Chapter 31, Mount Hyjal PT3. By all rights, Rognak and his warsong druids should have been fighting alongside Thrall and the rest of the horde. But there was no denying that both he and his neophytes had become much more in tune with the Night Elf people than their own over the past several weeks. In the end, in terms of where they were best positioned, there were very good reasons that Rognak and the other Orc druids he and Cenarius had been training found themselves at the Night Elf base instead of the Horde one. Even still, he would need to make sure that this didn't cause a schism within the Warsong clan in the future. Or even worse, a schism between the Warsong clan and the Horde as a whole. It wouldn't do for his druids to become so enamored with the Night Elf way of life that they abandoned the new Horde entirely. While not necessarily a terrible outcome in and of itself, it still might lead to strained relations and eventually ruin the peace on Kalimdor that he'd been trying so desperately to achieve ever since he stopped Grom from cutting down the Night Elves' forests in the first place. But those were all problems for future Rognak. Present Rognak had his own challenges to worry about. They're here. The Legion and their scourge dogs aren't playing around anymore. They'd received word that the Horde base had fallen less than a minute ago, and yet already the demons and undead were at their gates. Rognak grimaces, his teeth grinding together as he watches the ghouls and skeletons crashing into Night Elven fortifications. The fortifications hold for now, but that's only because this is the fodder. Nothing truly powerful has shown up just yet. This is it. Their final stand. Though it only has to look like that. The true plan is to let Archimonde reach the summit. To let him reach Nordrassil itself and use the World Tree as the trap it is to end him once and for all. Rognak knows that nobody is happy about what they're doing here today, least of all the Night Elf leaders themselves. But all recognize that it must be done. Archimonde is damn near unstoppable, and even if he weren't practically invincible, his forces are endless. They could have tried to pull out all the stops, they could have built fortifications that might have lasted them days, weeks, even months instead of the measly hours they were operating with now. They could have bled the Legion and their undead slaves for every inch of land on Mount Hyjal. But what would be the point? In the end, in a battle of attrition, their enemies were truly unstoppable. There was only one path forward, and it just so happened to be the same way that Rognak's second set of memories said they beat Archimonde in the game. Fuck, he wished this was a game. His other memories spoke of all sorts of cheese strats and whatnot. How it was entirely possible to not only hold Archimonde and his forces at Jaina's base for the entire duration of the mission, not allowing them to get past even the humans, but also possible to kill Archimonde himself with Firbolg champions. Unfortunately, the real world didn't work like that. His memories could only carry him so far, and this was not a game. These people around him, his orcs and their Night Elf allies, they were not NPCs. They were not units. They were individuals. They had names. Lives. Loved ones. And some of them would die today before this battle was over. As soon as Cenarius let Tyrande know that they were ready, the High Priestess would give the order to retreat. The best case scenario would have been if Archimonde allowed Jaina and Thrall's respective forces to stymy his troops long enough for the Night Elves not to need to hold out for very long at all, but that didn't look likely to be the case. They were still holding the line here. Cenarius wasn't prepared to spring the trap just yet. That was okay though, because while this might not be a game, Rognak had come up with a trick purely derived from his second set of memories. And he was looking forward to implementing it as soon as. Cry for mercy, for I, Khazrogul have come. Your meaningless lives are forfeited before the might of the Legion. Miserable nuisances, you will know pain before your final deaths. Bahaha. To think, Manoroth died to these mewling weaklings. His overconfidence proved to be his undoing, but I, Aesgalar, shall carry out his and the Defiler's will. Rognak lets out an explosive breath as the deep voices ring across the battlefield. Showtime. As the Doom Lord and Pit Fiend both come into view, stomping their way through the undead and lesser demons beneath their feet like they're nothing but chaff, Rognak settles into position. Warsong clan. Are you ready? Loktar Augur, chieftain. With a sudden lurch, his mount begins to shift and rise from its rooted position. Slowly pulling itself from the ground, the pre-prepared tree of eternity lifts itself to its full height, even as Rognak reaches forward and slides his hands into grooves created ahead of time. Roots reach back to greet him, and he smiles as he feels a connection made with the ancient creature. Meanwhile, all throughout its hollowed legs and arms and torso, his warsong druids scurry back and forth, moving this way and that. The modified tree of eternity stands tall and begins stomping forward towards the two demon commanders, both of whom feel the shaking in the ground from its plodding steps and turn to meet it. This was Rognak's big play. Cenarius had helped of course, but most of the project of modifying a tree of eternity into a nature-themed woodend mecha for fighting the Kaija-sized demons he knew they would be facing off against was done by him and his fellow orc druids. Together, they had taken to the task with gusto, fortifying and expanding the size of the tree of eternity until it was the massive behemoth Rognak was piloting now. Aesgalar and Khazrogul both stare for a moment in disbelief, before the Pit Fiend reacts with more uproarious laughter and the Doom Lord snarls in anger. Look. Look what they must do to mimic even a fraction of our power. Bah. Foolish mortals. With one last cackle, Aesgalar raises his massive glaive and points it at them all. Fell energy begins building on its tip, the only warning Rognak receives before the attack is launched. Shield. As he roars out his command to the other orc druids occupying the inside of the modified ancient, Rognak uses his controls to have the tree of eternity lift one of its arms up to its chest. At the same time, the orcs stationed in that limb place their hands upon the inner wall facing outwards and focus. Just in time too, as a beam of pure malevolent evil streaks from Aesgalar's hulking glaive, striking the arm just as it's reinforcing itself with more and more wood. Rognak grunts as he feels the entire tree of eternity being pushed back, a furrow in the ground forming as they're driven a few dozen yards. But in the end, Aesgalar's attack does not truly hurt them. The Tree of Eternity is a byproduct of Nordrassil itself and represents the Night Elves' immortal connection to the World Tree. With the orcs helping to guide its growth, a thick disk of wood has formed on the arm, building back up faster than the beam of fell energy can burn through it. By the time the dust clears, none of the damage from Aesgalar's attack remains save for a small patch of smoking wood. It's already been healed. Suddenly, the pit fiend isn't laughing anymore. Suddenly, he finds the situation just as humorless as his fellow demon commander. A snarl comes from the hulking demon lord's mouth and he begins to stomp forward, bashing away any of the night elf defenders who dare to get in his way. Rognak just smirks, preparing to stand his ground and lifting up his Tree of Eternity's arms, stretching out its ancient wooden claws in preparation for the pit fiend's next move. However, it never comes. Before Aesgalar can reach him, before the hulking demon can even so much as build up steam, another Tree of Eternity comes out of nowhere, blindsiding the pit fiend from the side and slamming into him with such force and power that Aesgalar is sent careening backwards with a confused, surprised roar. Rognak blinks and then scowls as Fondrel Staghelm, in position atop his own modified Tree of Eternity, shoots him a haughty look and an arrogant scoff. I thought you orcs were supposed to be savage, and yet here I find you letting the enemy come to you instead of the other way around. Before Rognak can formulate a reply, Fondrel whips his Tree of Eternity around and slams an ancient claw across Aesgalar's face, making the demon lord positively howl in pain as the incredibly powerful wood digs furrows in his flesh. The tree's other set of claws seize upon Aesgalar's chest plate and hoist him up off the ground, before throwing him off to the side only for Fondrel to follow. Alright, yes, Rognak knew that Fondrel had a tree too. He'd just been trying to ignore it for the moment. As soon as the Archdruid had overheard Rognak and Cenarius talking about turning a Tree of Eternity into a modified troop transport and overall combat vessel for Rognak and his warsong druids, Fondrel had decreed that he would gather up as many of his kin as possible and do the same, saying that such an undertaking was something that only those with lengthy experience could be trusted with. He hadn't gone so far as to try and say Rognak and his fellow orcs couldn't go forward with their plans, of course, likely remembering the last time that he was smacked down by Cenarius for being an egotistical prick. However, that definitely hadn't stopped Fondrel from doing his level best to one-up them. Still, for now at least, they were on the same side. Fondrel was undoubtedly a sleeper agent for the enemy already, but Rognak and Cenarius had both talked it over and decided that his corruption must be subtle enough that he's not fully turned just yet. In the end, the kind of enemy that Fondrel represented was important here. He and his master, the Nightmare Lord Xavius, were servants of the old gods and the Void, and they had their own designs on Azeroth wholly separate from Archimonde and the Legion. For this battle, they could count on him to keep his cover intact for the chance of furthering Xavius' plans after Archimonde was defeated. Besides, it wasn't like Aesgalar was about to let the insult that Fondrel had just dealt him stand. Already the pit fiend was fighting his way to his feet and facing off with Fondrel's Tree of Eternity, a snarl of rage on his torn open face. Rognak pays them little mind, however. He only has eyes for Khazrogel at this point. The hulking Doom Lord wields his massive sword, Calamity's Edge, swinging it back and forth as he narrows his eyes at Rognak's Tree of Eternity. With a sneer, the massive demon pushes off the ground, his wings beating and taking him up into the air a few dozen feet. Launching himself forward, he comes back down with his blade aimed to pierce right through the heart of Rognak's mount, a heart filled with orc druids that Rognak has been doing his best to introduce to a brand new world. Needless to say, the Warsong chieftain isn't about to let that happen. Lifting the Tree of Eternity's hands, he catches Calamity's Edge on its claws, snarling as he feels his fellow orcs pumping nature magic down the length of the ancient's arms in order to empower and repair the damage even touching such a blasphemous, fel-infused weapon is causing. Khazrogel snarls right back, his spittle nearly hitting Rognak in the face as he leans in, putting all of his weight into the downward thrust, only for it to be diverted abruptly, with Rognak twisting the entire tree to the side and forcing Khazrogel's sword into the earth. Then, he backhands the Doom Lord across the face hard enough to spin his head and send him reeling. Grey-ah. Pitiful insects. Rognak lets out a laugh, causing Khazrogel's eyes to flick to him for the first time, the Doom Lord just now noticing him in his pilot's seat. Giving the hulking Doom Lord a wicked grin, Rognak sends off a wordless command through his controls. These pitiful insects have stopped you in your tracks, demon. Your master will not be pleased when you fail him. The words have the intended effect of enraging the Doom Lord, but also distracting him. Just as he's opening his mouth to deliver a biting response, the Tree of Eternity's torso begins to glow. Focused as he is on little Ole Rognak perched atop the ancient, Khazrogel doesn't notice the build-up until it's much too late. A beam of combined lunar and solar energy collected over millennia by this Tree of Eternity explodes outwards, slamming into Khazrogel and tearing through the Doom Lord. In an instant, his entire left side is gone, incinerated along with an entire swath of land behind him, including all of the demons and undead that were pouring up the slope who just so happened to be in the way. The spiraling helix of the sun and moon's molded power curves after a bit and flies off into the sky. But Rognak does not have time to admire that for long, because Khazrogel still has his sword arm intact, and despite the immense pain the Doom Lord must be in, he's managed to find the strength to swing it, directly at Rognak's head. With only a split second to respond, Rognak tears an arm free of the Tree of Eternity's modified interface and yanks Wolf Song from his back. If it were still Gorhal and not blessed by Cenarius, he can't say for sure whether Grommash Hellscream's old weapon could have withstood the bite of Calamity's Edge. But it has been blessed by Cenarius and it has the might of nature itself flowing through it. That, Rognak imagines, is the only reason that he's not torn out of his seat, nor does he lose an arm as he manages to block Calamity's Edge from cleaving him in two with Wolfsong's glowing green edge. Khazrogel's eyes, which had been narrowed in vicious anticipation, go wide as Rognak manages to push his hulking weapon away despite their difference in sizes. Grinning savagely, the Warsong chieftain winds up, and throws Wolfsong right into Khaz'Rogal's forehead in a move reminiscent of his kill of Manoroth, sending the Doom Lord stumbling back, and then falling to the ground, half burnt to a crisp and entirely dead. Retrieving Wolfsong with the help of his fellow orcs, using the Tree of Eternity's smaller branches to pull the axe from the dead demon's face and pass it back up to him. Only once his weapon is secured on his back once more does Rognak turn to see how Fondrel and his Tree of Eternity fare. His feelings when he sees Fondrel's tree holding Aesgalar's decapitated head aloft, the pit fiend's corpse dead at his feet, are mixed. On the one hand, good. On the other hand, well, it was Fondrel's Staghelm. Their eyes meet across the battlefield, and Fondrel has a better-than-thou smirk on his face, right up until he sees the remains of Rognak's opponent on the ground. The smirk is wiped away in an instant, replaced by a sneer, but before the Archdruid can say anything, the sound of clapping suddenly echoes across the battlefield. Turning in unison, both Rognak and Fondrel straighten in their seats as Archimonde the Defiler strides forward, clapping his massive blue hands together. Industrious little gnats, aren't you? Good help is so hard to find these days. Before either of them can react, Archimonde suddenly lurches forward, beams of pure fel lancing out of his eyes, directly at Fondrel's Tree of Eternity. The power might be the same as what Aesgalar shot out of his glaive, but the difference is night and day. Just those two thin lines from Archimonde's eyes cut right through the left arm of the ancient in an instant, the massive wooden limb falling to the ground with a heavy thud. Straightening back up, Archimonde the Defiler gives them both a wide, wicked grin even as night elf druids can be seen scurrying from out within the delimbed appendage. Shall we then? Chapter 32, Mount Hyjal Finale. To Fondrel's credit, Archimonde's opening salvo, while maiming, does not immediately take the Archdruid and his Tree of Eternity out of the fight. Even as fell flames flicker at the stump where the Tree of Eternity's arm used to be, keeping the night elf druids within the hulking ancient from repairing it with their nature magic, Fondrel lets out a roar of challenge, and begins to charge forward. Rognak can only blink before cursing under his breath at the reckless display. Aren't he and his supposed to be the savages here? Hell, Fondrel can't possibly want to die here, he has too much to do for his dark masters still. But regardless, as much as Rognak might want to leave the treacherous Archdruid to his fate, to let the Defiler slaughter him, he has to intervene. For one, Tyrande has yet to sound the retreat. This means this is still a delaying action. They still have to buy time for Cenarius to prepare the trap for Archimonde. For two, Fondrel is not the only night elf piloting his Tree of Eternity. And those innocents do not deserve to die simply because Fondrel is being a reckless idiot. Axe. As Fondrel pilots his one-armed ancient towards an amused Defiler, Rognak calls out to his own crew of orc druids and begins moving his ancient forward at a more reasonable pace. He only has them start picking up speed as wood begins to grow from the Tree of Eternity's clawing branches, forming into the haft of an axe in rapid order, and growing further on until the blade is crafted as well. Made entirely of wood, it is nevertheless supernaturally sharp. A more massive version of Broxigar's axe of Cenarius, Rognak can't help but reflect as he takes hold of the new construct with the ancient's second hand as well, moving them faster in the direction of Fondrel and Archimonde. The Defiler raises a hand, clearly preparing to do away with Fondrel's damaged Tree of Eternity in one wave of fell magic, but before he can do so, Rognak is there, his giant wooden axe suffused with the power of Nordrassil itself coming down towards the Eredar Overlord's unprotected wrist. To his credit, Archimonde responds with rapid alacrity, clearly sensing the danger as he yanks his arm back out of the way and even takes a step back to give himself space. The Defiler's eyes narrow and Rognak gets ready to bring up the axe to block another eye-beam attack, but rather than immediately strike, Archimonde's lips merely curl into a savage, vile grin as he locks gazes with the Orc Druid. You. The little Druid usurper. You're the one who killed Grommash Hellscream. You're the reason Manoroth's scheme failed. The Orcish Horde were always Kil'jaedan pet project more than mine, but even still, to see such capable foot soldiers weaken themselves with this pathetic tree-hugging is truly a sad sight. Rognak's eyes narrow at the obvious provocation. Indeed, he can feel how much Archimonde's insidious, silken words rankle his fellow orcs, down in the bowels of the Tree of Eternity. But Rognak doesn't let it get to him. Holding his head high he has his ancient hoist the mammoth-sized wooden axe up in the air. This pathetic tree-hugger certainly seems to give you pause enough, Defiler. The massive demon lord stiffens at that. It's immediately obvious he can dish it out but not take it, as he snarls and begins to lean forward. But Rognak isn't surprised by that. Someone like Archimonde would not be used to being talked back to. Of course, equally true was the fact that someone like Fondrel Staghelm was not used to being ignored. There is no warning, as Fondrel's ancient suddenly smashes into Archimonde's side in a repeat of his earlier maneuver. Unfortunately, this time around it's not nearly as effective. Unlike Aesgalar the Pit Fiend, Archimonde does not go tumbling ass over end. He grunts, catching Fondrel's tree on its remaining arm and smoldering shoulder as he's sent skidding back across the ground. From that moment on, battle is joined. Rognak would like to say that he and Fondrel fight together, as one but that would be a lie. Their respective crews had done no training together. While the concept behind their Trees of Eternity is the same, the execution is far from it. Rognak is the pilot while his crew is each trusted with their own work. Fondrel, meanwhile, has taken complete control, with his own fellow night elf druids relegated to feeding their energy into him. It's eerily reminiscent of what Rognak remembers from Fondrel's later actions, and he resolves to make sure that Cenarius checks over the living members of Fondrel's crew after the battle is won, if the battle is won. While Fondrel's direct control allows him faster reaction time, it does not allow for nearly as much adaptability. More than that, the Archdruid's Tree of Eternity is already maimed by Archimonde's opening gambit, the fell flames on its stump never going out. In the end, it's not long before, even facing off against the both of them, Archimonde slams a fist straight through the chest of Fondrel Stagilm's Ancient, burning it from the inside out. Only the druids in the arm and legs survive the ensuing sickly green conflagration as the Tree of Eternity itself dies in a blazing explosion. Well, them and Fondrel himself, regrettably. Rognak notes the Archdruid shouting as his weakened, smoking form is dragged back from the battlefield. Archimonde would likely have finished them all off, but he still had Rognak to contend with. Rognak and his ranged support. Throughout the battle, the rest of the Night Elves have not stood idly by as he and Fondrel piloted their Trees of Eternity against the Legion commanders. But until now, Chandris, Tyrnda, and their sentinels have been focused on taking down the undead and lesser demons threatening to overwhelm the Night Elf base. However, as Archimonde and Rognak face off against one another, the Defiler's face split into a confident grin filled with surety and certainty of his impending victory. A barrage of arrows comes flying and strikes him across the face. Some of them are glowing with the radiant light of Elune as well, making the Eridar Overlord rear back for a moment, snarling in fury and rage. Before he can turn his attention their direction however, Rognak urges his tree forward, getting right in the Defiler's face and slamming the massive axe in the Ancient's gnarled branches down into Archimonde's chest. Unfortunately, the Demon Lord has adapted to that, and a shield of fell fire collected in his palm blocks the axe blow, while his other hand comes up and more fell splatters across the Tree of Eternity's face and chest. Even still, Rognak doesn't back down. Your battle is with me, Defiler. Archimonde just chuckles lowly, knowing what they both know, this battle is already almost over. Rognak would like to say that the supporting arrow fire from range helped. That it somehow turned the tide and gave him what he needed to hold Archimonde back indefinitely. But the Eridar Overlord of the Legion was not so easily beaten. He was not so easily held at bay. The Tree of Eternity that Cinerais helped him and his student repurpose for this battle, does not last much longer than Fondrel's did. In the end, Rognak is barely able to force the disengage when Archimonde's clawing hand comes for the tree's chest, just as it did with the Archdruids. While the desperate maneuver means that Defiler doesn't manage to punch straight through the wooden Ancient's chest, the explosion of fell magic is still enough to blast the Tree of Eternity back 100 yards, falling to the ground half destroyed and in pieces. Rognak forces himself out from under the dying tree's head, his eyes closing for a moment as he sends a pulse of satisfaction and pride through the pilot's controls one final time. The Trees of Eternity that he and Fondrel had used in this battle, they were alive. Sapient creatures who had consented to being utilized in this fashion. They were as much casualties of this battle as any of their other losses. But they'd done well. They'd done well, and Rognak insists on making sure his tree knows that, before finally pulling free of it and climbing to his feet. As he unslings Wolf Song from his back, Rognak looks around for a moment, letting out an Orcish huff at what he sees. If he does not growl, he will whine. If he does not snarl, he will cry. Everywhere he looks, fell flames lick upon Night Elf fortifications. The battlefield is littered with bodies. Far more of the enemy lie dead, the scourge re-killed in the hundreds if not the thousands by this point. But plenty of Night Elves have been slain. Orcs as well. And he knows, too many of them. Far, far too many of them. His earlier thoughts return to him. This is not a game. These are not units, nor NPCs. They are people, individuals who Rognak has come to know. Some, quite well. They have names. Families. Wants and desires. This isn't a story, damn it, this is the end of the world. Archimonde, in the wake of his triumph over Rognak and the Tree of Eternity, has taken a moment to stop and gloat over his impending victory. Bahaha. This is what you Night Elves mustered. If I had known it would be this easy, I would have returned to your world to crush you all centuries ago. Spreading his arms wide, smiling wickedly, Archimonde's eyes flash a sickly green. Come. Where is your fire, mortals? Where is your passion? 10,000 years, and this is all you can muster. Rognak knows, of course, that there's a reason they're not fighting with all they have. It's for the trap. It's all for the trap. But the trap isn't ready yet, and Archimonde's words rankle something fierce. For most of his life, Rognak has not felt the Orcish bloodlust like most of his kind. He was born with a fell taint that was cleansed by his connection to nature, and so he did not share in the same curse that Grommash and so many others shared in before Manarotha's death. And yet, in that moment, surrounded by bodies, both of elves and orcs, Rognak thinks he might know what it feels like, to be overcome with an Orcish rage. He thinks he might know what true fury means to an orc. It starts low in his belly, before expanding upwards into his chest. It starts with huffing and growling and snarling as his grip on Wolf Song tightens and he slowly begins to move forward. What starts as plodding, pained steps becomes a more rapid movement in short order. Archimonde has just begun to turn away as Rognak propels himself forward, sprinting at the hulking demon lord by this point. Archimonde. As the Defiler starts to turn back, Rognak is already transforming, taking on the same form he took when he slew Manoroth. The power in the back legs alone is enough to allow him to leap high into the air, though Archimonde towers over even the pit fiend he killed in height. And yet, there's enough height for Rognak to reach the Eridar Overlord's chest. Enough height for him to reach the blackened, charred spot on his exposed blue flesh where Thrall's lightning bolt struck true not too long ago. Your battle is with me. His voice comes out even more guttural than usual, but his words are clear all the same. With a howl, Rognak slams Wolf Song home into that crack in Archimonde's skin, sinking his nature-blessed axe into the demon lord's chest. The defiler's eyes widen and he howls in true pain as Wolf's song bites deep. Rognak feels a sense of pure satisfaction to go along with his raw fury as he pumps every ounce of power he can claw from his connection to nature into the move. Unfortunately, what killed Manoroth in a single blow is not enough to kill Archimonde. The defiler certainly feels pain, but so does Rognak when the demon lord backhands him off a moment later, sending the druid flying into the ground, Wolf's song wrenched from his grasp and thrown far as well. Disarmed, Rognak grunts as he lands on the forest floor, the air knocked out of his transformed lungs. He immediately begins healing, but not quickly enough, not by a long shot. As Archimonde looms over him, Rognak grits his teeth, glaring up at his doom. Retreat. Fall back. And there it is. A sense of relief washes over Rognak, even as the retreat is finally called. The signal that Cenarius is ready to go, that the trap for Archimonde is laid. Of course, it's much too late for Rognak to get away. The call for retreat distracts Archimonde for only a moment, the Eredar overlord looking away for a beat before looking back down at Rognak and chuckling darkly. The moment they see their champion fall, they run away. Truly, the mortals of Azeroth have become weak in our absence. But you, little usurper, have earned my personal attention. I will enjoy killing you and then taking your soul back with me to the nether. I'm curious what sort of demon you might become. But first. Archimonde reaches down, his hand moving to close around Rognak, likely to lift him up or even just smash or crush him. But while Rognak is disarmed, he is never truly defenseless. His claws pulse with nature energy the moment that Archimonde's line of sight is cut off, and he takes a vicious sense of satisfaction in driving them up into the Eredar overlord's blue palm, channeling every bit of the patronage Cenarius said he could call upon in that moment. Another howl leaves Archimonde's lips as he rears back. He no longer looks amused or happy in the slightest after that. And instead of reaching for him again, he lifts up one of his hooves, intending on stomping Rognak into paste before making good on his word regarding the Orc Druid's soul. But then, if this is to be the end, so be it. Rognak can only hope that everything he's done up to this point will give Azeroth more of a fighting chance. If he can have averted even a handful of the tragedies that will befall this world via his actions, then it will have been worth it. As the hoof descends, blotting out his vision, Rognak lets his eyes drift shut and waits for the end to come. And yet, it never does. And when a second turns into 5 and Rognak is still conscious, albeit in pain, he finds himself opening his eyes again to see that he's staring up, not at Archimonde's rapidly approaching hoof, but at Lady Jaina Proudmoore, the blonde mage smiling a watery smile, having used the last drops of her magic to remove him from the battlefield. You saved me. Jaina holds her head high, even as she gives him a tired but satisfied smile. Meanwhile, Thrall's voice echoes from Rognak's other side, making the Orc Druid realize that Horde's Warkif is there as well. She saved all of us. Back straight, Jaina lets out a single explosive breath. Yes. Yes, I did. She sounds very pleased with herself, but then, she damn well should. It was always the plan to have Jaina evacuate her people and then the Horde base as well, but it was also understood that by the time the Night Elf base fell, she would be completely out of mana. Those defending at the base of Nordrassil were expected to get out of the way all on their own, which was why Tyrande had to call a retreat in the first place. Pushing himself up into a seated position through no small amount of effort and with some help from Thrall, Rognak looks off into the distance, just in time to see Archimonde growing even more massive than he already was. The Defiler's voice rings across the summit of Mount Hyjal in all directions. Pathetic cowards, all of you. Run and hide, mortals. You have failed. At long last, my victory is complete. And then... As Archimonde reaches for the World Tree, as he grows in size to match the majestic height of Nordrassil itself, Cenarius blows his horn, and sets off the trap they'd spent so many lives buying time for. Rognak watches as thousands upon thousands of burning wisps slam into Archimonde and Nordrassil, igniting the World Tree. The energy of which increases the resulting explosion 100-fold, leaving the Defiler fully engulfed. The Eredar Lord howls, burning to ash along with the remains of his armies. Rognak can't help but smile, a swell of pride filling his tired, aching, pained body. Though there's also a hint of worry too. Did the others manage to? But just as he's thinking that, there's a commotion at the end of the evacuation point, as those who retreated from the Night Elf base, including his remaining druidic students, finally arrive. Making eye contact with Chandri's Feather Moon, Rognak can't help the dopey smile that spreads across his face at seeing that she's safe. And then his eyes begin to droop close, and he passes out on the spot. His last thought before consciousness flees him is that he's glad she's all right. Chapter 33, After the Battle. Not for the first time, Tyrande finds herself running hands glowing with radiant moonlight across Rognak's torso, her face screwed up in concentration as she makes sure that every last bit of the damage, both inside and out, has been healed. In this she has Elone's full support. Through her connection with the goddess of the moon, the Night Elven High Priestess can make sure that there is no lingering demonic corruption from the blows Rognak took, nor from his proximity to flames of fell magic. He's clean. He's also completely healed, of course. But it's hard to accept that when the Orc Druid is still unconscious days after the battle for Mount Hyjal. They'd won that battle, even though they'd lost so much, and Rognak had been instrumental in carrying the day. Was it any wonder that Tyrande found herself here, by his side? A hand of branches falls upon her shoulder, causing the High Priestess to let out a slow breath. She'd felt Cenarius approach from a good distance away of course, so she's not startled. Even still, her eyes do not leave Rognak's sleeping visage. High Priestess. Your vigil, while appreciated, is unnecessary. The young druid is doing quite well thanks to our efforts. He merely needs time to rest now that we've healed what physically ailed him. Tyrande frowns at that, not liking it, truth be told. Then why does he not wake? Even Staghelm has woken up at this point. By all rights, Tyrande should be assigning just as much credit to the Archdruid as she is to Rognak. Indeed, they'd all played their parts in defeating Archimonde and the Burning Legion, and they'd played them well. And Fondrel, much like Tyrande and the rest of their people, had sacrificed more than Rognak and their allies had. Nordrassil was gone, destroyed in the same explosion that destroyed Archimonde. Their immortality was lost. After over 10,000 years, they would age and die like mortal beings once more. Of course, there were already murmurings of a new world tree. A chance to regain their immortality. Tyrande wasn't sure how she felt about that, but a part of her didn't like it. It felt premature. The chieftain's bond to nature is strong. He counts many among the wild gods as his patrons, including myself. Tyrande's eyes snap open at that confession, her gaze finally leaving Rognak to look to Cenarius. The Lord of the Forest is speaking rather candidly at the moment. During the battle, he reached for all that he could. And we did not deny him. He wanted our power for his own use, but we, his patrons, deemed his cause in this instance to be just and righteous. And so, we gave him what he was asking for. A small smile curls across Cenarius' face and the demigod chuckles softly. I'm not entirely sure he even knew what he was doing. He only knew that he wasn't strong enough, that he needed more. Unfortunately, his mortal form was not made for so much power. If he'd held onto it for much longer, he would have suffered severe consequences. Cenarius' voice is grave, sending a shiver down Tyrande's spine as she looks back to the young orc laid out before them. She doesn't like the sound of that, but thankfully it was only a matter of if. The worst had not come to pass. As it is, he requires more time than most to recover as a result. Still, I think he will awaken soon. A day more, at most. Tyrande slowly nods, accepting this as she stares at Rognak some more. Her daughter's lover and the bridge between her people and the Horde. Without him, Tyrande has a feeling that everything would have turned out far worse. Her insight tells her that Rognak was a blessing for her people, that his mere existence has served to put them on the path to a better future. And yet, Tyrande's eyes drift over to Rognak's weapon, the axe wolf song. Retrieved from the battle, it had suffered some damage that Cenarius had already restored. Marshalling herself, Tyrande lets out an explosive breath and finally asks the question at the forefront of her mind. Is he to be my beloved's replacement then? The Lord of the Forest startles at her side, causing Tyrande to look at him knowingly. Will he be your new protege, Lord Cenarius? Your next student? Cenarius does not meet her gaze, which is answer enough. But Tyrande still waits him out, until at long last he speaks. The young one represents a great opportunity, Tyrande. The future of our world will be a brighter place with him in it. The corner of Tyrande's mouth quirks up as Cenarius unknowingly mirrors her previous thoughts with his words. But the forest demigod isn't done yet. However, know that Malfurion's fate weighs heavily on me. I cannot claim parity with your loss, but if given the choice, I do not know if I would trade young Rognak for a change in Malfurion's fate. Tyrande blinks at that. It is a heavy confession. And a terrible thought. If she had the choice, between Rognak's life and Malfurion's, what would she choose? She hates that Cenarius even put the thought in her head. It helps though, that she knows what Malfurion would say were he here. He would decry such a choice. He would never want them to sacrifice anyone for him, let alone a promising young druid on the cusp of greatness. And yet, those are the words that Cenarius leaves Tyrande with. He does not speak again, merely standing beside her quietly for a few moments more before silently taking his leave of her. Tyrande remains by Rognak's side, and after a moment she returns to her healing vigil, never touching the slumbering orc but running glowing hands over his body all the same. Immediately after the battle, she and Cenarius had indeed worked together to heal Rognak's numerous injuries. They were many and varied, with broken ribs and internal bleeding being some of the worst of it. He had very nearly been on the verge of death, but in the end his Orcish constitution combined with their quick work had resulted in him pulling through. It was the least Tyrande felt she could do. Rognak and his kind had risked everything to give them the time they needed. And in the end, they'd succeeded. All of the races of Kalimdor and some from far away had come together in the battle for Mount Hyjal. Night Elves had fought alongside Tauren and Trolls for the first time in millennia, to say nothing of the foreign humans or the even more foreign orcs who had come to their shores. In spite of their differences, they had done it. Against all odds, they had proven victorious. Archimonde hadn't known what hit him. The Defiler had been so confident in the end there. Even charred and bleeding from Thrall and Rognak's respective attacks, the Demon Lord had believed his conquest unopposed. Indeed, the tenacity and ferocity of their young orc allies had probably been what convinced him that there was no trap, in the end. And ultimately, he'd walked right into it. And died. A vicious sense of satisfaction fills Tyrande even now as she thinks about it. The end of Archimonde. The destruction of the Defiler. However, that satisfaction is overshadowed a moment later by thoughts of the future. Rognak and his fellow orc druids are, so young. So very mortal. But then, with the death of Nordrassil, she and her people are mortal now too. Perhaps it's better that way. Perhaps with time, the Night Elves and the Orcish Horde can become closer than ever before. Tyrande isn't unobservant, after all. She's well aware that there are relationships cropping up between the two races outside of what Chandris and the young Warsong chieftain have going on. Some of her sentinels have taken to Rognek's neophyte druids quite eagerly. Indeed, a handful of her priestesses had come to her already, to ask what they should do about it. Nothing, she told them. She would not condemn such couplings. She would not drive away their young allies and turn victory into ash in their mouths. The Night Elves had lost much when her beloved mate and many of their druids had died to the scourge. If they were going to ever recover, they needed to forge stronger ties with their new neighbors, not push them away. It would not be easy. There would be missteps. There would be stumbles. There would be challenges. But Tyrande fully believed they would be able to overcome them all, together. Oh. High Priestess, I didn't expect to find you here. Blinking, pulled from her thoughts, Tyrande yanks her glowing hands back from Rognek's chest as though burned. She's not sure why she's embarrassed to have been caught healing the perfectly healthy Orc Druid by her adoptive daughter, but as Chandrise pushes into the tent, Tyrande finds herself a little flushed, coughing delicately. Chandrise. I was merely looking after our ally while he rested. I know his own people watch over him, but I wanted to make sure none of the fell could take root. Her excuse sounds weak, even to her own ears. Why is that? Tyrande shifts from side to side, even as Chandrise nods and comes to kneel beside her, gaze locked on Rognek's sleeping face. Thank you, mother. For helping him. Tyrande smiles softly, and when Chandrise reaches out and takes hold of her hand, she intertwines her fingers with the other night elves, giving Chandrise a solid squeeze. It is my pleasure, daughter. He has done much for our people. To toss him aside now would be the height of dishonor. To say nothing of what he means to you. And like that, with one single sentence spoken in a teasing tone, Tyrande is treated to the sight of Chandrise blushing and sputtering a little bit. However, she does not deny it. She does not try to claim that she and the Warsong chieftain are merely friends. As Chandrise falls quiet, Tyrande sighs and looks down at the other night elf's hand in her own. When you first spoke of him, I could hear in your voice that your engagement was more than just the physical affair you might have claimed it to be, Chandrise. I wonder, have you come to understand what feelings you might have for Rognek any better after all of this? Blush intensifying, Chandrise does not immediately answer. But eventually, she straightens her back, squares her shoulders, and nods. I have, mother. Feeling rather at home in playing the teasing mother, Tyrande's eyes twinkle as she fiddles with their joined hands. And, gazing towards Rognek's slumbering form once more, Chandrise sighs. You're right. I do feel more for him than I initially anticipated. I have become attached. At first, I'd thought us too far apart for there to be anything but sex between us. He is only mortal, after all. But now. Tyrande smiles, nodding along with her adoptive daughter. She's pleased that Chandrise has come to the same conclusion that she did. The destruction of Nordrassil, while a terrible loss to their people, might just be a blessing in disguise. So are we now, Chandrise. Many of our people are over 10,000 years old. But no longer. No longer can we expect immortality. No longer can we let the years pass us by without reaching out and seizing what happiness we can wherever we can find it. I tell you this now, not as your high priestess, nor even necessarily as your mother, but as one woman to another, you must take hold of this opportunity and never let it go. Hold tight and keep him close, no matter what. If a tinge of bitter sorrow enters Tyrande's voice by the end of her speech, Chandrise at least has the good grace not to mention it. Instead, the younger night elf lets out a low, shuddering breath as she continues to stare at Rognek for a moment more. Then, at long last she nods and turns her gaze to Tyrande. I will. I promise. Smiling now, Tyrande pulls Chandrise in for a warm embrace. The two of them hug tightly, basking in one another's presence and the physical contact of a loved one for a good, long while. And then, Chandrise pulls away, ending the embrace. Tyrande looks at her as the sentinel captain bites her lower lip, hesitating for only a moment before speaking. And what of you, priestess? What of your happiness? Tyrande freezes at the question. She would think Chandrise would know better than to ask such a thing. In a very short amount of time, Tyrande has lost quite a lot. Forcing a smile onto her face, the priestess of Elune places a hand on Chandrise's shoulder. I will be fine, Chandrise. You do not have to worry about me. Your happiness will be my happiness. Seeing you find love after all this time, it fills me with joy enough as it is. I do not need anything more than what I already have. My duty to our people, and my love for you. That will be enough for me. Chandrise frowns at that, looking displeased with Tyrande's answer. But truth be told, she doesn't know what else to say to the younger night elf. Malfurion is gone. Perhaps not dead just yet, not completely, but he is lost to her. And Tyrande will just have to live with that. Luckily, she will not have to live with it for eternity, or she thinks she might just have gone mad from the endlessness of it all. But one mortal life lived in pursuit of a future for her people, even after she's gone? That Tyrande can do. That is a purpose she can get behind. But apparently, that's not enough for Chandrise. Her gaze flickers over to the slumbering Orc Druid in their midst again, and after a moment Chandrise speaks. My happiness could be more than just your happiness in spirit, mother. What? What is Chandrise saying? Shifting from side to side, looking 10,000 years younger and like she'd just done something incredibly naughty, Chandrise nevertheless holds her head high and finds the courage to meet Tyrande's eyes. I have already accepted that I will be sharing my mate with a human mage, Jaina Proudmoore. Tyrande blinks, causing Chandrise to give her a crooked smile. In fact, I'm the one who brought them together. He's a bit much for me to handle on my own, you see. Orc men are, very beastly, High Priestess. It slowly begins to dawn on Tyrande, what exactly Chandris is implying. But then Chandris goes beyond simply implying. What I'm saying is. Before she can finish that sentence, Tyrande abruptly pulls away, standing up and cutting Chandris off. Apologies. I must. I have sat in vigil for much too long. I need to find food, and perhaps a bath. And I am sure my responsibilities to our people are already piling up. I leave the vigil in your capable hands, Sentinel Captain. Chandri's eyes widen, and she opens her mouth to speak, but Tyrande is already fleeing the tent, something in her chest twisting into knots at Chandri's insinuation. Surely she just misunderstood. Best to put it out of her mind. Best not to think about it, ever again. Chapter 33.5, After the Battle, Lude. Chandri's face falls as Tyrande retreats from the encounter. She'd tried to be as subtle as possible, tried to coach it in terms that she felt might bring the Priestess of Elune around to the idea. It wasn't as though she wanted Rognak to replace Malfurion in Tyrande's heart or anything like that. She'd merely wanted her mother to have an opportunity to be happy again. Alas, she'd come on too strong and chased Tyrande away. She couldn't even go after her either. Not just because she was sure that the other night elf wouldn't appreciate her company at this point, but also because Rognak was not supposed to be left alone while he convalesced. Lord Cenarius' orders, to be exact. So. Chandris was stuck. She was. Blinking, Chandri's eyes snap over to her sleeping lover, even as the silence is broken by a quiet huff of laughter from the supposedly unconscious orc. But just because his eyes are closed doesn't mean he's actually asleep still, and the curve of his large mouth certainly looks something like a smile. Squawking indignantly, Chandris reaches over and smacks Rognak on the chest, to little effect save for that he finally creaks open an eye. How long have you been awake, you big lug? A rumble makes its way up from his chest, through his throat, and out his lips before he answers her. Long enough to listen to you striking out with your own mother, Chandris. Sputtering, Chandris feels the heat rising in her face as she colors in embarrassment. Growling, she strikes him again on the chest, once more to little effect as she scowls at him. We're not truly mother and daughter. Yes, she might have taken me in, but it's been 10,000 years. We're more like sisters at this point. I haven't been a child for millennia. Rognak just snorts and Chandris has to admit that even to her own ears, her excuses sound weak. And yet, it's not enough to break her of her convictions. She's still convinced that her mother deserves happiness, and that requires her to eventually move on from the mate she lost, is losing. Okay, so maybe trying to convince Tyrande to bed her orc lover when Malfurion wasn't fully gone just yet was where Chandris had truly erred. Letting out a sigh, Chandris throws herself on top of Rognak, all but using him as a bed. He grunts at her weight, even as large green hands come up to grab hold of her. Hey, sheesh, no care or concern for the wounded, is there? Lifting her head from his chest, Chandris scoffs at that. I know you're not wounded anymore. Lord Cenarius and Tyrande made sure of that. You should be fit as a fiddle, after all of the healing that the High Priestess provided you with. Then, Chandris is hit by a bout of insecurity and blushes, starting to pull away. Though I imagine you might still be exhausted and feeling weak. I apologize, I am MPH. But Rognak isn't having it. Before she can pull away, his hands grip down harder on where he's holding her, and suddenly he's leaning up to kiss her on the lips. Chandris all but melts into the kiss, her lips going straight for that corner of his big, strong Orcish mouth that she loves so much. For a while, there's nothing but the feel of his warmth against hers and their bodies pressed up along one another. But eventually, he pulls back, his eyes dancing with mirth. You're right. I'm feeling pretty damn good. Great, even. Like $1,000,000. Chandris wrinkles her nose at that. What do male deer have to do with anything? For a moment, Rognak looks taken aback, then he grins, laughing as he holds her closer. Well, if nothing else, they're virile creatures, aren't they? Just as virile as I am. She feels his bulge beginning to grow against her ass then, the effect of the prolonged contact between their two bodies finally starting to have an effect. Straddling him, Chandris bites her lower lip and pushes off his chest, reaching up to begin divesting herself of her sentinel garb. Rognak watches her do so, his throbbing erection pressing against her buttocks the entire time, until at long last she's naked and can remove his loincloth, exposing the rest of his body as well. As his throbbing Orcish member slides up and down between her cheeks, Chandris shivers, slowly bouncing, riding him while also not truly riding him just yet. He doesn't question why she's taking her time to get started. Instead, he seems to be feeling the same awkward tension in the air that she is. Tilting his head to the side, the young orc looks at her, truly looks at her, making Chandris freeze up as she waits in anticipation and dread alike for the question she knows he's going to ask. Chandris, what are we to each other? Heart thudding in her naked chest, the Sentinel Captain wiggles for a moment, luxuriating in the feel of his body and genitals. And then, she finally tells the truth. Both to him and herself. We are, whatever you will let us be, Rognak. I won't deny it. I think I want to be more than just physical with you. Before, I thought that there was no way to bridge the gap between the two of us. You are so young, and I have been alive for over 10,000 years. But even setting that aside, I was immortal and you were not. Rognak nods, not a trace of judgment in his eyes as he listens to her. Chandris bites her lower lip, taking a moment to get her thoughts in order before continuing on. But then I fought alongside you. I lived alongside you. I realized quite quickly that bridging the gap wasn't the impossible task I thought it was. You might be young, but you live an entire lifetime in every moment you have on Azeroth. You never stop moving. It's like you're chasing something, and in doing so, I could tell you would rapidly catch up to me, just as a byproduct of that chase. Smiling softly, Chandris reaches up and runs a hand down the side of Rognok's face. And now, the issue of immortality has solved itself as well. I and my people are no longer immortal, and I do not believe we will regain eternal life, even with what that blowhard Staghelm has been spouting. I will live out the rest of a mortal life, a blessing in disguise, because it means I can perhaps do it, by your side. Blushing again, Chandris pulls her hand back, suddenly self-conscious. If you'll have me, that is. For a long moment, almost too long, Rognok is quiet. His hands are still on her body. His cock is still nestled between her ass cheeks. But nevertheless, he pauses. When he finally does speak, he seems conflicted. I would like nothing more than that, Chandris. But there is someone else to be considered. The way Jaina spoke during our shared time with her, I think she might want the same thing. And now I don't know what to do. You had me first, but you spurned my heart. Jaina had me second, but she made her desires clear from the moment she got the chance. Oh. Was that all? Chandris feels relief filling every pore of her being. For a moment, she thought he was about to say that the age difference was too much of a bridge for him to be able to cross. But if all he was worried about was hurting the human mage's feelings. Letting out an airy little laugh, Chandris cups Rognok's face in her hands and grins as she lifts her hips up and finally, at long last, sinks herself down his cock. Not that it's actually as easy as she makes it sound. He's big, bigger than big, just as he's always been. But she's gotten better at taking him over time, and she's prepared for this. Her sopping wet cunt stretches nice and wide as she sinks down the Orc Druid's member. He, of course, is taken by surprise. Here they were talking about matters of love and she'd just gone ahead and impaled herself upon his massive green dick. A loud, involuntary groan leaves Rognok's lips, even as he tilts his head back in audible and visible enjoyment. But at the same time, he growls at her, clearly annoyed alongside being pleasured. Chandris. His tone has a note of warning to it, and though Chandris giggles, she also doesn't leave him hanging for too long. Let her join into whatever we want to develop between us, Rognok. I don't mind. That catches the orc off guard. His eyes flick to hers and he blinks incredulously for a moment. What? Pulling her hands back from his face, sliding them down his broad chest, Chandris pushes herself up into a proper seated position upon his dick. He's so deep inside of her, and yet when she glances down, only half of his length is actually in her cunt at this point. Meanwhile, her belly is already starting to bulge a little bit in some places. Admiring the view, running her fingers across her taut, chiseled, stretched abdomen, Chandris eventually looks back to Rognok and grins. Why are you so surprised? I'm the one who facilitated your encounter in the first place. And sure, maybe I was still in denial then, but my feelings have not changed. Or rather, more accurately, my feelings towards that cute little human morsel have only improved. She fought quite well during the battle for Mount Hyjal, didn't she? And not only that, she saved your life. That wasn't part of the plan. Chandri's smile slips for a moment, and she wiggles herself up Rognok's length before slamming herself back down forcefully. She growls, expressing just a bit of her heartbreak and anger as she begins to ride him as best as she can. I thought I lost you, you know. My mother had given my fellow sentinels orders to drag me from the battlefield kicking and screaming if need be when she finally gave the order to retreat. It wasn't until we reached the evacuation point that I found out you were teleported away just before Archimonde could turn you into paste beneath his hoof. Her solemn tone causes Rognok's breath to hitch. And then he frowns. I suppose I should have asked. We did it, right? We won. Chandris blinks and then giggles, realizing he's just woken up and didn't know yet. Though to be fair, he probably had a good idea of how things had worked out from what he'd overheard Chandris and Tyrande talking about. Nevertheless, the sentinel captain nods, smiling a somewhat watery smile as she bounces up and down on Rognok's cock, riding him hard and fast. It feels good the rougher she can make it. A little pain never hurt anyone. We won. The plan worked. The Defiler is dead. There were losses, of course, as I'm sure you know. But, we did it. We lived to fight another day. That seems to reinvigorate her orc lover, because the next thing she knows, Chandris is on her back again as Rognok rolls them over. He embraces her, his massive body covering her as he hugs her tightly. Grunting, he thrusts into her even as Chandris spreads her legs, which lift into the air from the sheer power of his thrusts. Embracing him right back by wrapping her arms around his head and pulling him down so they can touch forehead to forehead, Chandris smiles. We lived. You lived because of Jaina Proudmoore. So yes, Rognok. I'll happily share you with a human if she's willing to do the same. Left unsaid, or at least what Chandris leaves unsaid is what will happen if Jaina is not willing to do the same. She isn't about to demand Rognok answer that question right now. Even if she really has no clue how humans feel about sharing a man. For her, it seems perfectly reasonable. And Jaina did happily share Rognok during their first threesome together. But there's always a chance. If she's not willing, then I'll choose you. Chandris blinks, caught off guard by Rognek's sudden unprompted promise. Looking down into her eyes, the Orc Druid smiles. It's simple enough, isn't it? I like Jaina. I might even love her. But, you came first. If she can't accept that, then we were not meant to be. I will talk to her when the opportunity arises. And we shall see what she has to say. Speechless, a little taken aback and more than a little touched by his promise, Chandrese flushes for a moment before leaning up and biting into his shoulder for lack of anything better to do. As she digs her small fangs into his Orcish flesh, Rognek grunts, seemingly able to tell that she's no longer in the mood for talking, but still very much in the mood for talking. At some point, her teeth come free of his skin, because once he starts really pounding away at her cunt, fucking her non-stop with that impressively massive cock of his, Chandrese finds she simply can't be quiet. Her cries fill the tent and the air beyond, and her moans are only matched by the slapping of flesh against flesh as his hefty ballsack swings up into her shifting ass cheeks down below. Every time he punches into her with his Orcish mast, Chandrese sees stars. And every time he kisses her, she feels nothing but happiness as her tongue meets his, as she swirls it around his tusks, and as she moans into his mouth. His thick shaft fills her again and again, and all Chandrese has to do is hold on for dear life and take it. She meant every word she'd said about Jaina Proudmoore as well. The human had fought bravely. More than that, she was the only reason Rognek had survived the battle. For that, Chandrese was willing to make anything work. Though it did make her feel quite good to know Rognek would not allow the mage to force him to choose between them. Or rather, that if Jaina did, Rognek would choose her every time. Still, it wasn't as though the night elf expected Jaina to be difficult. And if she was, well, she'd just have to pay the human a visit herself. Maybe bring along the same rope she'd used on her before and remind her of what fun they'd had the first time around. For now though? For now it's Chandrese's time. The sentinel captain lets her eyes roll back and a wanton moan escape her mouth only to be swallowed up by Rognek's as he continues to piston into her time and time again. Her insides clench around his cock until he fills her up with his seed at long last. As far as starts to a mortal lifespan go, Chandrese decides this one isn't half bad. Not by a long shot. Chapter 34, After the Battle PT2. The celebration is well underway and Thrall, Warkif of the Horde, can't help but feel a swell of happiness as he stands alongside Cairn and Vol'jin, looking out over a massive party where all three groups who had stood in defense of Kalimdor can be seen peacefully coming ling. If you had told him that his people would not only one day fight side by side with humans, but also celebrate with them afterwards, Thrall isn't sure he would have believed it. But he cannot deny what is taking place right before his eyes. Orcs, Tauren, and Trolls exchange hearty laughter with night elves, humans, gnomes, and dwarves. They might have been split between their different bases during the battle, but now, after the fact, they engage in casual camaraderie that Thrall has to admit, makes him hopeful for the future. Indeed, that is why he stands with Cairn and Vol'jin now. Thrall has already spoken with his Orcish lieutenants, the chieftains of the Orc clans who have followed him from Lord Aaron all the way to Kalimdor. They stand at his back even now, ready to follow him into a brighter future for their people. Their victory over the Legion, to say nothing of the alliances they've managed to make since coming to these lands, has only served to further the trust that his people have in him. Needless to say, Thrall's leadership of the Orcish Horde is not likely to be questioned anytime soon. But at the same time, is this not supposed to be a new horde? Even in the old horde, there were more than just orcs. There were the ogres who traveled with them from Draenor, and the many trolls who allied with them against the high elves of Kulthalas. While Thrall had no intention of waging a war of conquest like his predecessors, that did not mean he should ignore everything they did. Especially Orgrim Doomhammer, who made allies of the disparate and downtrodden. Looking to his companions, Thrall grunts, drawing their attention over to him as he takes a swig of the grog in his mug. It burns going down, as good grog should. My friends. I would speak of our future. Of the future of our peoples. What say the two of you? There is quiet for a moment, before Cairn speaks up first, voice rumbling in his chest. The Bloodhoof tribe will always owe you and your orcs much, Warkif. Your horde. I would be honored to have my tribe join it. However, I seen an opportunity for more, an opportunity that you yourself have made possible with your actions. Thrall blinks at that, inclining his head in acknowledgement for Cairn to continue. After getting his thoughts in order, the Tauren chieftain does exactly that. For longer than I have walked this world, my people have suffered at the cruel predations of the centaurs, the quillboar, and the harpies. The centaurs most of all. With your people's help, the Bloodhoof tribe has done the unthinkable. We have managed to drive the centaur out of Mulgore and claim the grasslands of our ancestors for our own. For the first time in centuries, we have a chance to build something new. Looking out over the celebration, Cairn's eyes look almost misty, though Thrall acknowledges that might be a trick of the light. I wish to return to Mulgore with my tribe and create a refuge there. Not just for the courageous Bloodhoof braves who helped save Kalimdor from the Legion, but for all of the Tauren tribes. I believe, now that we have a chance to build ourselves a home, that the Tauren of Kalimdor will come flocking. And I believe, once they see what friendship with you and your orcs has wrought, they will see the wisdom in joining your horde officially. Turning to him fully, Cairn drops to one knee and bows his head, placing a fist on his chest. I say to you now, Warkif Thrall. Ask it of me and I will remain. I and my Bloodhoof braves will join you and your horde here and now. But release us to return to the grasslands, and I will bring you tenfold what you have now. Thrall is quick to place a hand on his friend's broad shoulder, feeling immediately uncomfortable at Cairn's show of support. Please my friend, please rise. Cairn does so, even as Thrall smiles. As always, your wisdom is unmatched, Cairn. You need not ask me for permission to do something that will undeniably benefit your people. Nor are you my servant, for me to order around and abuse. Go, chieftain of the Bloodhoof tribe. Return to Mulgore. Create a home for your people. Rally the Tauren to your cause. And when you return to me, I will happily clasp arms with you, as brother. Cairn bows his head, and Thrall nods at the honorable Tauren. Then, he looks to Vol'jin. The Shadow Hunter chuckles, crouching low to the ground as was his people's preference. Ah! I cannot be offering ye such heady promises, Warkif. Day trolls of Kalimdor not be so easily swayed, I'm afraid. My people have long memories, Monday. They remember their empires, even to this day. Shaking himself, Vol'jin snorts. They also not all be as nice as Day Darkspear tribe. But, we never be forgettin' what the Horde did for us neither. This be my solemn vow, as chieftain of Day Darkspear. From now until the end, we fight for you, Warkif. For the Horde. That's more than fair. Indeed, Cairn's heady promise had already taken Thrall aback. He knew better than to expect that Vol'jin would be able to do the same with his own people's tribes. The trolls, from what Thrall knew, were scattered all across the face of Azeroth, whereas the Tauren had never left Kalimdor before. Nodding to Vol'jin, Thrall smiles warmly. I require nothing else from you, my friend. For the Horde. Before any of them can speak again, a female voice suddenly rings out from the party. A toast. A toast, please. All eyes, including Thrall and his allies, turn towards Lady Jaina Proudmoore as she holds up a cup. No one hesitates to hold a cup of their own up or go and find one as well. No one dares to sneer or turn away from the woman who saved so many of them from the jaws of death with her powerful arcane magic. Without Jaina's teleportation, many more of both her own people and the Horde would have died during the battle for Mount Hyjal. That is indisputable. Holding her glass high, Jaina speaks loudly and clearly as silence falls over the celebration, everyone listening to her words. A toast to Duke Lionheart, Paladin of the Order of the Silver Hand. A brave man. A good fighter. A stalwart knight. Even in his advanced age, he followed me across the sea to this strange, unknown place. He fought with me to protect our new home, and he fought alongside all of us to save Azeroth from the Burning Legion. He and his fellow knights fell in honorable battle, so that I and others might survive, so that we might escape. Please, to Duke Lionheart. Duke Lionheart. Sir Lionheart. For the Silver Hand. Cries rise up among Jaina's people at first, but the toast is quickly taken up by others as well. Thrall smiles as he sees orcs raise their mugs and let out roars, beating their chests with fists in honor of the human warrior. Thrall himself raises his mug and does the same, remembering Duke Lionheart well. He might not have known the human paladin personally, but in his handful of interactions with him, he'd never got the impression that the man blamed any of them for the actions of the old Horde. A rare and honorable individual indeed. That said, something Jaina has said prompts Thrall to step forward, even as the cries start to die down. When people begin to notice him, they fall silent all the quicker, and his orcs begin stomping their feet, drawing more and more attention to the orc Warkif. Jaina herself turns his way, even as Thrall holds his mug up to her next. Another toast. A toast to Lady Jaina Proudmoore. If not for her magic, I and my warriors would not have escaped the Legion's advance. To fall in battle protecting your home is a warrior's greatest honor. But to live to fight another day, is priceless. And we still have much to do here on Kalimdor. To Lady Proudmoore. To our new home. More cries. More roars. Jaina blushes but smiles and dips her head, accepting the praise without comment. Of course, now that Jaina and Thrall have both done it, things quickly become a series of toasts from all sorts of people to others. Be they fallen heroes, or even living warriors who had comported themselves well in battle. The following toasts are smaller affairs, with smaller groups cheering for them as they start up all over the party. Meanwhile, Jaina makes her way over to Thrall as he steps back to where Cairn and Vol'jin await her. She gives them each a nod of her head, acknowledging them before sipping from her glass. Thrall, after a moment's hesitation, goes for broke. We were just discussing the future of the Horde, Lady Proudmoore. I wonder, how do you see yourself fitting into that future if you don't mind me asking? It's possible she'll take his question as an unintended insult, but Thrall considers it worth the risk. Of course, the moment she processes his words and freezes in place, he knows that the best case scenario is too much to hope for. Apologies. I will be blunt. I do not see my people ever joining the Horde, Warkif. I acknowledge that your new Horde is not like the old, but you are still orcs. And as much as we have proven that humans and orcs cannot only fight side by side but also live in harmony with one another, my people will never accept putting themselves under the leadership of an orc Warkif. And I would be doing a disservice to them if I tried to force the issue. It's simply a bridge too far. Jaina looks pained as she says this. But Thrall understands. More than that, it was only to be expected. She's right, after all. It's one thing for Cairn and Vol'jin to swear loyalty to him and his Horde. But Jaina represents people who have suffered at the hands of orcs in the past. And while those wounds have healed, the scars that remain will forever run deep. Tilting his head towards Jaina to show there is no offense, Thrall rumbles. I understand, Lady Proudmoore. You are right, of course. Jaina smiles a weak smile and takes another sip from her glass before throwing out a lifeline. Still, I do not believe that precludes there being peace between our two peoples. Already, my ships are scouting the coastline of Kalimdor for a suitable place to build a harbor. Given that the vast majority of able-bodied men I brought from Lord Aaron have at least some sailing background by this point, we think it best that we build our new home on the coast, if not an island, if a suitable one can be found. I shall make sure that word is sent when we decide where we are settling down roots. There is no reason that our two peoples cannot peacefully coexist, especially when Kalimdor is such a big place. She sounds hopeful. Eager, even. It's obvious that the thought of settling somewhere fills Jaina with excitement. And honestly, that excitement is infectious. But Thrall still finds himself feeling a little cynical. He hums, about to reply, when Jaina suddenly perks up. Her gaze has caught upon something off in the distance, or rather someone. Before Thrall can speak, she turns back to them and bows her head respectfully. It has been a pleasure, but I must be off. Thank you for your time. And with that, the human mage moves back into the crowded celebration, making a beeline for a certain warsong chieftain who has just showed his face at long last. As Jaina goes to Rognak, Thrall watches the two of them, not entirely sure what to think if he's being honest. At his sides, Cairn and Vol'jin both have their own thoughts on the matter. Well, if nothing else, it would seem the ties between orcs and humans might be able to get even stronger with some more time. Monday. Specifically the ties between dat orc and dat human, Thrall chuckles good-naturedly at the teasing, hiding the inner turmoil that he feels as he watches Jaina encircle one of Rognak's large, thick arms with her own and guide him away from the main area that the celebration is taking place in. It is not jealousy that Thrall is feeling right now. He does not wish he were in Rognak's place, especially since he knows the warsong chieftain is currently being courted by two different women at once. He does not envy the Orc Druid having to figure out how to navigate his relationships with Chandri's Feathermoon and Jaina Proudmoore. Still, a part of Thrall wonders at the bonds that Rognak is forging. After the internment of their people, the flight from Lord Aaron, and the battles here on Kalimdor, the Orcish clans have weakened in their individualism, by and large. There is no longer so much separation between the orcs who remain. They are, for the first time in history, all one people, all one horde in truth. Save for one. The Warsong clan still stands a step apart from the rest of the horde. With their druids and their bonds with the Night Elves, they have the most clan identity remaining. This in and of itself is not a bad thing, but combined with Rognak's actions, many of which are taken without consulting his Warkif, sometimes Thrall wonders if Rognak truly sees him as his superior. Or if the Warsong chieftain instead views them as peers. Thrall is not so small-minded that he needs to be kowtowed or bowed to in submission or subservience. But for all the good Rognak has done for their people, he will always be the orc who killed Thrall's brother. And while Grommash might have forgiven Rognak for his actions, Thrall isn't so sure he'll ever be able to do the same. Even still, Thrall would not allow himself to fall into a spiral of self-doubt. The future was brighter than ever, and he would be doing a disservice both to himself and the horde if he started chasing shadows and making enemies where there were none. Rognak was an ally. And his bonds with the Night Elves and humans would hopefully only enrich and strengthen the horde in the end. And if they did not, well, Thrall would cross that bridge when he came to it, he supposed. Chapter 34.5, After the Battle PT2, Lude. Jaina, SHHH. Jaina blushes as she insistently tugs on his hand. Fortunately, despite a frown on his face, the large orc druid doesn't fight her. After all, she knows full well that she doesn't have the stature or the physical strength to move him if he doesn't want to be moved. Not without magic anyways, and she's obviously not going to resort to that. Luckily, he allows her to pull him along, letting her drag him a little way away from the party into a more secluded area. Once Jaina deems them far enough away from everyone else, the human mage turns to him. Then, she takes the hand she's been pulling on and carefully uncurls his index finger from it, before sliding that finger down between her legs and up against her crotch. Her breath hitches as the hefty, thick, Orcish finger makes contact with her sex, albeit with her robes and undergarments between their flesh. Nevertheless, Jaina is sure that Rognak can feel just how warm her core is. No doubt he can smell just how aroused she is right now, her insides hot and needy. But, it's more than physical need. It's so much more than that. Jaina. Rognak says her name somewhat slowly, looking into her eyes as she stares back at him with a bright red blush across her features. He doesn't try to remove his finger though. Nor does he move it, however. Instead, as she finds herself resting upon that digit, he looks at her and smiles softly. I haven't gotten the chance to thank you properly, yet. You saved my life. That, at least, is easy enough to respond to. Thrusting out her chin, Jaina shakes her head. No need for thanks. I was just doing my duty. Nothing more. Rognak scoffs at that, his finger still pressed against her core. She probably shouldn't be enjoying the contact as much as he is, but, well, he is an orc. His soul green finger is as big as a human's, well, it's big, suffice to say. And she likes that he's not removing it while they have this conversation. Don't try to downplay it. Your duty was to your people and the Warkif and his forces. No one expected you to have any mana left for anything beyond that, and drinking more potions than you'd already had must have put you in danger. You risked yourself to save me, Jaina. I owe you my life. Biting her lower lip, Jaina leans forward and presses her forehead into Rognak's chest. I don't accept it. You owe me and nothing. I did what I did for purely selfish reasons. There were probably others I could have saved, after all. But I chose you. Because. She trails off here, almost not trusting herself to speak. In that moment, Jaina finds herself thinking back to the conversation she just had with Thrall and the others back at the party. The same reasons that she'd given the Orc Warkif for why her and her people could never join the Horde officially, they sort of held true for why Jaina shouldn't be considering going through with this confession right now. And yet, the battle was over. Their world was saved. And most importantly of all, both her and Rognak had survived. With things all said and done, Jaina was forced to confront her feelings regarding the night of passion that she had shared with the Orc Druid and Chandri's Feather Moon. She was forced to acknowledge a simple truth: she had never been happier. She didn't want to give up on that happiness. And though her shoulders bowed slightly under the weight of her duty to her people and the responsibility she had to see them settled in these new lands, Jaina also wanted to be a little bit selfish and carve out something for just herself as well. So that's what she would do. Rognak. I saved your life, because I want to be with you. Because somehow, somewhere along the way, you have managed to secure a place for yourself in my heart. Jaina blushes even harder the moment the words are out. She'd just said such a cheesy thing, and with his finger still pressed up between her thighs too. Wiggling atop his digit, the mage almost wants to flee, to use her magic to blink away and run. But she doesn't. She needs to know he's heard her. And more, she needs to hear his answer in turn. Jaina. I am happy to be more than just friends. To explore a relationship with you in the long term, now that we have saved Kalimdor and achieved a lasting peace, hopefully. However, you should know. I cannot discard Chandri's. She has confessed similar feelings for me. Blinking, Jaina processes the orc's words, spoken in a grave tone. She finally lifts her head, looking him in the eye for a moment before smiling brightly. Is that all? He looks a little taken aback by that, even as Jaina pushes up onto her tiptoes, wrapping her arms around his broad shoulders. The mage is quite tall for a human, but face to face with an orc, her height barely gives her any sort of advantage. Still, she can at least do this much. Pushing up on her toes, his fingers still pressing against her core, Jaina kisses Rognak. He grunts, and then wraps his free arm around her waist, hoisting her up into his hold and kissing her back. For a long moment, that's all they do with one another. Making out slowly, tenderly. It's nice to just have a moment alone with him. Chandri's had been a whirlwind that had come into Jaina's life and forced her to confront some uncomfortable truths about herself and what she wanted. And while Jaina would never not be grateful to the Night Elf Sentinel, she had to admit she was glad now to be able to speak her mind to Rognak without Chandri's being present. When they finally pull apart, Jaina smiles at Rognak, her eyes dancing with mirth. I do not mind sharing you with her, Rognak. Chandri's Feather Moon is a very aggressive sort. She knows what she wants and she moves to take it. I can respect that. So long as I can have a place in your heart as you have a place in mine. I do not require anything more. The three of us shared something physical before. I see no reason that we all can't share something beyond the physical as well. Rognak looks blown away for all of a moment, before seizing upon her with a happy growl. Lifting her up even further, Jaina lets out a yelp followed by a breathless laugh as she wraps her legs around his waist as best she can in the same way her arms are wrapped around his neck. Of course, then he falls back with her, landing hard on the floor though to no ill effect that she can see. Straddling him, sitting atop him, Jaina blushes as she feels his erection beginning to grow and press against her from below. Wasting no time, wanting to give him no chance to change his mind on her, the Lady Proudmoore reaches down and hikes up her robes, lifting her skirts and tugging her panties to the side. His finger is thus replaced with his cock, only for Jaina to gasp as she feels the huge slab of orcish meat pressing up against her. She'd almost forgotten just how big he was. Having him inside of her that first time. Jaina was almost grateful for Chandri's efforts in preparing her for Rognak's size. She couldn't say one way or the other whether the Orc Druid was particularly gifted for his race or not. But one thing was certain, Orc phalluses were not exactly made for humans in mind. That hadn't stopped Jaina from taking him while Chandri's had her bound up and presented as a tribute to the well-endowed druid. And it wouldn't stop her from taking him now. Still, Jaina can't help but wince a little bit, as she fits his mammoth-sized cockhead against her slit and begins to try to wiggle down his length. A soft whimper leaves her lips, prompting Rognak's hands to fall upon her hips as he grunts. Here, let me help. Jaina isn't sure what he does next, only that it works. An application of some sort of nature magic, maybe? Either way, all she knows is one moment her cunt, despite being wet with arousal, is struggling to slide down his length. The next, she's beyond wet, she's positively sopping, and her pussy stretches like it's only done once before as she slowly slides along his shaft, impaling herself upon his cock. A throaty, wanton moan leaves Jaina's throat as she finds herself straddling him properly, her hands coming down to rest on his incredibly broad, orcish chest. Rognak, meanwhile, looks up at her with a smile, his hands still resting on his hips. He's not doing anything though. He's letting her take him at her own pace. Making a split-second decision, Jaina reaches down and yanks her robes up and over her head, taking them off altogether. Exposing herself, she quickly removes her bra as well, tossing it aside. Clad only in her panties which at this point are pulled to the side to allow him access and could only be removed by ripping them off entirely, Jaina leans forward, placing another kiss on Rognak's mouth as she presses her tits into his chest. Her rock-hard nipples rub against his burly green chest in a most satisfying manner, even as she moans against his lips. Down below, her pussy pulses around his cock, her insides clenching and squeezing all along his massive length. Initially, she does what she does because she's too afraid to move. But once she's stripped down to practically nothing and is rubbing her nude body against him, Jaina overcomes that fear. Slowly, she lifts her ass up into the air, sliding inch after inch of Rognek's thick green prick out of her squeezing, sucking cunt. Her inner walls and pussy lips try to hold onto him for dear life until she reaches the halfway point, at which time they start trying to push the intruder out with all their might instead. Jaina isn't about to let them have their way though, regardless. With a cry muffled by Rognek's mouth, the Lady Proud more positively slams herself back down his length. She moans into his lips as she fills herself back up with his dick, only to pull up and then do it again. The sound of flesh slapping against flesh fills the air. It feels so good, to drive herself down and impale herself upon Rognek's cock over and over. And he seems to agree, if his grunts and groans are anything to go off of. His hands, large and orcish that they are, slide up and down her body, groping and squeezing different parts of her plush, voluptuous figure. Jaina knows she's not like Chandri's. She has a human's body, and a mage's body besides. She's soft and pillowy in all the right places to make Rognek happy though, just as she imagines Chandri's is taut and firm in all the right places as well. In a way, they're two sides of femininity, making them well positioned to share a lover as versatile and virile as Rognek between them. Or so Jaina tells herself. Obviously, polyamory is not something that the young woman ever thought she would be finding herself engaging in. Events have led to a set of circumstances that leave her happiness on the line, however. And for that, she will stop at nothing to have Rognek. This she's decided. She made that decision when she let Chandri's tie her up just so Jaina could have a chance with the orc. She'd made the decision again when she'd saved him from certain death at the hands of the defiler. It felt like life had been doing nothing but beating her down for a long time now. Only her purpose had really kept her going. First in trying to stop the plague alongside Arthas, and then when that failed so catastrophically, she'd turned to a new purpose of evacuating as many people to Kalimdor as possible. And she still had a purpose. She still had people who were counting on her to lead them and protect them. But at the same time, Jaina had decided she would grab onto this happiness with both hands and never let go. As she bounces upon Rognek's cock, as she rides him and moans and quakes atop his member, Jaina knows beyond a shadow of a doubt that she's going to hold tight. A particularly powerful thrust leaves her tipping over the edge and climaxing upon the Orc Druid's member. A quivering, shivering, trembling orgasm runs through her body as Jaina moans even louder into Rognek's mouth. He holds her steady, his hands having settled on her ass, his fingers digging into her plush, pillowy backside. She's glad he finds it to his liking. She's glad he finds all of her to his liking. A moment after she comes for him, Rognek groans and comes for her in turn. His seed spills forth from his cock, his churning balls letting loose a torrent of a load that fills and fills her womb. Jaina gasps as she's stuffed for the second time to the brim, shuddering as she feels herself growing more and more bloated in such a satisfying way. By the time he's done, she feels, packed with his seed. Just the way she likes it, at that. Shivering, Jaina pulls back, running her hands down her body, across her breasts and her pronounced nipples and over her distended abdomen. And she smiles down at Rognek, knowing that this was the beginning of the rest of their future together. Azeroth was saved. Archimonde was dead. And the peoples of Kalimdor had come together to make that happen. She and her people might not be able to join with the Horde, but Jaina wouldn't let the peace and camaraderie they'd managed to achieve disappear without a fight. She would hold onto it just as hard as she intended to hold onto Rognek. She refused to let any of it slip through her fingers. For now though, she drops forward onto Rognek's chest again after pulling herself up off of his cock. She cuddles with him in the afterglow of their coupling, and smiles as he holds her to him, wrapping her up in his big, strong arms. For now, they could rest. They'd more than earned it. Chapter 35, The Nightmare. Fondrel. Lord Cenarius. The tone that Fondrel Staghelm takes is one that has Cenarius narrowing his eyes at the Night Elf Archdruid in response. It's not quite disrespectful, but it's certainly towing the line. You seem unhappy to be here, Archdruid Staghelm. One would think you would jump at the chance to convince me your plan for a new world tree is not the depths of folly. Fondrel's lips thin out and then pull back in the faintest hint of a snarl at that. Respectfully, Lord Cenarius. I shouldn't have to convince you. This new world tree I have in mind, it should be something you have no problem putting your support behind. After all, are we not your children? Would you see us wither away and die after it was your plan that saw Nordrassil burn in the first place? From his hiding place nearby, Rognek intakes sharply at that. That was no longer towing the line. Now Fondrel was indeed being disrespectful to the Lord of the Forest. Still, there wasn't anything actionable in the things he'd said just yet. In fact, his anger was perfectly reasonable if you took everything people knew about him on a surface level alone. That doesn't stop the Night Elf Druid hidden at Rognek's side from stiffening at Fondrel's tone, however. It had been a couple months now since the battle for Mount Hyjal. With the Legion's second invasion of Azeroth a complete and utter failure, they had all been able to turn their attention towards other problems. Rognek certainly preferred focusing on the myriad of things currently on his plate, if nothing else than to be able to avoid thinking too long and hard on his mess of a love life. Oh, don't get him wrong. Chandri's and Jaina were both great. He just wasn't sure how he'd ended up in a committed relationship with both of them, and with the two not just aware of the other but completely okay with it as well. But, in the end, it wasn't relevant to the matter at hand. Which meant that Rognek could set it aside for now and focus on Fondrel Staghelm and the threat he posed to everything. Teldrassil was a nice idea in theory. On paper, it made sense. With the loss of Nordrassil, why not? Why shouldn't the Night Elves try to build a new home for themselves? Except Rognak knew better. He knew exactly what Fondrel was really up to, just as he knew that the attempt to regain their immortality would ultimately fail. Teldrassil would wind up a twisted nightmare of what they were trying to create, and worst of all, the real cost of planting it would not be felt for many years to come. Well, not this time around. This time around they had a chance to nip this in the bud, literally. With no Teldrassil, Fondrel would have no central location to plant the cutting from the Nightmare Lord's tree. He would not be able to corrupt the Night Elf's new home at its roots. In the end, the Night Elf people didn't need Teldrassil. In fact, Rognak privately felt like its creation made them too isolated and insular from their own lands. When the majority of the Night Elves moved to the New World Tree to be under Fondrel and Tyranda's combined aegis, it seemed to Rognak that had left the Night Elf lands on the main continent underpopulated and thus underdefended. Everything from demons to Naga to, yes, even his own people the Orcs had been able to take chunks out of Night Elven lands practically uncontested, or so it felt like. This time around, Rognak wanted to keep the Night Elves closer. Not just because they and the Orcs had a much better relationship and he wanted to continue strengthening those ties, but also so that they would confront the problems plaguing their forests and not allow them to fester well into the future. Without Teldrassil to distract and bog them down, it was Rognak's hope that Northern Kalimdor could truly prosper. But first, Fondrel. You would do well to watch your words with me, Fondrel. Archdruid you might be, but I walked these forests before your people took their first steps. If you wish to have my blessing in taking Malfurion's place among the Night Elves, you will show me respect. Fondrel's jaw clenches, and his body tenses like a pulled taut bow. Rognak himself tenses up as well, waiting for the moment when the Archdruid would attack. There was a reason for all of this, Theodore, to be clear. Cenarius believed him of course. He believed that Rognak was telling the truth about Fondrel's allegiances and his treachery. However, when they discussed Rognak's memories of the original events, Cenarius had been concerned by what the Orc Druid had to say about Fondrel's original ambush of Malfurion. Or rather, what he didn't have to say. The truth was, Rognak didn't know how Fondrel had taken Malfurion down in the original version of events. His second set of memories were incredibly vague. Cenarius had taken this into consideration, and decided they needed backup. Which was why Brawl Bearmantle was here now. The Antlered Druid had comported himself well in the Battle of Mount Hyjal. He'd been part of the crew fighting within Fondrel's Tree of Eternity in fact. When the tree had gone down, it had been Brawl's daughter who pulled her father free, and his daughter who had dragged him over to her lightsaber and evacuated him from the area. She'd saved his life, and Rognak was glad for that. But having him here now meant they needed Fondrel to confess. They needed incontrovertible proof that the Archdruid was working with the Nightmare Lord, for Brawl's sake if nothing else. However, while Fondrel tenses up, he doesn't attack as Rognak is hoping he would. Instead, he keeps speaking. I wonder, Lord Cenarius, if you ever intend to give me your blessing. You already seek to stifle me at every turn. You call me Archdruid, but you reject the idea of a new world tree, of renewed immortality for our people. And you spend all of your time cavorting with those savages instead of those of us who have followed you loyally for more than 10,000 years. Will you see me elevated to Malfurion's old position, or will you put your pet orc in what is rightfully my place instead? Wow. That was. Rognak has to hold in a snort, imagining himself being named Archdruid of the Night Elf people instead of Fondrel, of being tasked with essentially setting druidic policy for a bunch of elven druids who are over 10,000 years older than him. Yeah, that would be pretty ridiculous. But then, that right there exposes the flaw in Fondrel's entire argument. He's grasping at straws here. Nature is savagery, Fondrel Staghelm. It is savagery manifest, in its purest form. The young Warsong chieftain and his students require more of my attention and tutelage than you or yours do. Unless you think I somehow went wrong in my original teaching of your people, and that you all need remedial training. Fondrel bristles at having his words thrown back in his face like that. His teeth grind together as his jaw remains clenched and his hands curl into fists at his side. After a moment, he snarls. So then you admit your favoritism. You admit that it is these idiotic, muscle-bound creatures who have your focus. For a long moment, Cenarius is quiet. When he finally speaks, his tone is deceptively soft. I admit nothing, Fondrel. Save that you continue to disappoint me at every turn. Is this the depth of your persuasive abilities? Insulting me and my students while trying to convince me to see things your way? Or perhaps is it merely that you never intended to persuade me of anything at all? The Archdruid goes stiff at that, his eyes widening at Cenarius' accusation. Gazing down upon the Night Elf, Cenarius gestures at Fondrel with a set of branch-like claws. You reek of it, Fondrel. How long, I wonder? How long have you served your master the Nightmare Lord? Rognak grows tense again, ready to spring into action now that Cenarius has accelerated this conversation towards what feels like its inevitable violent conclusion. The thing is, he's pretty sure the forest demigod is bluffing. Cenarius had confided in Rognak multiple times before now that he truly couldn't sense Fondrel's duplicity. It was hidden from his senses far too well, and while he'd been able to check on other things to confirm the threat of the Emerald Nightmare and the Nightmare Lord were both very real, Fondrel gave off not a whiff. It was almost enough to make Rognak himself doubt whether or not the Archdruid had been turned yet. Was it possible he remembered incorrectly? Was it possible that Fondrel didn't even know he was a double agent, somehow? But no. At Cenarius' words, Fondrel Staghelm slowly begins to change, his entire countenance morphing from haughty to shocked in an instant. You, how? How can you possibly know? For a moment, Cenarius lets the Archdruid's question hang in the air. Then, he shakes his head. I didn't. Not for sure. Not until you confirmed it for me, Fondrel. And there it is. Rognak is hardly surprised when Fondrel freezes for a brief moment before letting out a howl of anger at being tricked. But then, a duplicitous traitor had no reason to be mad over being the victim of duplicity in turn, really. Alas, Fondrel clearly didn't get the memo. You ask me how long? Long enough. Long enough to know that the Nightmare Lord's path is the only way forward. Long enough to know that this world is wrong. And the only way to make it right is through the nightmare itself. Wisps of darkness and shadow begin to coil and grow off of Fondrel's being. Cenarius takes a step back and Rognak and Brawl both rise from their hiding places. A quick glance at the antlered night elf shows that Brawl Baremantle has seen and heard more than enough. The druid looks infuriated by Fondrel's treachery, his teeth bared in an enraged snarl. Fondrel. What have you done? Whipping around, Fondrel's eyes go wide from under the shadow roiling off of them. As it coils around his body, pulling at his feet more and more, he growls. So then. A trap. I suppose I should have known. Oh, but this is perfect. 3 birds with 1 stone. Before any of them can react, Fondrel throws his hand out in Cenarius' direction. Rognak's eyes widen as a powerful working of nightmarish power flings from his shadow and slams into the Lord of the Forest. The demigod grunts, and then slumps, falling to the ground as a coating of the disgusting oily black ooze covers him. Turning back to them, Fondrel lets out a dark chuckle, looking like quite the madman now as he spreads his arms wide. Did you think Lord Xavius did not send me here without a way to disable a wild god? I might not have a second and third working for you too, but that's fine. It's better this way, in fact. I will enjoy rending you both limb from limb. And then, with all 3 of you out of my way, the path forward will be clear. Teldrassil will be planted. A monument to the Nightmare Lord in every way. Rognak unslings Wolf Song from his back, while Brawl begins to transform into his namesake, a massive bear steadily taking up more and more space in the cavern where Cenarius and Fondrel came to meet. But if Fondrel is worried, he doesn't show it. In fact, he laughs at them some more, the most joy that Rognak has seen from the dour, haughty and altogether arrogant blowhard of an archdruid since they met. Even together, you two cannot defeat me. But I will enjoy watching you try and fail all the same. However, before battle can be joined, before Rognak and Brawl can rush forward or Fondrel can lunge towards them with shadowy claws outstretched, there's a chime. A single chime, but one that startles Fondrel and causes him to whip around in confusion. What? No. There, hovering in the air right above Cenarius' downed form, is a single glimmer of emerald light. However, it does not stay so small. Another chime sounds, and the glimmer doubles in size. And then again. And again. Fondrel howls and goes to charge at it, but Rognak reaches out and roots erupt from the ground, assailing the Archdruid's footwork. It's only the work of moments for Fondrel to break himself free of Rognak's distraction, but in the end, moments are all that are needed. By the time he's able to focus on the emerald light again, it has coalesced into a being. Floating in the air above the incapacitated Lord of the Forest is the glowing green ghostly form of Malfurion Stormrage. Did you think Cenarius foolish enough to meet with you without assistance from the dream, given what he suspected Fondrel? Did you really think it would be that easy? He looks coldly down upon Fondrel as the other Archdruid gapes up at him, and then with purpose and intent, reaches down and brushes a single emerald hand across his teacher's brow. In an instant, the coiling, writhing mass of shadow and inky blackness that has covered the Lord of the Forest is dispelled. Blasted apart by the illuminating green energy of the emerald dream itself. The Nightmare Lord had long survived by hiding in the shadows. And while events over the next several years would have originally given him all the power he needed to come out into the light without fear, those events had not taken place just yet. For now, at least, the dream was still stronger than the nightmare. Cenarius intakes sharply and Fondrel's eyes widen as he lets out a howl of anger. No. But it's much too late. The traitorous Archdruid's attacks are blocked by the awakened Lord of the Forest, who rises back to his feet after deflecting Fondrel's desperate charge and pushing him away. Eyes narrowed now in righteous fury, the forest demigod rises to his full height before wincing a bit. Still, even though he's clearly not quite at his best, Cenarius nevertheless speaks with a clear and decisive tone. Fondrel Staghelm. You have betrayed your people. You have betrayed the Emerald Dream. And you have betrayed yourself. Surrender, and submit to the judgment of those you have wronged. Surrender, surrender? Ahaha, ahahaha. Bahahaha. Rognak's hands clench tightly around Wolfsong's haft. He knows even before the maniacal laughter starts up that there's no way Fondrel will surrender without a fight. They've made their moves. They've exposed Fondrel's treason. They've managed to block the Archdruid's attempt at taking Cenarius out of the fight. But the battle has only just begun. Chapter 36, The Nightmare PT2. As swiftly as Fondrel's mad cackling starts up, it comes to an abrupt end and the broken Archdruid attacks. Coiling, writhing shadows lash out from his person in all directions, and he snarls as he reaches for them with malicious intent. There's no question now that's obvious, as Rotha's first satyr and the self-styled Nightmare Lord, has sunk his claws deep into Fondrel Staghelm long before now. Nature itself is twisted and perverted in the corrupted Archdruid's presence. Control of the roots that Rognak had used to halt Fondrel's advance is abruptly usurped, with Fondrel forcing them to do his bidding, coating them in inky darkness. Being a druid, utilizing nature's power, it's a give and take. It's as much about communing with nature as anything else. Only with a particularly strong bond could you hope to use even a fraction of the abilities that Rognak remembered from the game in his second set of memories. Of course, for Rognak, it had always been all too easy. He knew now that he was born that way, born with the blessing of dozens of beings already intrinsically bound with nature itself. By comparison, Fondrel isn't communing with nature. Nor does he have the blessing of any of its ancient guardians. No, the corrupted Archdruid uses his shadowy gifts from the Nightmare Lord to dominate nature, to force it to do his bidding. In an instant, the roots that he's taken control of have risen out of the ground entirely, forming into a plethora of twisted, darkened, shadowy treants. Corrupted and gnarled in appearance, the treants open their mouths in snarls, revealing gaping pits of darkness as they all begin moving forward, the vast majority heading straight for Rognak himself. Gritting his teeth, the Orc Druid holds Wolfsong at the ready. In the end, it would appear that an orc would end up cutting down some night elf trees after all. Funny how the world works sometimes. As the first of the treants reaches him, he pulls back from its opening lunge and swings through it a moment later, cutting it limb from limb. But by the time he's done dismembering the first, 3 more have arrived behind it and he finds himself beset on all sides by the twisted, shadowy creatures. Still, Wolfsong glows with green light. It shines with nature's blessing, and every last one of Rognak's swings is true. Which is good, because any time he reaches for his connection with the nature around him, Rognak is forced to pull back. Darkness suffuses every element of the cavern. Their trap for Fondrel has been turned around on them, becoming a trap for them instead. In this dark, dank place, Fondrel calls upon more and more of the Nightmare Lord's power, and it's obvious that he's getting quite the answer from his master. Yes. More. Give me the strength to end these fools. I swear, Lord Xavius, I won't let them stop us. Fortunately, someone like Brawl Bearmantel's strength in the druidic arts lies inward instead of outward. While their ability to rely upon the nature around them has been curtailed, that does not mean they cannot still fight. Indeed, the antlered night elf has transformed into a hulking bear and even now is trying to fight his way to Fondrel, just as they all are. Still, Brawl is having the most luck of it. The twisted treants that Fondrel has summoned to support him in this battle are battered away by Brawl's massive form even faster than Rognak can swing Wolfsong into them. Meanwhile, Cenarius is still fully recovering. The Lord of the Forest has managed to take to his feet, and Malfurion's emerald form remains beside him, sheltering and shielding him from the remnants of whatever spell Fondrel cast upon him. However, it's obvious from the grimace on Cenarius' face that Fondrel's disruption of the nature in this place is getting to the demigod. It makes sense. Cenarius is the most attuned to nature of all 4 of them. Even Malfurion, who technically only exists in the Emerald Dream right now, can't hold a candle to what the demigod is capable of. But the strength of that bond seems to be causing debilitating effects right now, with so much of what makes Cenarius who he is cut off and unavailable to the forest demigod. Meanwhile, Fondrel is preparing something. Something as dark and twisted as everything else he's done so far, if not more so. Above the corrupted Archdruid's head, a cloud has begun to spiral into existence. Taking up the entire roof of the cavern, it grows blacker and darker by the moment, with purple and red sparks of malevolent-looking lightning coming off of it more and more. Whatever that is, Rognak is sure that none of them want to find out. Fortunately, Brawl is closing in on Fondrel and might just be able to disrupt the other night elf's concentration. Unfortunately, Fondrel has noticed this and sneers, proving that he can multitask quite easily with the Nightmare Lord's help. One of the Archdruid's arms, covered in roiling blackness, thrusts out towards Brawl in his massive, hulking bear form. Entangling roots that put Rognak's earlier distraction to shame come bursting out of the ground beneath the enraged bear. Grasping at his limbs, they endeavor to hold him down. To his credit, Brawl fights them with all his might, and even starts to break free, ripping himself out of their clutches. However, it's not fast enough. Fondrel's other arm is still raised high in the air, his hands swirling around and making the massive pitch-black cloud over their heads swirl around as well. The corrupted Archdruid is creating a hurricane, Rognak belatedly realizes. But with the added elements of nightmare, the Orc Druid has no clue what form that will ultimately take. In the end, he sees only one choice. He's still harassed on all sides by the corrupted treants that Fondrel has summoned. Every one he cuts down, 2 more take its place. Cenarius and Malfurion's shade are likewise boxed in, and Brawl is slowed by the roots. Their options have dwindled and they need a Hail Mary. So, Rognak does what must be done. With a roar, he shoulder checks a treant in his way and then, before another can take its place, he winds up, and throws. Depriving himself of his only weapon when his connection to nature was currently very suspect might not be the smartest move, but it was still the only move he had to make. Wolfsong goes flying through the air, spinning rapidly, and then it makes contact and the glowing green blade of the large axe slices right through Fondrel Stagilm's upraised arm. The dark hurricane that the corrupted Archdruid was summoning sputters and begins to fade, even as Wolfsong goes clattering into the distance and Fondrel howls in pain. Rognak only gets a moment to feel satisfaction at the Archdruid's maiming however, before he's beset once more by the twisted treants, this time without his axe to chop them to pieces. With a snarl, he takes on the form of a bear as well, fighting them back and swiping at them with his claws. It's not remotely as effective as an axe, but it's not nothing. They aren't going to be able to kill him like this, merely pin him down. Still, with Fondrel so heavily damaged. Misbegotten wretch. Worthless mortal savage. My arm. Graya. As he rears back on his hind legs to stomp down on a treant, Rognak sees across the cavern as Fondrel's missing arm is replaced by a grotesque limb of shadow and oily darkness. He looks absolutely pissed, but he's not nearly as hurt as Rognak would have preferred. The Nightmare Lord must be interfering even more than he would have imagined. Even with all of their precautions, it would seem that they've underestimated how much their enemies can bring to bear here. Of course, just as Rognak is starting to get really worried, there's a sudden surge of power from Cenarius' direction. Abruptly, the darkness blocking their connection to nature is blasted away, destroyed in a moment. The shadows that Rognak hadn't even realized were coiling around the cavern more and more, are suddenly pushed back all the way to their source. Fondrel Staghelm himself. This time, when Rognak kills a treant, another doesn't immediately rise from the floor to take its place. When Brawl swipes away more roots that seek to entangle him, he actually makes progress, breaking free and pushing forward. And finally, when Rognak looks over at Cenarius and Malfurion, it's to see the Lord of the Forest truly standing tall now, the grimace from before gone. The Forest Demigod has broken through whatever Fondrel and his master had done, freeing this place of the corruption that the Emerald Nightmare had managed to place upon it. Fondrel, of course, is less than pleased by this development. No. But his denial means nothing. With the connection to nature restored, all four of them press forward. Of course, the corrupted Archdruid doesn't stop fighting. And even as he struggles against them all, he has words for each of them. For Rognak, it's the same old song and dance. Savage beast. You will never achieve an ounce of what I have achieved. Your people are nothing and will forever be nothing. For Brawl Baremantle, Fondrel seems to take the opportunity to truly hit below the belt. You are a worthless father. Your own child had to save you from certain death. You failed her, just as you will fail here. For Cenarius, it is much as what he'd said before, colored with a clear deference to his master. You have done nothing but hold us back for 10,000 years, Forest Lord. Your time is done. It is time that the Night Elves were led by a Night Elf in truth and not just in name. And finally, to Malfurion. Pathetic reflection of a dead man. You meddle beyond your means, Storm Rage. Even now, I see you fading away. Even now, my master encroaches. The dream is at an end, fool. Now is the time of the nightmare. In response, much to Rognak's surprise, Malfurion actually glows brighter. The Archdruid's shade shakes his head, even as he lifts a see-through hand and swallows up one of Fondrel's latest attacks in his palm. No, Fondrel. This is the end of you and your master's nightmare. Why do you think he's become so desperate? Why do you think he empowers you so? This is not your moment of triumph. This is Xavia's last gasp of breath before we destroy him forever. Fondrel's eyes widen at that, even as he's assailed on all sides. The corrupted Archdruid might have been all spittle and rage at this point, insults and snarls, but it hasn't stopped them from slowly surrounding him, from hemming him in more and more. Rognak takes the time to circle around and pick up Wolfsong from where it landed across the cavern, and then he joins the others in putting an end to it. Eventually, Fondrel is forced back. The coiling shadows he calls upon are blasted away by Cenarius' magic even from Fondrel himself. The cloak of nightmarish power that his master granted him vanishes and the Archdruid falls back, sweat on his brow and his breath coming out in laboring breaths. One-armed and on the ground, he pants heavily as he glares up at them all, his eyes glassy but still filled with hatred and fury. This was a broken man. This was a night elf who had lost his son 1,000 years before and simply never recovered. A creature who had let darkness into his heart and decided the rest of the world deserved to feel all the pain he did. He might have even thought he was helping, that the world truly was wrong and the nightmare was right. But Rognak didn't think so. No, Fondrel Staghelm just wanted to make everyone else hurt in the same way he hurt. It's over, Fondrel. You and your master have lost. Lips pulled back in a half sneer, half snarl, Fondrel pushes himself up with his one remaining arm and growls. It will never be over. Not so long as I still draw Urk. Which is when Rognak brings Wolfsong down upon Fondrel's chest, the axe's blessed blade carving right through bone and heart alike. The blood splatter lands all across Rognak's face and chest, but he does not pull away from it. Instead, he looks down into Fondrel's eyes, watching the night elf die. For a moment, Fondrel just stares at him in disbelief, before spitting up a little bit of blood, and finally expiring. Placing a foot on Fondrel's shoulder, Rognak yanks Wolfsong back out of the corrupted Archdruid's corpse and straightens up. When he looks around, the others are all giving him looks. Not quite judgmental, and in fact Rognak thinks Cenarius might actually approve. But they're certainly surprised by his killing of a disarmed prisoner. Shrugging, Rognak works his jaw for a moment before speaking. Sorry, did we want him alive? I'm just a savage beast. Can't control my own impulses. Malfurion looks like he might have something to say in response to that, but before he can, Cenarius interjects. What's done is done. It is finished. Fondrel's treachery has been met with justice. Malfurion, you will be needed back in the dream. The Nightmare Lord must be dealt with, now that his machinations have been brought into the light. The emerald shade of Malfurion's storm rage nods sharply at that. Indeed. I have no doubt that we will put an end to Xavius, especially with what information you and this young orc have managed to give us. But the corruption in the dream, this so-called emerald nightmare, it runs deeper than just what Xavius has become. I expect I shall be quite busy in the months to come. We all will, those of us who call the dream our home. Malfurion's eyes move from Cenarius, to Rognak, and then to Brawl. He nods to Rognak and Brawl respectively, bowing his head as they bow their heads in return. Afterwards, he turns his attention back to Cenarius as his shade-like form starts to fade. Teacher. I feel the toll participating in this battle has taken on me. I believe the next time I manifest on Azeroth, it will be my last. Forgive me, but I will be of no further use to you outside of the Emerald Dream. My last manifestation. I would save it to say goodbye to my beloved. Pain appears in Cenarius' eyes, but right alongside it is understanding. The Lord of the Forest bows his head in Malfurion's direction, choking out his response moments before the Archdruid disappears entirely. Of course, my student. I will let her know. Thank you, Cenarius. And with that Malfurion is gone, back to the dream to face Xavius and his nightmare. Rognik wishes him the best of luck, knowing that while Malfurion won't return to Azeroth until it's time to say goodbye to Tyrande, Cenarius will most definitely be visiting the dream many times in the coming days to help its denizens against the threat posed to it. Rognik has done all he can on that front, however. Like Malfurion mentioned, he's given Cenarius and the others all the information that he possibly can on what Xavius' plans are and how deep the nightmare truly runs. Xavius is, after all, merely a piece on the board. The Nightmare Lord has his own masters, and even knowing that it is the old gods they truly face should hopefully help the denizens of the Emerald Dream fight off their corrupting influence a little bit better this time around compared to his second set of memories. Meanwhile, it was long past time Rognik returned to his people. Not just the Warsong clan, but the Horde as a whole. It was time for the Horde to settle, and for them to begin setting down roots here in Kalimdor. And Rognik would do everything he possibly could to make sure that Druidism became one of the pillars of the new Horde going forward. Chapter 37, Tirotar blooms. Ready? Indeed. Rognik grins and reaches out along his connection to nature itself. At the same time, Thrall does the same beside him, but with the elements instead. Side by side, the Druid and Shaman work, and the arid, barren land beneath their feet begins to breathe with new life for the first time in who knew how long. Where once there was nothing but rock and dust, verdant green grass begins to grow. The seed that Rognik brought with him and scattered through this area begins to take root, as the water Thrall has summoned from the nearby river pours into the ground and loosens up the soil. Only together have they managed to make a difference, Rognik reflects. In a way, it's been an amazing bonding experience for the two of them. He and Thrall might want the same things for their people, but that doesn't mean they haven't had their differences in the past. Fortunately, Rognik had noticed the gulf growing between them before it was too late and sought a way to mend what was beginning to fray. They stand in the middle of Tirotar, a few hundred yards away from the new orc settlement of Orgrimmar. All had been named by Thrall himself, and Rognik hadn't made any effort to try and convince the Orc Warkif to go with anything else. Both Tirotan and Orgrim Doomhammer were incredibly important people in Thrall's life, after all. It wasn't Rognik's place to question him, not on that, at least. It's been several months now since the battle for Mount Hyjal. More than half a year, in fact. In that time, the defenders of Kalimdor have all been doing their part to either rebuild what was lost or build what had never been there in the first place. With Fondrel's death, Teldrassil would never be planted, leaving the Night Elves to settle all across their forests in greater numbers than they would have in another version of events. Meanwhile, Rognik and his Warsong clan had ended up making their home in the area that would have been occupied by the Warsong lumber camp, if not for his interference. Instead, he and his clan had made themselves the bridge between their people and the Night Elves of Ashenvale Forest. By straddling the border of the new homes that the two peoples were trying to build for themselves, Rognik and his fellow Orc Druids could help out their kin with projects like this, while at the same time making themselves available to their Night Elf allies, either for further Druidic tutelage, or in the case that the Night Elves needed a helping hand with any remaining demonic remnants or other would-be malcontents. Orcs loved a good fight after all, and he and the Warsong clan were perfectly positioned to get all of the best fights. That said, beyond those differences, everyone else had mostly wound up where Rognik remembered them ending up from his second set of memories. Jaina and her people had settled off the coast of Dustwallow Marsh, turning an island there into the future their Amor city. For now, it was still in the process of being built up into what Rognik remembered, but he could already see what it would one day become, and it promised to be singularly amazing. Meanwhile, Cairn and his Tauren had returned to Mulgore, settling the Tauren capital of Thunderbluff. Drawing the other Tauren tribes to him, Cairn Bloodhoof was well on his way to uniting his people under one banner, under the Horde's banner. The Tauren had not had a unifying leader like the Bloodhoof chieftain in quite a long time, nor had they been truly safe on the plains of Mulgore in a while either. Thunderbluff represented a new age of prosperity for the Tauren people, though Rognik knew that the Grim Totem would likely never accept Cairn's rule, nor join the Horde in earnest. He would have to keep an eye on Magna Grim Totem, given what he knew of her future actions. At the same time, the trolls of the Darkspear tribe had settled off the coast of Tirotar, on the Echo Isles, precisely where they had in the other version of events. Consisting of only one tribe, the Darkspear might have been one of the smaller groups within the Horde, but that didn't stop Thrall from appreciating Vol'jin's counsel all the same. It had only taken Rognik hearing the name Zalazan in passing to remember what would happen there, but while he could certainly warn Vol'jin to keep an eye on the witch doctor, it was up to the Darkspear chieftain to actually do anything about it. In the end, it turned out that Zalazan was actually Vol'jin's best friend, and for the moment at least he had not turned into the traitor he one day would. All Rognik could do was keep an eye on things on that front, and of course, make sure Tirotar was as lively as it possibly could be, so that it could support the growing Horde well into the future, no matter what came. Yes, because last but not least were the Orcs, and they had indeed settled where Rognik's second set of memories had told him they would. There were other places in Kalimdor that might have been better, but in the end their people had been drawn to Tirotar. Why, Rognik couldn't have said. But he knew one thing for sure, he wasn't going to let them barely survive off of lands not meant to sustain life like they had in the video game he remembered playing. That was why he and Thrall were out here, performing this combined effort on yet another portion of Tirotar. They'd done this what felt like 100 times now, and Rognak was certain that they were nearing a point where the greenery they'd been planting would at long last reach critical mass and begun expanding across the arid wasteland all on its own. As they both pull back, having turned this spot of Durotar into a beautiful verdant green patch of forest at least, Rognak wipes a hand across his sweaty brow, unable to help the smile as he gazes out at what Thrall and he have created together. After a moment, he cups his hands together and gives Thrall a jokingly plaintive look. In response, the orc Warkif snorts derisively and uses the elements to direct a small stream of water into Rognak's palms. The makeshift bowl he's creating fills quickly enough and Rognak brings the crystal clean water to his lips, drinking greedily and deeply. Beside him, Thrall huffs as his eyes sweep back and forth across what they've managed to make. Humph. You know there are still some among our people who say we are foolish for doing this. That Durotar should remain the way it is. Side-eyeing Thrall, Rognak scoffs. He's well aware of the old curmudgeonly fools who would prefer they suffer in some struggle of strength. Humph. Idiots stuck in the past, the lot of them. I always wondered if they convinced you to come to Durotar because it reminded them of the world they ruined, the world they were forced to leave behind. I've heard tell of what Hellfire Peninsula looked like by the time they were done with it. Not too different from this, just with more fell magic. Thrall can't help the corner of his mouth turning up at that, even as he shakes his head. They say that too much comfort will make us weak. That we are only as strong as we are today because of the hardships we've faced in the past. They've even set up a space down south where we have yet to reach that they're calling the Valley of Trials, letting any young orcs who want to learn go and train in the harshest conditions that Durotar has to offer. Rognak's eyes flash at that. The harshest conditions Durotar has to offer, for now. I will not let their insistence on suffering for strength stop us from turning Durotar into the verdant green paradise that we both know it can be. Orgrimmar is well on its way to being a fine city for our people, but where would it be without our efforts? Of course, he knew where it would be. Orgrimmar would still stand, even if they hadn't brought life to the system of craggy valleys and caverns that the city was built within. But it would not stand easily. Water would have to constantly be carted in from the nearby river, and the place would be hot and arid and just, all around nasty. Rognak was glad for what it had become instead. He was especially proud of the massive collection of trees he'd managed to grow in the center of the Valley of Strength. It was not a world tree, to be clear. Far from it. Instead, it was a grove of trees that Cinerais himself had helped Rognak design, and Thrall had provided his approval for. In the end, the grove of trees grew high above the top of the valley system, their canopies spreading out and covering most of the city, still under construction, in their shade. Meanwhile, within the grove itself was where Rognak held court, so to speak. Not that he had any intention of detracting from Thrall's leadership of the Horde. Merely, if any orcs wished to explore the idea of druidism, or even needed healing, they were welcome in Warsong Grove, where Rognak's people stayed when they were away from their camp on the border of Ashenvale Forest. You are not wrong, Rognak. Still, we must show the proper respect to our elders. They have lived a long time and seen much. Their experience is invaluable. You antagonize them too often, I fear. Smirking, Rognak just shakes his head and reaches out, clapping Thrall on the shoulder. This is why you are Warkif and I am not, my friend. You can show them proper respect. I will never see the lot of them as more than what they are. Tired old warriors. Their experience in drinking demon blood and ruining our people's world is not something I wish to partake in, I must admit. Thrall shoots him a look, but ultimately sighs. This is common territory for them, something they've retread time and time again. Though. Rognak does narrow his eyes after a moment, his pat of Thrall's shoulder turning into a slightly harsher grip. They aren't suggesting returning to demon worship again, are they? Thrall blinks, and then shakes his head. Ah, no, none have been foolish enough to suggest that after the united front we put on, I'm grateful to admit. Though, even then, you conflate the issue. They were not trying to return us to demon worship. They were merely suggesting that allowing warlocks into the Horde might give us much needed strength in these early years on Kalimdor. Snorting at that, Rognak nods. Right. Demon worshippers. Giving him an exasperated look, the orc Warkif chuckles. Your pig-headedness forces me to defend that which I hate, Rognak. Not every warlock is a demon worshipper. Some of them subjugate their summons and serve no demonic master. Even if I find their methods distasteful, there is truth to the power they wield. Rognak's eyes narrow as a growl builds in his chest. The only truth to their power is in its corruption, Thrall. Fell magic is inherently corrosive to our world, just as necromantic magics are. Tell me, if a group of Scourge showed up tomorrow and asked to be let into the Horde, would you allow them to join what we are trying to build here? Taken aback by the question, Thrall scoffs. Don't be ridiculous. The Scourge are monsters one and all. Why would they ever try to join the Horde? Thinking of a certain group in Lord Aaron that may or may not end up existing given all the changes he's made, Rognak rolls his shoulders. It is simply a hypothetical. You wouldn't welcome undead with open arms, would you? No. Of course not. Nodding decisively, Rognak waves a hand through the air. Warlocks are the same. Their magic is just as harmful to our world as the very existence of the Scourge is. If a warlock were to abandon their pursuit of power and never touch another ounce of fel in their lives, then maybe I could see us letting them join the Horde. But once they touch that power, they become addicted to it. Intoxicated by it. There might be warlocks out there who claim to serve no demonic masters, but in the end, they all serve their addiction. They all serve the fel, no matter what they might try to claim. Thrall is quiet for a moment, before slowly nodding and cracking a grin in Rognak's direction. Hat. Save your speeches for the council meetings, chieftain of the Warsong clan. You already know that I agree with you on all of this. Am I not Warkif of the Horde? So long as that remains the case, you can trust that I will not allow the Legion to corrupt our people again. Nor will I allow your hypothetical scourge to join us either. Rognak appreciates Thrall's words. Really he does. But in the back of his mind, his second set of memories tell him that the Warkif's convictions do not stand up to the passage of time. It will be up to Rognak to make sure Thrall stays on the straight and narrow. There are lots of things Rognak will abide by, but he draws a firm line at warlocks and undead. The Forsaken were never anything but trouble for the Horde as far as his other memories told him. And warlocks were either demon worshippers, or sleeper agents who didn't know they were demon worshippers just yet. He remembered what the Cleft of Shadow became in the original Orgrimmar. He would not allow such a thing to happen this time around. Not on his watch. But, for the time being, he keeps such thoughts to himself, removing his hand from Thrall's shoulder and nodding to the edge of their latest patch of greenery. Shall we? We shall. Together, the two of them move on and perform their combined efforts to bring life and nature to Durotar once more. They can only do this one small parcel of land at a time, but both are committed. And once other shaman druid pairs have been trained up in their technique, things will rapidly accelerate until the arid wastelands that make up the majority of Durotar are a thing of the past. This, Rognak swears. XXX. Many hours later, at the end of a long day of grueling work, Rognak lays his head down to rest within the Warsong Grove, his eyes drifting shut as he falls asleep. It feels like only moments before he awakens again, to the feel of the sharp edge of a blade at his throat. Blinking, Rognak's eyes, adjusted to the low light, take in the figure looming over him, as well as her weapon. Dressed in full warden garb, wielding a night elf glaive at his throat, Mayev Shadowsong growls as she presses the edge into his flesh just enough to draw a droplet of blood. Rognak of the Warsong clan, yes? Ha, imagine if he said no. But no, if he tried to mess around with her, who knew how she would react? Fractionally, he nods his head. He probably shouldn't have pushed himself so hard earlier today, because he's still quite exhausted and his connection to nature is, somewhat spent at the moment. Humming, Mayev tightens her grip on her weapon, even as she leans in nice and close, her small fangs visible as she bares her teeth. We need to have a little chat. Well, this was apparently a thing. Chapter 38, The Warden. 10,000 years. She'd been warden and jailer to some of the worst scum that Kalimdor had to offer for 10,000 long years. And the worst of them all, the first of her prisoners and the whole reason that the Watchers existed as an organization in the first place, was Illidan Stormrage. The betrayer. He was the reason that Mayev had left the Sisterhood of Elune behind, foregoing the robes of a priestess of Elune and taking up arms. He was the reason that she had taken up Malfurion Stormrage's charge all those years ago. Because if someone like Illidan was allowed to roam free, then a second sundering might just occur. The end of everything they knew. And sure, she'd also have been happier just killing Illidan for what he did to her brother, but in the end Jared had lived and her vendetta was not truly justified. Over time she'd come to accept that eternal imprisonment would have to do. Over the centuries and millennia that had followed, Mayev had taken those of a similar mindset as her and inducted them into the Watchers. Their members eventually came from all sorts of backgrounds, but the originals were all volunteers from the Sisterhood, just as she was. As first warden, Mayev Shadowsong had taken the mandate set down by Malfurion Stormrage and ran with it. The Archdruid had recognized the need for a force like theirs in the wake of the War of the Ancients. However, not even he had fully understood just how necessary they truly were. Sometimes it felt like only Mayev comprehended the gravity of the situation and the magnitude of the task at hand. But that was fine. She had not let anything or anyone stand in her way. Her Watchers had become both the jailers and marshals of Kalimdor. Not only did they guard the night elf prisons located far beneath Nordrassil in the Barrow Deeps, but they also hunted down dangerous criminals that Mayev had to admit, she'd always, without fail, compared to Illidan Stormrage. None of them had ever measured up to the sheer threat that Malfurion's brother represented, however. A powerful sorcerer, but worse than that, a man of uncheckable ambition. Mayev should know, she'd sat in on a few of the earlier sessions, when Malfurion had visited and tried to get his brother to see reason. She had watched Illidan refute every attempt the Archdruid made to try to redeem him. As far as Illidan was concerned, he did not need to be redeemed because as far as he was concerned, he hadn't done anything wrong. That was what made him truly dangerous. That was what made Illidan Stormrage her most important charge. And yet, on one of the handful of times over the centuries that Mayev had been away on a mission, one that had taken her far from northern Kalimdor and left her out of contact with the Barrow prisons for months, everything had gone to shit. Without her even getting a chance to speak against his release, Illidan Stormrage, after 10,000 long years of her as his warden, had been released. Oh, but that wasn't all. No, that wasn't even the half of it. What really left Mayev Shadowsong at a fucking loss was the fact that not only had Illidan been released without her permission, but he'd gone and gotten himself killed within the hour, just like fucking that. It was unbelievable. Truthfully, Mayev hadn't believed it at first. She'd refused to accept it until she'd done a thorough investigation on her own. It would be just like the betrayer to somehow fake his death, she figured. And if he had, Mayev knew she was the only one who could have figured that out, the only one who could have found him and brought him back to his cell. She'd guarded his prison for 10,000 years after all. There was no one who knew Illidan Stormrage better than her. And yet, Mayev's investigation had turned up nothing but evidence that seemed to confirm what she'd already been told. She'd been to the place where he was said to have died. She'd located some of the ash left behind by the destruction of his body. She'd spoken to all of the parties involved, and while she had her suspicions about High Priestess Whisperwind, she knew that Lord Cenarius was above reproach. He would not lie to her. But that didn't stop her from wanting more. Conflicted, desperate for answers, she'd looked for anything at all that could continue her search. And that had ultimately led her to here. To this strange new city filled with strange new creatures. The orcs, she'd been told they were called savages, but in a good way was the prevailing opinion among the common folk that Maiev had spoken to. Of course, the High Priestess and Lord of the Forest had had plenty of nicer things to say about them. The orcs, it would seem, had been crucial to the defeat of Archimonde and the salvation of Kalimdor. Meanwhile, the destruction of Nordrassil and the loss of the Night Elf people's immortality was considered a necessary sacrifice and a decision made holy by Lord Cenarius himself. Maiev didn't much care about suddenly being mortal. It just meant that she would need to prepare the Watchers for when she was gone. No big deal. But, losing Illidan. That was a big deal. And so here she was, having snuck into the heart of Orc territory, into this strange grove filled with nature magic, and into the abode of the Orc Druid responsible for it all. Chieftain Rognak of the Warsong clan. Holding her umbra crescent to his neck, she stares him down wordlessly, noting the lack of fear in his eyes. But then, from what she's heard, orcs do not fear death as a general rule. Something she'll have to keep in mind over the course of this interrogation. He could have called for help, but that too was something orcs tended to avoid, she'd been told. They were prideful creatures to the last, with their own ideas of honor. Tilting his head ever so slightly, Rognak grunts, parroting her words back to her. And what exactly do we need to chat about, Warden Shadowsong? Maev's eyes narrow beneath her mask and she grits her teeth. So he knew her already, did he? Did that mean Tyrande had warned him of her coming? Or perhaps Lord Cenarius himself? Maiev hadn't told either of them, of course, but it wouldn't surprise her if they knew she would eventually end up here. It was inevitable, given the orcs' role in the events that led to Illidan Stormridge's demise. Still, the orc's fearlessness might make even more sense now, if she puts it through another lens. He probably thinks she can't kill him. Not a student of Lord Cenarius. Not a friend of the Night Elves. Humph, perhaps not, but she will have her answers either way. If he proves to be uncooperative, she has ways of making him speak. I'm here to discuss the circumstances under which the betrayer was released from his prison in the Barrow Deeps. Circumstances I'm told you were highly involved in. Remaining where he is, the orc chieftain is quiet for a moment before letting out a grunt. I was there. Cenarius decreed that we needed all the help we could get. So we went to the Barrow Deeps to release Illidan and any other prisoners who could be trusted to fight against the Legion invasion. A lie. Or rather, not the whole truth. Maiev smirks beneath her mask and digs her umbra crescent a fraction more into the orc's neck. Don't lie to me. Keeper Califax told me what he saw. He told me how all of you acted down there, while you were busy forcing him to release the greatest criminal my people have ever known. And he told me what you did, little Orc Druid. How you were unsurprised when Illidan ran off within mere moments of being freed. How you pushed for him to be followed, but discreetly. Califax is a good judge of character. You knew more than you let on. She's certain of this. Everything she's heard, everything she's managed to piece together of that moment, it all leads back to here, to this orc. When Rognak doesn't immediately reply, Maiev hisses and leans in closer, pushing down a bit more on her umbra crescent. In response, before she can blink, one of his large hands is suddenly up and grabbing hold of her blade, stopping it in its tracks. With a single grunt and a simply frightening display of physical strength, he pushes her and her weapon away, sending her skidding back across the room as he finally sits up and rubs at his neck. Almost immediately, the blood from the shallow cuts she gave him, both the intentional one on his neck and the unintentional one on his palm, seep back into their wounds, which then close under his healing magic. Maev's eyes widen at this, and she prepares for a fight, though she's already considering possible escape routes. Battling a physically stronger opponent is something that her and her watchers are well versed in, but doing so in a confined space while surrounded by thousands of their allies in the middle of their city stronghold is not an optimal strategy. However, rather than lunge at her, Rognak stays where he is, remaining seated as he stares at her for a long moment before speaking. Illidan's death was never my intention. But you're right, I had ulterior motives for wanting Cenarius to free him. And when he ran away, well, I saw my plan coming together right before my eyes and I seized the opportunity presented to me. Maiev doesn't relax. But she does uncoil just a little bit. Still tense, still wound tight and ready to fight, the warden nevertheless growls, wanting answers more than anything. And what was that opportunity exactly? What was your goal? Arthas Menethil. He says it so simply, as if Maiev is supposed to know who that is. Something of her confusion must have shown despite her face being hidden, because after a moment of silence, Rognak groans and covers his face with a palm for a moment before giving her a distinctive look. The man that killed Illidan in the first place? The Death Knight. Maiev shrugs, shifting from foot to foot for a moment. Yes? What of him? She knew Illidan's killer of course, though she hadn't bothered memorizing his name. Looking into Arthas had ultimately been a dead end as far as she was concerned. He was a dangerous entity capable of dangerous things, but seeing how he was dead too, it wasn't like Maiev and her watchers needed to hunt him down or anything like that. He was the champion of a malevolent entity known as the Lich King. His favored champion, in fact. The Lich King sent Arthas Menethil to Kalimdor specifically to get to Illidan Stormrage. Through prophetic visions, he knew that Illidan would be freed and could be turned into a pawn in his plans. I had my own prophetic visions, I suppose you could say. Visions? Prophecy? Maiev wrinkles her nose under her mask at the Orc Druid's increasingly irritating explanation. It wasn't that she didn't think such things were possible, she just hated when they cropped up. People seeing what could be and thinking it would be always made things so much messy in her line of work. And what did your visions tell you, exactly? Solemn-faced, Rognik spreads his arms wide. Well, they told me that Arthas would seek out Illidan if the latter was freed. And they also told me that if allowed to survive, Arthas Manethil would become a greater threat to Azeroth than Illidan's Stormrage had ever been. His conviction takes Maiev aback. The orc sounds absolutely certain of his words. Seated there on a pile of furs, staring up at her with his eyes glittering in the room's dim light, he looks as though he believes what he just told her beyond a shadow of a doubt. That doesn't make his words any easier to digest, however. To learn that her greatest charge was released and allowed to go and get himself killed to some human necromancer was something Maiev was still struggling with. To find out that it was all because the human necromancer, this Arthas Manethil, was deemed a greater threat than Illidan himself was even harder to stomach. In the silence that ensues, Rognik remains seated but does eventually shift from side to side for a moment before grunting. Cenarius is aware of this, to be clear. He and I have already discussed this. As I said before, Illidan wasn't supposed to die. I underestimated Arthas, or overestimated Illidan. I can't say which it was. Maiev scoffs at that. Likely the latter, really. Yes, Illidan was a dangerous sorcerer and left unchecked could cause plenty of damage, but the Night Elf had been imprisoned for 10,000 years. It wasn't as though they were keeping him fighting fit all that time. Still. I care not what Lord Cenarius does or does not know. Rognik's eyes narrow at that. Maiev knows she's towing the line there, treading close to disrespecting the forest demigod. But it's the truth. Holding her Umbra Crescent in both hands, back ramrod straight as she stares down at the seated Orc Druid, Maiev growls. Your actions have cost me a prisoner, Orc. Whether they were necessary or not is neither here nor there. Reparations are required. You will perform a service for me, or I will take payment out of your thick hide. At long last, her words provoke him into standing up. Maiev watches as the Orc Druid rises to his full height, standing perhaps a couple inches taller than her and easily twice as wide. These orcs were a large people to be sure. She could see where the common folk she'd spoken to had gotten the savage descriptor from. Her grip tightens on her Umbra Crescent, even as Rognik rolls his shoulders, looking at her with those same narrowed eyes from before. Then, finally, he dips his head. What would you have of me? If it is not too much, then I shall fulfill your request. Maiev bristles at the insinuation that he would deny her, that this was a request. She almost wants to tell him off, but no. She already had an idea in mind for how he could make this whole debacle up to her. In truth, his role in Illidan's release was minor, despite the ulterior motives. It was Lord Cenarius who had ultimately given the command after all. And with Illidan truly dead, well, it was time for Maiev to turn her sight back towards her other responsibilities. The Watchers might have been originally formed for the sake of keeping the betrayer imprisoned, but their mandate had grown in the past 10,000 years and their role was not yet expended. Setting aside the strange feeling that she's lost her purpose, Maiev shakes herself and then pins Rognik with a stare. You will atone by assisting me with a hunt, Orc. Then and only then will you have earned absolution. She tenses up, waiting for his response, but to her satisfaction, he nods his head in easy agreement. Very well. Consider it done, Warden. Scoffing, Maiev just shakes her head. I will consider it done when it is done, Orc. And not a moment before. Rather than get angry with her caustic attitude, Rognik just chuckles. Oh, this is going to be fun. I can already tell. Fun? Not likely. Productive? He'd best hope so. Chapter 39, The Sea Witch. Truth be told, part of Rognik is more curious than anything else. Waking up to Maiev Shadowsong of all people standing over him and holding him at blade curve was one thing. Fortunately, Rognik had been able to utilize the nature of Warsong Grove to revitalize himself as they talked, because initially he'd been too exhausted to do much of anything at all. Still, eventually he'd been able to put their conversation on more even footing. At which point, he would have been well within his rights to take her down or even summon the other orcs in the grove to help him capture her. But he hadn't, because part of him did feel a little guilty still over Illidan's death. And also, as previously stated, he was curious. With Illidan gone, what did Maiev Shadowsong's future even look like? He barely knew the woman in this life to be fair. She wasn't anyone to him. But his second set of memories painted quite a grim picture. Her obsession with Illidan would have consumed her for a long, long time. It would have brought her to the brink, and it would have caused her no small amount of heartache and loss along the way. Now though, that possible future was dust in the wind. All that Illidan's Stormrage would have done was up in the air, and Rognik didn't know what would come next. The Demon Hunter had been a pivotal figure in quite a few events both on Azeroth and off of it. But now not only would he not be around for those events, neither would the Illidary he would have gone on to create. The very concept of Demon Hunter had not really managed to get off the ground. Would another arise to take his place? Would Illidan himself be brought back at some point down the line by the forces that considered him the chosen one? Seeing as he never consumed the skull of Gul'dan to become more demon than Night Elf, Rognik wasn't sure that Illidan would be so easy to resurrect as he remembered happening in his other life. But then again, who was to say what lengths certain beings would go to, in the end? What did Rognak really know besides just how much he simply did not know? One thing is certain, however. He's not going to let his so-called foreknowledge stop him from doing what he feels must be done. And he's not ever going to treat this world like a video game. This is a real world he's living in, and as a druid he feels that more keenly than most. The heartbeat of Azeroth is all around him in every aspect of nature that he touches. Still, it's curiosity and guilt that have seen him come all the way out here, following Maiev away from the newly settled Orgrimmar after sending word via the Warsong clan to the Warkif that he would be away for a few days. Whatever hunt Maiev had in mind for the two of them, he figured it wouldn't take too long. Working together, they should be able to handle almost any bata that landed on the Warden's radar. That said, he probably should ask for more information, since they were well on their way to their ultimate destination now, having left Orgrimmar behind and headed north into region known as Ashera. Warden Shadow Song. For a moment, Maiev doesn't respond. Whether she's being petty or just lost in her own thoughts, Rognak doesn't know. But her head does twitch, so he waits patiently until at long last she fully looks in his direction, though she keeps her lightsaber moving. Yes. Sitting astride his own mount, a grey wolf he'd procured from Kennel Master Ogunnar Wolfrunner on their way out of the city, Rognak inclines his head. I wish to inquire exactly who or what we're hunting. Seems like if I'm going to be helping you with this, I should know some details. Maiev grunts noncommittally at first and silence reigns between them for another handful of moments before finally, she speaks. Rognak can't help but be a little amused by her clipped tone and no-nonsense attitude. The seaport town of Nendis sent out a call for aid a moon back. Apparently, they're finding themselves beset by serpentine creatures coming from the water that are attacking their fishing boats and kidnapping their fishermen. It is said that these creatures are controlled by a sea witch. She is our target. Deal with her and the rest will likely scatter. Nendis will be saved. Rognak grunts at that. Then he actually turns Maiev's words over in his head. Nendis alone had sounded familiar, but when he pairs it with the talk of serpentine sea creatures and a sea witch, is Maiev talking about the Naga? But, that doesn't make any sense. Baroness Vashoy and her Naga only showed up because they were answering Illidan's call, right? With the demon hunter dead, why would they be attacking dry land now? And wasn't it far too early for all of that anyways? He needs more information, but before he can get it, Maiev suddenly stiffens in her saddle. Smoke on the horizon. And, sounds of battle. Twisting in the direction her long ears are twitching towards, Rognak sees the smoke she's talking about coming over a nearby ridge of the notoriously hilly and mountainous Ashera. Then, listening carefully to the wind, he hears the same sounds of battle that Maiev had mentioned. Gritting her teeth, the warden grabs hold of her reins. We must make haste. I sent some of my watchers ahead to secure the town before our arrival, but it would seem that their presence might have provoked a full-scale attack. And with that, the warden is off, her lightsaber darting through the trees. Rognak grunts and grabs his wolf's reins as well, and they're soon moving just as fast after her and her mount. He probably could have kept pace in one of his own animal forms, but that would be an insult to the kennel master and the mount he'd entrusted him with. Still, once they actually make it down a small path from the ridge to the shore, finding the town of Nendis under significant attack from the very Naga that Rognak had been wondering about, he wastes no time in dismounting from the back of his wolf and drawing his axe. As Maiev leaps from her saddle as well, it's only a moment later that another warden runs up to them. Maiev. Naisha, what is the situation here? We arrived in force, intending to secure the town as you ordered, but no sooner had we come than they attacked. They call themselves Naga and I have managed to identify the sea witch that the reports spoke of. But she's not our biggest problem, Maiev. There's a demon lord among them. Fat and grotesque, he's commanding the lot like they're his slaves. We believe he has them under some form of mind control. Maiev rears back at that information. A demon? Then the situation is more dire than I thought. Come, we must put an end to this madness at once. This is the orc I spoke to you about. He will assist us in the coming battle, to atone for his role in freeing the betrayer. Naisha's head swivels to look in Rognak's direction, but truth be told he's not in the mood for introductions at the moment. All he can manage is a faint nod as he struggles to wrap his head around what she just told Maiev. The Naga were here, and it sounded like they might even be commanded by Baroness Vashoy. But, what was this talk of a demon lord? That shouldn't be possible, all the major players from the Burning Legion's invasion of Kalimdor had been killed at this point, Rognak was pretty sure. As Maiev and Naisha rush into town, Rognak is close on their heels, desperate for answers. Of course, you know what they say. Be careful what you wish for. He gets his answers rapidly enough as the demon in question comes into view. The citizenry of Nendis is trying to run, even as the small force of watchers that Maiev had sent to the seaport town struggle to fight off the Naga invaders. Meanwhile, the so-called demon lord laughs from where he stands in the back, a distinctive Naga sea witch by his side, her hands raised over her head to channel a lightning storm that is further harassing and harrying the outnumbered watchers. Bahaha. Yes. Take as many alive for questioning as you can. Kill the rest. Bahaha. Flee mortals. Flee if you can. For I, Ditherok, have come to your shores. Bahaha. The demon lord in question is actually a dreadlord, the fattest, most grotesque dreadlord that Rognak has ever laid eyes on, as a matter of fact. Seriously, how does an Aethrism even get that fat? And yet, his name is familiar. But it doesn't make sense. Ditherok should have been on the other side of the world, back in Lord Aaron with his brothers, Balnazar and Verimithras. He shouldn't have even known about Archimonde's defeat yet, so why the hell was he here, in this place? Unfortunately, answers would have to wait. There was a battle going on, and the Night Elf defenders were in great need of some relief. With that thought, Rognak steps forward and thrusts out his weapon-free hand. From the ground, pulling themselves out of the beach in a tangle of driftwood and roots located deep beneath the grey sand come a dozen treants, their mouths stretching open and their branches like claws as they assail the Naga attackers and support the Watchers trying to defend the people of Nendis. Immediately, Ditherok's belly laughing cuts off as the overweight demon scowls furiously. What? What is this? Druid. There's a druid. Find the druid and kill it, you incompetent snakes. The response to Ditherok's order is telling and Rognak thinks that Naisha might be right. These Naga do not willingly serve the Dread Lord. He's put them under some sort of spell, a compulsion of sorts. Maiev seems to agree, because after she sees his treants bolstering their defenses, she immediately turns to Naisha. Circle around. Look for an opportunity. You'll know it when you see it. Yes, Maiev. It will be done. With that, Naisha all but vanishes from view. Sneaky one, that. Rognak doesn't try to follow just where it is she goes. He's focused on the battle at hand and so is Maiev as they both begin moving forward, wading into the fight. With Wolf Song held aloft, Rognak has no issue going toe-to-toe with any Naga Myrmidon who thinks they can take him. Of course, no sooner has he put himself in the midst of the fray when suddenly... Hold. That's not just a druid, that's an orc. Him. Bring him to me alive. I must know what he knows. I must know where to find Rognak of the Warsong clan. In an instant, all of the focus is on him. Rognak grits his teeth, not at all liking the sound of his name coming from the grotesque demon lord's mouth. Still, with the mind-controlled Naga all turning their attention his way, it does make it much easier for him to go ahead and stomp the beach with all his might, sending up a wave of entangling roots that grasp and constrict the more than a dozen Myrmidons all trying to suddenly reach him at once. This, unfortunately, prompts another response from Ditherok. Suddenly, the Dread Lord raises a hand and calls a halt. Wait. The battle comes to an abrupt standstill, as the compelled Naga pull back, giving the beleaguered Watchers a chance to regroup and further evacuate the civilians of Nendis behind their lines. But it's not the common Naga that were truly giving them trouble. It was the mind-controlled Baroness Vashoy and her lightning storm. Now though, the sea witch stands there, having stopped her channeling, swaying gently from side to side beside her demonic master. Said demonic master scratches at his jowls as he grins wickedly. That much power. You are the Warsong chieftain, aren't you, Orc? Tell me. Tell me what I wish to know and perhaps I shall spare you and your allies. Refuse and I will wipe this pathetic town off the map. Sharing a glance with Maiev, Rognak cautiously steps forward. Honestly, as much as he might want to deny the demon lord, this was too good a chance for him to get some answers of his own. What do you want to know, exactly? Ditherok's wicked grin widens, perceiving this as Rognak all but capitulating to his demands already. Yes, you hero types are always so willing to sacrifice for the innocents. Ah ha ha ha. A minor memory from his previous life comes to mind. Something he'd read once upon a time. Or maybe heard. It was a description of Ditherok by the game designers of this world. They'd called him, Oafish. Standing before him now, Rognak had to admit, the gluttonous Dreadlord was a tad ridiculous. Which was strange, because if he remembered correctly, this was the Nathrism that eventually went on to infiltrate the human spy organization known as SI-7. Odd, to say the least. Finally getting over his gloating, Ditherok reaches towards Rognak. Tell me. Tell me where the shards of the rune blade known as Frostmourne are being kept. I must know their location, immediately. Rognak rocks back on his heels, once again left reeling by the Dreadlord's request. That was why Ditherok was here? He wanted Frostmourne? But, why? What even was this? No, Rognak knew what this was. This was the consequences of his own actions coming back to bite him in the ass. But he could contemplate what the fuck he'd changed later. For now. I cannot give you that information. Only one being knows where they are hidden. He's not about to rat Cenarius out though, of course. But unfortunately, it doesn't seem that he has to. Ah, the Lord of the Forest is who I must find then, very well. I suppose I have no use for any of you then, do I? Do you like my Naga pets? Recognize any of them, perhaps? Maybe you all can reminisce as they slay you for me. Those last couple sentences are definitely directed at the Night Elves rather than Rognak. But he doesn't think most of them know what the Naga are or what happened to them at the bottom of the ocean after the Great Sundering. Nor does it seem to matter to someone like Maiev Shadow Song, who steps forward with a scoff, her umbra crescent in her grasp. There's only one problem with that, demon. Ditherok's eyes narrow and he leans towards her, grinning a truly terrible grin. Oh? And what's that? Rognak can hear the smirk in Mayev's voice as she rolls her shoulders, preparing for battle. Your method of compulsion is too heavy-handed. In robbing these monstrous creatures of their free will, you've left them all too open. Before Ditherok can respond, Naisha strikes from the shadows, and relieves Baroness Vashoy of her head in one fell swoop. Rognak's eyes widen right alongside the Dreadlords as this happens. Vashoy was a major player in both current and future events. Not as major as Illidan, but even still, for her to die here was shocking. And yet, Maiev was right. Under Ditherok's control, Vashoy had been reduced to little more than an automaton. No doubt the Oafish Dreadlord had not been able to utilize any subtler methods due to the Sea Witch's power, but in making her into little more than his puppet, he had robbed her of her ability to defend herself from attack. And he'd been so distracted by Rognak and Maiev that he hadn't noticed Naisha sneaking up until it was much too late. The warden in question dances back as Ditharok howls in rage, and with her killing of Vashoy as the signal, the rest of the Watcher forces scramble to capitalize, attacking the Naga Sirens and Myrmidons who remain. Without Vashoy's lightning storm overhead providing air support to her forces, the battle is much more even, though still not completely decided. However, as Rognak begins fighting his way towards where Ditharok stands, wolf song in his hands and glowing bright with purpose, the oversized Dreadlord takes one look at the situation, and falls back into full retreat. Rognak roars and tries to give chase, but he can't quite reach the Nathrazim fast enough to stop Ditharok from getting away. After his cowardly departure, the battle becomes more of a formality, though every single Naga has to be slain before it's finally over. There is no surrender, no capture. The mind-controlled creatures fight until they're dead. Afterwards, Rognak is left panting heavily, splattered with the blood of over a dozen of the serpentine creatures. And yet, it's not the Naga he's concerned about. Turning back to find Maiev and Naisha sharing a surprisingly tender moment, with full-on hands on each other's necks and helmets touching helmets, Rognak blinks for a moment, before focusing on the matter at hand. Warden Shadow Song. News of this Dreadlord's intentions needs to be brought to Cenarius immediately. Pulling away from Naisha, Maiev takes in the scene around them. Nendi still stands, but barely. And the absence of the Dreadlords remains puts the situation in stark perspective. After a moment, she nods. You are correct, Orc. Lord Cenarius must be informed. Ditharok could strike any time at any moment. The Watchers will accompany you to Moonglade to speak with Lord Cenarius post-haste. Rognak feels a small sense of relief hit him at Maev's easy agreement. That's one hurdle crossed. Now he just has to make it across the next 100. He'd known that Artha's death and the destruction of Frostmourne would have consequences. How could it not? But Ditharok's presence was throwing him for a loop. They had to get to the bottom of this or else Rognak didn't know what might happen. Azeroth was a world constantly beset by apocalypse after all. If it wasn't one thing, it was always something else. Hopefully Cenarius would know what to do. Chapter 40, The Oafish Demon. As they come over the tall mountain ridge surrounding the hidden hilly forest of the Moonglade, Maiev pulls back on the reins of her hippogriff, finally letting it slow down for a beat to let the tired beast catch its breath. Her and her fellow wardens have all pushed their mounts hard in order to get here from Ashera in record time, though not entirely by their own volition. A bestial cry comes from the solitary wyvern in their midst as he also slows down and points himself towards the beautiful and ancient forest glade below to begin descending. As Maiev and the Watcher forces with her all begin to follow the riderless wyvern down, she finds herself mutely shaking her head. The orc known as Rognak, chieftain of the Warsong clan and druid trained by Lord Cenarius himself, had continually proven to be full of surprises, truth be told. However, privately at least, Maiev could admit that she'd found herself somewhat softening towards the young orc. He wasn't quite the troublemaker she'd initially assumed him to be, and he was in fact quite the powerful ally to have in a fight. She's confident that they still could have handled those Naga creatures in Nendis even without his help, but there was no denying that with his help, the number of casualties they experienced had been lowered dramatically. And then to have him prove to be capable of not just a flight-capable druid form, but a full-blown wyvern of all things? He'd even offered to provide a ride to one of her wardens, but while Naisha had looked tempted, Maiev had shot that down. She didn't want the druid to think they were getting too chummy. She certainly wasn't about to let him know that he was slowly but surely managing to get on her good side. Frankly, as far as most people were concerned, Maiev Shadowsong didn't have a good side. It was best if it stayed that way and no one had any expectations of her going soft and becoming, friendlier. As it so happened, the only one who had any inkling that she might actually be coming around to the Orc Druid besides herself, was her mate and lieutenant, Naisha. The other warden even shoots her a teasing grin as they descend, likely knowing what's going through Maev's head. Briefly, she considers throwing Naisha a rude hand gesture in response, but before she can decide one way or the other, another cry from Rognak's currently transformed mouth sounds out, drawing her attention. Maev's eyes widen as she looks to where he's now angling and sees Moonglade's solitary town, Night Haven, settled next to Lake Illuminera, is under attack. And not just under attack, though that's bad enough, but under attack by the very same creatures they'd fought back in Nendis. These Naga. Hissing in anger, she whips her head towards Naisha and the rest of her watchers. Fan out, all of you. The demon lord must be close by if his forces are attacking here as well. Find him but do not engage. Send a signal immediately and we'll be there as fast as we can once we've helped Lord Cenarius beat back this attack. Confirmation comes from the others, with a personal nod from Naisha specifically. Then, all of them peel off, spreading out over the Moonglade as Maiev directs her hippogriff down towards the ground at a much faster pace. She arrives just in time to leap off and sink her Umbra Crescent into the back of one of the sword-wielding Naga's necks as it tries to slash out at Rognak while the transformed orc is savaging another of its kin. Cutting it down quite effectively, Maiev hops off of the serpentine creature's back and watches as Rognak pulls away from his own kill, transforming back into his Orcish self. The orc chieftain gives her a single nod before unsheathing his axe from his back and stomping forward. Together, they make good time in reaching the inside of Night Haven, where they find Lord Cenarius leading the town's defense. Lord Cenarius. You look like you could use some help. The Lord of the Forest's eyes flicker over to her, before moving on to Rognak. The demigod's whole countenance brightens up as he takes in the sight of the two of them. Indeed we could. Warden Shadowsong. Rognak. It is good to see you both, especially under such dire circumstances. To think that the Naga have resurfaced after all this time. I had hoped they would stay to their ocean depths, but perhaps that was a foolish hope of mine. Maiev blinks at that, even as Rognak grunts, throwing out a hand and applying entangling sets of roots to the current wave of attackers, supporting and alleviating the burden on Nighthaven's defenders by quite a bit. You know these creatures, Lord Cenarius? You know where they come from and what they are. She hadn't missed the demon lord's words back in Nendi's. How this Ditherok had spoken like the Naga were her people's long-lost kin or something. She'd merely put it in the back of her mind, to be investigated later. Now however, despite the dire situation, Maiev can't help but fall into interrogation mode. It's all too natural for someone like her. Cenarius, for his part, does not reprimand her nor tell her this is not the time. Instead, the Lord of the Forest looks almost tired, his eyes drifting shut for a moment as he lets out a sigh. Indeed. 10,000 years ago, the War of the Ancients and the Great Sundering resulted in the Night Elf people turning away from arcane magic and embracing nature in all its glory. Your people settled the remaining lands of Kalimdor and cared for the forests here, and in turn the forests cared for you. In the case of the world tree Nordrassil, this was quite literal until recently, seeing as it provided you with immortality. Maiev is well aware that there's a battle going on still, but for the moment at least, they seem to have it well in hand. The Naga are relentless, but disorganized. It's obvious from the glaze in their eyes that they are under the same mind control that the ones in Nendi's were. However, much like happened in Nendi's after Ditherok fled like a coward, they aren't able to do much beyond attack, attack, and attack. Not without his direct presence on the battlefield, it would seem. As such, she feels secure in listening to Lord Cenarius' explanation. And admittedly, she's drawn in by the tale he's weaving. Utterly fascinated by where he's going with all of this. However, you and your people are not the only survivors of the Great Kaldore Empire, Warden Shadowsong. Maiyev's eyes widen at that. What? But the rest were. She cuts herself off, the realization hitting her like a boulder as she whips around and stares at these, aquatic serpentine creatures in a whole new light. Looking at them, it's hard to see any similarities, until she looks from the males in the front lines to the females in the back. The Naga sirens who are mindlessly casting frost magic at their defenses, staring at their faces, she can almost see the kinship. Lost beneath the waves. That was what you were going to say, wasn't it, Warden? Indeed they were. But just because they were lost, does not mean they were killed. There are things lurking in the shadows of this world that even I would not dare to face head-on or alone. The Naga are what remains of the Highborn. It is said that they are led by Queen Ashera herself to this day, though you would not likely recognize her. Maiev jolts at that piece of information. She might not have had any personal interactions with Ashera, certainly not on the same level as, say, someone like Tyrande who had been one of the Queen's personal handmaidens. But she knew enough about the Queen to know she was a massive threat to Azeroth. The bitch's vanity had damn near led to the destruction of Azeroth. Oh, what Maiev wouldn't give to be able to have Ashera in her prison, languishing right next to Illidan for these past 10,000 years. If they'd known the cunt had survived, but no. No point wasting time mooning over what could have been. And besides, Maiev has a more pressing question at this point. How do you know all of this, Lord Cenarius? And, why keep it from us all this time? Lord Cenarius is quiet for a moment, before shaking his head. Parental concern, perhaps? I have no good excuse. Your people should have been told. Forewarned is forearmed, after all. Keeping the knowledge of the Naga from all of you was a mistake. As for how I know, the oceans are as much part of nature as these forests are. And in the same way I am Lord of the Forest, there are wild gods of the ocean. One of them, Wilhai, takes the form of a great whale shark, a creature that not even the Naga have sought to meddle with. He complains most frequently about their ocean empire all the same whenever we speak. For a moment, Maiyev's thought processes stutter to a halt as she finds herself picturing the forest demigod and a giant whale shark conversing and griping about their respective problems over some tea or something. Before she can fully get that out of her head, Lord Cenarius growls, his eyes staring out at the waves of Naga still streaming into view to waste themselves against the defenses of Nighthaven. However, I know not how these Naga have managed to make it so deep inland, to arrive at the Moonglade. Nor why they would do so in the first place rather than strike out at the many coastal towns that dot the shores of Kalimdor. Maiev opens her mouth to answer, only to be cut off by Rognak. That is because they are being forced to attack by a dreadlord named Ditherok. And as for how they are here, I believe he is also the answer to that as well. Cenarius, you would be able to check better than I, but I suspect there might be a portal at the bottom of Lake Illunaira that these Naga forces are coming from. Lord Cenarius' eyes widen at that assertion, even as Maiyev's do the same. The Lord of the Forest is quick to focus on the lake off in the distance, and then nods sharply. You are correct, Rognak. The Naga are coming from a portal tainted with fell magic, hidden in the depths of the lake. Maiyev's respect for the Orc Druid goes up another notch at that reveal, even as Rognak develops a savage grin and hoists his axe in the air. Then we just have to get over there and shut it. At least now we know how to end this. Indeed. Though, just as Maiev is moving to leap back on her hippogriff and Rognak looks ready to transform back into a wyvern so they can both fly on over and attack from the air. Lord Cenarius chuckles. You've been away too long, Rognak. You've forgotten what exactly it is I'm capable of. Before their eyes, the Lord of the Forest reaches out with a hand of branches and focuses his power. They don't actually see anything happen, but after a moment, he lets out a grunt of exertion and pulls back, nodding sharply. It is done. The portal has been closed. Maiev can't help but be impressed, though she hides it better than Rognak. And indeed, Lord Senarai's words prove themselves true, as the waves of Naga attackers slowly begin to peter out. Seeing this, the Night Elf Warden smirks and turns to Lord Senarais and Rognak. Excellent. With this, we need only wait for word from Naisha and the others and... Bahaha. To think, like buzzing gnats you try to stop my progress at every turn. Eyes widening once again, Maiev whips around along with Senarais and Rognak, just in time to see the fat, slothful form of the demon lord Dithirok unveil itself. The loathsome creature isn't alone, however. As he appears before them all, his massive bat-like wings flapping behind him and holding him aloft, the demon holds a prisoner in his hand. Maev's heart damn near stops as Naisha struggles in his grip, his claws wrapped around her neck. Unfortunately for you, the same trick doesn't work on me twice. This little bitch thought she could take me unawares like she did my Naga pet, but in the end, all she's done is reduce herself to a bargaining chip. Surrender and I shall spare her life. Fight me, and she dies like the rest of the pathetic rabble that was with her. Maev stiffens at that. If Dithirok was telling the truth, then he was much more powerful than she'd initially given him credit for. She thought him just a schemer with a powerful mind control ability, but for him to have killed the entire contingent of watchers Naisha had with her, gritting her teeth, Maev's mind races. Beside her, meanwhile, Rognak seems ill-inclined to just stand there. That's obviously not going to happen, Dreadlord. Why are you even doing this? Why are you here? Why do you want the shards of Frostmourne? The blade is shattered, broken into 100 pieces. It's useless to you. Lord Senarai's head snaps to Rognak and Maev has to give the orc credit. She'd been so busy interrogating Senarai's about these Naga that she'd missed her chance to warn the Lord of the Forest about what Dithirok was really after. Sloppy of her. But now he knows at least. Even if their situation is not any better than it was before. And surely this demon lord isn't about to tell them anything, right? Who could be that foolish? Bahaha. A sword can be reforged, pesky little orc. Even a rune blade as powerful as that one can be made whole again. And the Lich King will have need of it, in order to keep his promises to the Legion and Lord Kil'jaeden. Maiev blinks, even as Dithirok scratches his belly with his free hand, looking overly pleased with himself. But then, why am I still talking to you, buzzing gnat? Senarai's. Forest Lord. I know that it is you who are keeper of Frostmourne's shards. Give them to me and I shall leave you all in peace. You may cower in fear, knowing that one day soon the Lich King and the Legion will come for you all. Bahaha. Of course, Lord Senarais remains silent. And Maiev feels like her heart is about to be ripped out of her chest, because she knows full well that none of them are going to give the demon what he wants. Not even her. Not even to save her mate. Meeting Naisha's eyes, Maiev expects to see resignation there. She's a little surprised to find defiance instead. A silent tableau has developed, but it's suddenly shattered when Naisha rears her feet up and plants them on Dithirok's arm. The demon lord looks over at her with a contemptuous sneer. Little. I am not, a bargaining chip. With a snarl, Naisha takes the dagger that she's managed to slip from the small of her back while they had Dithirok monologuing and slams it down into the fat demon's wrist. With an angry cry, Dithirok's claws spasm open, and Naisha begins to drop. Unfortunately, he is not so surprised that he doesn't immediately retaliate. Letting out a roar, the flying demon lord immediately opens his mouth and lets out a blast of fell fire that engulfs Naisha in an instant. No. Maiev reaches for her mate, anguish alongside rage filling her voice. Her heart breaks, even as her blood sings for violent revenge. But before she can dart forward to dole out retribution for Naisha's death, the smoke clears and Maiev is brought up short, blinking at the sight. Rather than Naisha's charged corpse, there is a thick bramble shell still burning merrily with fell fire covering the spot where she fell. And as it pulls back, a single solitary figure darts out from it, racing across the ground to their defensive line with all her speed. Maiev can hardly believe it when Naisha slams into her arms just as Rognak is pulling back his hand, the shell of roots proving to be his quick thinking. Dithirok, meanwhile, scowls angrily at the sight and then takes in what he's up against. With a snarl, the demon lord once again begins to pull back and up into the air, only to slam into some invisible force that shoves him back towards the ground. I think not, Dreadlord. You wanted this battle. And now, you shall have it. Lord Senarai's words ring out over the suddenly hushed battlefield, only to provoke a raucous war cry from the defenders of Nighthaven, all of whom are all too ready to put the demon lord to death for his actions. Maiev joins them, removing her arms from Naisha and lifting up her umbra crescent as a snarl of righteous fury overtakes her features. Dithirok was a threat before. But now? Now he'd made it fucking personal. Chapter 41, Answering the Call. Dithirok meets the raucous battle cries with a roar of outrage, the trapped Nathrazim clearly not intending to go down without a fight. And yet, even with that said, it's obvious he's not going to survive this. The battle might still need to be fought, but the ending is predetermined. It's only a matter of seeing how many Dithirok takes down with him before he goes, but even that isn't likely to be that high of a number given Senarai's presence. The forest demigod not only has Dithirok locked down, keeping him from escaping the Moonglade while the defenders of Nighthaven harry and harass him from all angles, but he's also providing support and defense to those fighting, healing any injuries that Dithirok's nasty claws and blasts of fell fire do manage to cause. Seeing all of this and recognizing that the battle has a foregone conclusion, Rognak also hangs back, staying by Senarai's side and even sheathing Wolf Song on his back as Maiev and Naisha both surge forward. Instead of entering the fray directly, Rognak sinks into something of an active meditation, a technique that Senarai's had taught him a couple months back. Tranquility washes over the area, healing the courageous combatant engaging the Dreadlord and keeping them in fighting shape. As Rognik channels the powerful piece of nature magic, he lets his eyes drift shut for a moment, trusting that the others have this handled. He needs this time to think, because frankly, things that didn't make sense before are suddenly beginning to click together. It's like he finally has enough pieces of the puzzle to see the bigger picture for what it really is. Ditherok had given him the final few pieces, of course. The Nathrazim might not even realize how much he gave away with his gloating words. After all, he had no way of knowing all that Rognik knew, in the end. He had no way of understanding Rognik's strange, unique set of circumstances. If he, or worse, his masters, caught wind of Rognik's situation, then it would be bad. Very bad. But at the same time, the Orc Druid wouldn't trade it for anything in the world. Having the foreknowledge he did had helped him quite a lot over the years. And he would continue to make use of it, even now. Finding Ditherok leading the Naga in place of Illidan Stormrage had been weird enough, but to hear that he was searching for the lost shards of Frostmourne had been even stranger. Mostly because, well, Rognik's second set of memories assured him that by this point in time, the Lich King and the Burning Legion should have been at odds. However, that wasn't always the case, obviously. The Lich King and the Scourge were originally the Burning Legion's creatures through and through. The schism between the two groups wasn't set to happen until after Archimonde's failure at Mount Hyjal. Not until the deceiver, Kil'jaeden, reached out to the Lich King to try and utilize him further in a bid to continue the conquest of Azeroth despite the defeat of his peer. Rognik's memories of another life where his world was nothing but a video game assured him that when Kil'jaeden tried to get in contact with the Lich King, Nazul would have refused him, and ultimately that would have in turn led to Kil'jaeden seeking out Illidan Stormrage and forcing the Demon Hunter, newly ascended to demonhood via the skull of Gul'dan, to go to Northrend and destroy the Frozen Throne and the Lich King. Obviously, that didn't happen here. But it wasn't Illidan's death that was the point of divergence for these events as Rognik had initially thought. No, it was Arthas. With Ditherok's words, Rognik was able to piece things together and figure out what must have happened. When Arthas died and Frostmourne was shattered, it must have gravely wounded the Lich King. Privately, Rognik had hoped that the loss of Frostmourne would ultimately result in Nazul's death as well, but it would seem he wasn't that lucky, unfortunately. Still, the Ruablade's destruction must have been singularly harmful to the Lich King, because the only way any of this made sense is if Nazul had bowed his head and asked for help when Kil'jaeden came knocking. Yes. Rognik could see it well enough in his mind's eye. Kil'jaeden reaching out to Nazul, only to find the Lich King dying. It must have left the deceiver in as close to a panic as a creature like him could get. And so, when Nazul had been forced to swallow his pride and beg Kil'jaeden for help, the Eredar Lord had went about trying to fix things. Namely, he'd contacted Ditherok over in Lord Aaron at the very least and set the Oafish Dreadlord to securing and retrieving the shards of Frostmourne so that the rune blade could be reforged and the Lich King made whole again. Far from seeking to kill the Lich King, Kil'jaeden was now trying to save the Lich King. And that changed everything. No. Rognik's eyes snap open just in time to see Ditherok held down by entangling roots from Cenarius, his arms and legs pulled apart so that he had no way of defending himself as Mayev Shadowsong leaped up into the air and brought her Umbra Crescent down upon his neck, shearing his head from his fat, grotesque body. The Nathrazim dies messily, but Rognik focuses on more targeted healing towards those that his tranquility wasn't enough for before turning to Cenarius, feeling ill at ease, even with their victory. Cenarius, this isn't the end. This is only the beginning. The Lord of the Forest knows most of what Rognik knows, of course. They'd focused the majority of their talks about the future on what Rognik knew of the situation in the Emerald Dream, to be fair. Dealing with the Nightmare Lord and his Emerald Nightmare was far closer to home for the Forest Demigod than anything else. But Rognik had mentioned at one point that Arthas was merely a servant of a greater power, and that the Lich King lay in the far north, in the frozen reaches of Northrend. He'd voiced his belief that Frostmourne, the most powerful rune blade ever created, had housed a vast portion of the Lich King's strength, and that by shattering it, they might have dealt with the threat before it could truly grow legs. Certainly with Arthas' death, they'd altered the threat beyond anything recognizable, or so he had assumed. And yet, Cenarius looks out at the battlefield for a moment longer to make sure Ditherok's death sticks, before finally turning to Rognik and letting out a sigh as he nods. Indeed. His words were, troubling to say the least. This Master Kil'jaeden that he spoke of. Do you know of him? Rognik blinks, belatedly realizing that Kil'jaeden hadn't actually been part of the War of the Ancients 10,000 years ago, so Cenarius wouldn't know him in the same way he and the Night Elves had known Archimonde the Defiler. Nodding slowly, Rognik grimaces. Yes. He is known as the Deceiver, in the same way that Archimonde is known as the Defiler. It was he who infiltrated my people's homeworld of Draenor. It was he who turned the Orcs into the Horde all for the sake of his vendetta against the remnants of his own people, the Draenei. Cenarius soaks this in for a moment before slowly inhaling and exhaling. So then, if Archimonde is Sargera's right hand, this Kil'jaeden is his left. Rognik frowns at that, considering the comparison for a moment before shaking his head. It's the other way around, I think. Kil'jaeden. Kil'jaeden is the Burning Legion's second in command. Archimonde and he joined Sargeras at the same time, but the Deceiver stands above the Defiler in the Dark Titan's esteem. That gets the Lord of the Forest's attention, his eyes widening as he processes that declaration. Rognik is pretty sure it's true, though the exact memories are a little fuzzy. Still, he's confident that Kil'jaeden is a massive threat, even if the Eredar Lord shouldn't be on Azeroth in person in the same way Archimonde was. He makes as much clear to Cenarius. I don't believe Kil'jaeden is actually on Azeroth. But that doesn't make his current machinations any less dangerous than Archimonde's were. Once news of Ditherok's defeat reaches his allies, they will send a much greater force after us to try and take back the shards of Frostmourne. No matter what, this is not the end. For a moment, Cenarius stays silent. Then, finally, the Forest Lord nods. History does not repeat itself word for word. But it does often rhyme, doesn't it? 10,000 years ago, the War of the Ancients was decided by a small band of Night Elf rebels, aided greatly by a human and orc who were far from home. And more recently, it was Night Elves, humans, and orcs who fought back the Burning Legion, alongside several other mortal races. Rognik blinks at the reference to Broxigar and Ronan's time travel and the part they'd played in the War of the Ancients compared to the much more recent Battle of Mount Hyjal. But he stays quiet as Cenarius continues speaking. This, from what you have told me, seems to be much the same. The players are missing, but the stage is still set. One way or another, there are forces at work trying to save the Lich King, and thus there must be forces at work trying to destroy him. Staying here on Kalimdor and trying to wait out this storm, it will only provoke greater and greater reprisal. You are correct. Cenarius' eyes blaze as he looks to Ditherok's remains. Like all Nathrazim, the fat Dreadlord has left no body, only his stretched out armor laying on the grass near the edge of Nighthaven. The battle against the Naga had not been without its casualties. Nighthaven would recover just as Nendi's would, but they were still both tragedies, to say the least. I will not allow Kalimdor to come to any further harm. Our goal in this instance is obvious. We must journey to Northrend and destroy the Lich King once and for all. Only then can this Kil'jaedan's plans be stymied. Rognik grimaces, even as he hears the resolve in Cenarius' voice. The Lord of the Forest is right, of course. And yet, part of Rognik worries all the same. Is it even possible to kill the Lich King? He really doesn't want to find out what happens if they destroy the Helm of Domination in the same way they shattered Frostmourne. His second set of memories have a rather derisive view of some of the later elements of the games he'd apparently played in that second life. There's this concept that floats around in Rognik's mind every once in a while called a Reetkin, and he won't lie, it confuses the hell out of him, while also throwing into doubt much of the foreknowledge he has regarding this world's future. But then to be fair, the more he changes, the less worth his foreknowledge has anyways. Killing Fondrel and stopping the Night Elves from isolating themselves in large numbers on Teldrassil had already dramatically changed several future events, for instance. To say nothing of what the deaths of Malfurion, Illidan, and Arthas all meant for the future of Azeroth as well. In the end, Cenarius is right. Rognik knows that the Lord of the Forest is right. Removing Nazul from the board, ending the tormented orc spirit's agony and suffering once and for all, it can only be considered a good thing. And even if they don't destroy the Helm of Domination, removing it from play this early on could also only be a good thing. Though, even as Rognik straightens his back and flares his nostrils, finding his own resolve, a whisper echoes in the back of his head all the same. There must always be a Lich King. A disquieting thought to say the least. But, they would cross that bridge when they got to it. Still, before he can open his mouth and muster up a response, a voice suddenly cuts into their conversation. This isn't over, is it? Ditherok was a monster controlling monsters to be sure, but he spoke of a master. And of a creature called the Lich King. Rognik stiffens and turns along with Cenarius as Mayev Shadowsong and her second Naisha both approach. The latter Night Elf gives Rognik an appreciative nod that he returns, pleased that he was able to save the Warden's life. Even if she'd proven her words true, she was certainly no bargaining chip, nor a damsel in distress needing a hero, no matter what Ditherok had thought. You are correct, Warden Shadowsong. Ditherok might have been working alone here on Kalimdor, forcing him to resort to using mind control to turn the Naga into his shock troops, but he has allies. And once they learn he's failed, they will seek to rectify his mistakes themselves. Before that happens, we must go on the offensive. To that end, I shall go to meet with the High Priestess, in order to begin the creation of an expedition to Northrend, where the Lich King sits upon his frozen throne. Right. They would need supplies and resources, all of which the Night Elves could provide far better than Rognik's people. While their new lands were certainly proving to be far more prosperous than they could have been in another version of events, there was no denying that the orcs were still settling into their new home even now. The Night Elves on the other hand, for all that they'd lost in the invasion of Kalimdor, still had plenty to go around. Though Rognik would endeavor to get word to the Warsong clan, and bring as many of his Warsong druids to Northrend with him as he could possibly get a hold of. Despite initial hiccups with their tutelage, the Orc Druids that he and Cenarius had managed to teach in these past several months had proven to be quick learners once they got past their initial hurdles. Far quicker than most Night Elf Druids in fact, who could spend decades on the training that Rognik's fellow orcs had already managed to complete. Regardless, Then we will come with you to Northrend. I shall send word immediately for a new contingent of watchers to meet us on the way to the High Priestess. Rognik blinks, a little taken aback by Mayev's words. He'd gotten so lost in his own thoughts that he'd missed her and Naisha exchanging meaningful looks, and now he's so surprised that he finds himself blurting out a question before really thinking about it. Are you certain? It will be incredibly dangerous. The moment the words leave his mouth, he feels like a fool for speaking them. However, the expected caustic response never comes. While Mayev does stiffen for a moment at his questioning, she glances at Naisha and instead of biting off his head, simply gives a single solid nod in response. I can think of no worthier cause. The Lich King will be stopped. This, I swear on my name and as Warden of the Watchers. And with that, it's settled. Chapter 42, Astranar Reborn. Astranar. Admittedly, Mayev had not visited the small lake town in quite a few years before now. But that didn't make the change from a town to a city any less shocking to witness. Especially since she was given to understand that this had not been the result of years, possibly even decades of growth, but only the work of the past several months. The old Estranar was damn near razed to the ground by Archimonde and the Legion in their single-minded pursuit of Tyrande Whisperwind. Countless loyal sentinels had laid down their lives to give first the townsfolk, and then Tyrande herself, the opportunity to escape. And yet, the people of Estranar had put true to the words that a town was nothing without its citizens. The buildings themselves might have been destroyed, but the civilians had returned, and with dogged focus, rebuilt. More than rebuilt, for Estranar was now the center of Night Elf civilization in all of northern Kalimdor. Once a small town built on an island within a lake connected only to the rest of Ashenvale by a pair of bridges, the place had been transformed into an entire city in the past few months. The center island was now dominated by a large, gorgeous temple to Elune, while all along the outer edge of the lake, buildings had sprung up, practically overnight. Of course, with the correct druidic influence, it was possible for Night Elf buildings to sprout up overnight quite literally. All it took was a connection with nature and a will to see it done, and the trees of Ashenvale Forest would work with you so long as you weren't complacent or rude. Or so Maiev had always been told. She was not a druid herself, after all. She had never spoken to the trees and coaxed them to grow a certain way or give up some of their precious wood in the way a druid could. Though, with the losses that the Night Elves had taken when it came to their druid population, one might wonder where the ability to create such a gorgeous city so fast had come from. But the answer was right in front of them. The Night Elves were not alone in their new capital. Maiev could see orcs dressed in leather robes working alongside Night Elves clad similarly, communing with nature together in order to make growth happen at an accelerated rate. And indeed, it wasn't just Orcish druids who commingled with the Night Elves of Estranar. There were other orcs as well who were clearly less druids and more warriors, walking around wearing armor and wielding large weapons of war. They went unhindered, and indeed caused no trouble in turn. And the orcs weren't the only non-elven race in the city either. Humans and Tauren could also be found, though in far lesser number. There were even a troll or two here or there, though they definitely had the lowest representation. That didn't surprise Maiev too much. Night Elves and trolls had long found themselves clashing and rubbing themselves the long way. The trolls would claim it was because the Night Elves refused to acknowledge that they were themselves descended from trolls eons ago. But privately, Maiev had always believed that to be bullshit. In the end, their ways of life, while similar in some ways, were just too different for peaceful coexistence to last long. Certainly, Maiev and her watchers had had to handle a couple of troll warlords in the last 10,000 years. To say nothing of what their witch doctors could get up to if they got the wrong sort of voodoo going. And yet, despite 10,000 years of experiences telling her that elves mingling with other races was a bad idea, Maiev doesn't find the sight as offensive as she would have thought. But then, she knew why that was, didn't she? Rognag. The Warsong chieftain had managed to get under her skin. She actually found herself respecting the Orc Druid more than she cared to admit. In point of fact, she knew deep down inside that he and his race were the impetus for all of this. Maiev's people had been slow to grow and damn near stagnant for centuries, no, for millennia. Even the destruction of Nordrassil likely wouldn't have been enough of a shock to the system to force through the cultural change they needed in order to adapt to the rapidly altered world they found themselves in. But the orcs were just what the priestess prescribed, weren't they? The creatures, savage and noble that they were, did not stop for nothing. They just kept going, and in doing so they had managed to set an example for Maiev's people to follow. That wasn't to say the Night Elves were becoming subservient to these orcs, thankfully. No, the younger races still had much to learn, and Maiev's people had much to teach. But, there was something to be said about the knowledge to be learned going both ways. Of course, she wasn't about to say any of that out loud. Stoicism was the name of the game, especially given where they were now. Standing in the upper tier of the Grand Temple of Elune erected on the site of Old Estranar, Maiev finds herself alongside Naisha in the back, essentially out on a balcony of sorts as they watch Lord Cenarius and the Warsong chieftain explain everything that has happened to High Priestess Tyrande Whisperwind and Sentinel Captain Chandri's Feathermoon. As the two Night Elf women grow increasingly more concerned with every word that passes from the mouths of Rognag and the Forest Demigod, Maiev finds herself nudged in the side by her mate. Amazing, isn't it? What's been done here in Estranar? I never would have thought it possible. Her first impulse is to tell Naisha to be quiet, to reprimand her for speaking out of turn. But they're both far enough away that they aren't interrupting the meeting going on inside, while also close enough to hear every word. And, having almost lost Naisha up in Moonglade, Maiev finds it hard to reprimand her, even if she's supposed to be the other warden's superior officer first and her mate second. In the end, she just grunts and nods, the best that Naisha is going to get from her in this circumstance. Of course, she can feel her mate's mischievous energy right beside her. The little minx is going to do something to provoke her any second, isn't she? She just. But Naisha never gets the chance, because Tyrande suddenly speaks up, the High Priestess of Elune's words managing to catch even their attention and hold it fast. You are correct. This situation is incredibly dire and must be dealt with sooner rather than later. Lord Cenarius, Chieftain Rognag, our resources are at your disposal. An expedition to Northrend will set out from the port town of Oberdine within the week. That by itself was great to hear, but before anyone can really breathe, let alone speak, Tyrande continues on, her eyes blazing with poorly contained fervor. Seeing as this Lich King is responsible for the death of both Storm Rage brothers, albeit in a roundabout way, I will be going with you. To settle unfinished business, once and for all. That is what gets everyone's attention, even Lord Cenarius visibly surprised, while Rognak literally rears back in shock. Maiev, meanwhile, tilts her head, a little caught off guard by the High Priestess' audacity, but more amused than anything. Part of her had been ready to blame Tyrande for all of it when she initially got back to the Barrow Deeps and found out that Illidan Stormrage was not in his cell. She'd always found it suspicious that the priestess had never visited the prisoner, despite their close connection. Biding her time, perhaps? But no. Maev's initial assessment had been incorrect, and she'd been forced to change her tune when she found out that Tyrande had actually had nothing to do with Illidan's parole. It was all Lord Cenarius and to a lesser extent Rognak in the end. Ultimately, Maev's heart went out to Tyrande. To lose her mate like that, and for that mate to be Malfurion Stormrage, one of their people's greatest leaders, yes, her heart went out to the other woman. Even still. Tyrande. High Priestess. Surely you can't be serious. You can't possibly go, you're our people's only remaining leader. They look to you for guidance. We've only managed as much as we have in these past several months with you leading the way. If Lord Cenarius is going to Northrend, we need you here more than ever. Chandri's Feathermoon lays it out pretty succinctly, Maiev feels. While there's no replacing Malfurion Stormrage, and the death of Archdruid Staghelm so soon after was also highly regrettable, Tyrande had done her best all the same. And looking around them, Maiev was forced to admit that the other woman had really stepped up. Then again, she'd been leading them while Malfurion tended to his duties in the dream for much of the past 10,000 years anyways. Maybe not well, but she had been leading them. And yet, Tyrande turns to her adoptive daughter and gives the Sentinel Captain a serene smile. You are correct, Chandris. With Malfurion's death, we lost a pillar of our people. Though. Lord Cenarius, am I correct in assuming that your departure means Brawl Bearmantle has finally agreed to take on the title of Archdruid? The forest demigod nods his head as he's addressed. Yes. It took some convincing from his daughter before his ridiculous insecurities and ultimately petty worries about not being good enough were laid to rest, but he has finally accepted the title. The Night Elves have an Archdruid once more, else you are right that I would be much less inclined to volunteer myself for this trip to the frozen north. Maiev tilts her head to the side at that, noting how surprised Chandris looks by this new information. Still, she's quick to rally. That's all well and good, priestess, but even still. Brawl, Archdruid Bearmantle can't be expected to do it all on his own. Once again, Tyrande remains calm. That serene smile of hers might as well have been permanently etched across her face as she steps forward and places her hands on Chandri's shoulders. He won't be, my dear. He'll have you to help him, because as of this moment, I am putting you in charge while I am gone. In my absence, you will handle all of my duties and responsibilities not directly pertaining to the Temple of Elune. The other priestesses can handle the temple business so that you aren't overwhelmed. Alright, now Maiev is a little amused. It's become apparent that Tyrande has thought this whole thing through, even if Chandris clearly hadn't. Eyes wide, the sentinel's mouth opens and closes like a fish a few times before she finally thinks up a new argument. I can't possibly take your place, Tyrande. I'm just a sentinel captain. Surely I don't have the rank or the pull for such a task. And yet, even at that, the High Priestess remains unperturbed. You were only a sentinel captain, Chandris. But if there's anything that these last several months have taught me, it's that we grew complacent over the last few millennia. Complacent and slow to adapt, slow to advance. You have held the title of sentinel captain for some time now, centuries, if I remember correctly. As such, I am proud to greet you under your new title. General Feathermoon. Oh ho. Tyrande had covered every contingency, hadn't she? Maiev doesn't grin, but she wants to. Beside her, she knows Naisha is grinning wide enough for the both of them. This right here? This is peak entertainment, to be sure. Though, interestingly enough, Rognak in particular jolts at the conferred title. Hearing General Feathermoon almost seems to mean something to the Orc Druid. Maiev doesn't know what, but she finds his reaction curious if nothing else. Chandris, meanwhile, is just frozen in place, eyes wide and mouth agape in shock. She seems torn between pleased at having her contributions to their people recognized with the promotion, and horrified at what's coming along with it. Placing her hands on Chandri's shoulders, Tyrande gives the other woman a heartfelt smile. I know I can count on you, General. Together with Archdruid Bearmantle, you will be extraordinary. Our people couldn't possibly be in safer hands. Chandris looks like she has several things she wants to say to that, but before she can, Tyrande pulls her into a hug, and in the end, the younger night elf simply hugs her back, looking as pale as a specter and whimpering into Tyrande's shoulder. XXX. Later that evening, Maiev finds herself on a different balcony entirely, high up in a tree that has been turned into temporary lodging for travelers. She and Naisha have been granted a set of rooms on the third floor, and Maiev stares out over the city that Astranar has become, watching as even late into the evening, even with the sun set, there's still plenty of movement to be seen, people moving back and forth with magical lanterns and candles to light their way. Suddenly, a pair of hands covers her face. Maiev reacts appropriately, reaching up and grabbing her attacker's wrists and executing a maneuver that puts her behind them before they can react, locking their arms together and ultimately arresting their movement entirely. Of course, there are a number of different ways to escalate the successful counter into a proper string of disabling or even lethal attacks from there, but seeing as her attacker is her mate, Maiev doesn't go for any of them. Naisha giggles and relaxes into her hold almost immediately, the other warden not even trying to fight it as she rests back against Maev's chest and lets out a happy little sigh. In turn, Maiev leans her chin on Naisha's shoulder, accepting the moment of luxury for what it is and acknowledging, at least to herself, that such moments will be in short supply very soon, especially once they set off for Northrend. Before she can say anything, however, Naisha makes a noise of curiosity in the back of her throat. Oh! Look there, Maiev. Maiev looks to where Naisha is pointing, and after a moment, makes out the form of one Chandri's feathermoon moving through the city streets. However, the more interesting thing is that she's not alone, but instead accompanied by a human woman with gold hair of all things. Mayev's eyes narrow at the sight and her lips pull into a frown. What is our new Sentinel General doing with a human at this time of night, I wonder? Naisha lets out a laugh and abruptly breaks free of a distracted Mayev's hold, though only to turn around in her arms and reach up to grab hold of her face. Nuh-uh. I know that tone, beloved. That's your I want to go snoop voice. Maiev narrows her eyes even further, though now she does so at her mate. I do not snoop. I investigate. Naisha just grins and shakes her head. Sure. But there's nothing to investigate here. Save your strength for the battles ahead, my love. You'll need it. Now, quit your pouting and take me to bed. Frowning, Maiev does as she's told, drawing back from the balcony. Though not without firing back one last response. I wasn't pouting. I was scowling. There's a difference. Of course, beloved. Of course. Humph. She cut Naisha way too much slack sometimes. Still, in this case, her mate was right. Whatever Chandri's feathermoon was doing with that human woman at this time of night. It was none of Mayev's business. Chapter 42.5, Astronar Reborn, Lude. He's expecting Chandri's to come and visit him. That's why he waits up for her, relaxing but not letting himself fall asleep despite the incredible comfort of the temporary accommodations he's been provided with. Frankly, what the Night Elves have managed with Astronar is inspiring to say the least. It's both similar and not to what his second set of memories tell him could have been regarding Darnassus. But most importantly of all, it's not suffering from the problems Teldrassil would have suffered from under Fondrel Stagilm's duplicitous attention. Still, even as he waits for Chandri's arrival, Rognak finds himself going over the events of the day in his head. Tyrande had been rather adamant that she would be coming along, and seeing how Cenarius himself hadn't tried to stop her, Rognak wasn't about to make a go of it either. If she felt like Brawl and Chandri's could handle things on Kalimdor in her absence, then who was he to argue? Indeed, he was leaving his own projects in the hands of equally capable subordinates. Sure, the Horde had Thrall as its warchief to keep everything on track there, but while a great majority of the Warsong Druids would be coming to Northrend with the expedition, not all of them would. If the worst came to pass and they somehow perished, Rognak wanted to make sure Druidism within the Orcs did not die off. It needed to continue, no matter what. Just as his thoughts are turning towards morbid possibilities, a knock on the door startles him out of them. Rognak looks up from his musings and grunts, rising to his feet and moving over to let Chandri's in. As previously said, he knew to expect her. However, he did not expect who she would bring with her. Jaina. Stepping aside to allow them both entry, Rognak can't help but stare at the smiling human mage. Jaina Proudmoore, Lady of the Amor Isle, slips into the humble accommodations and gives him a nod. Rognak. Chandri's, meanwhile, scoffs and none too gently punches him in the shoulder. What am I? Chopped liver. Blinking, Rognak flushes and shakes his head. Apologies, I just didn't expect Jaina along with you, Chandri's. The two women he'd found himself in committed relationships were here at the same time, each clearly expecting his attention. It would be a heart-stopping moment if not for a few things. 1. They knew about each other. 2. It was actually Chandri's who had seduced Jaina into his bed for him in the first place. And 3. They had both made it clear they didn't mind sharing him with one another. Smiling softly, Jaina nods her head. Chandri's sent me a message. We decided we would share you for the evening, before you had to leave. Rognak shifts from foot to foot at that. The expedition doesn't depart for another week, Jaina. It's Chandri's who scoffs at that. And? You'll be heading to either Oberdine or Orgrimmar on the morrow to begin making preparations, won't you? Meanwhile, she's needed back in their Amor sooner rather than later. And I'm a fucking general now. As much as I wish I could promise we'll all be able to spend every night of the next week together, there simply won't be time. With that decisively stated, Chandri's leaves little room for argument, especially when she begins yanking her armor off quite aggressively, stripping naked right there on the spot. Jaina and Rognak share a glance at the slightly irritable Night Elf's behavior, before both shrugging and beginning to strip out of their own garments as well. As they do so, a thought strikes Rognak and he finds himself frowning, a little worried as he glances over in Jaina's direction. Jaina, will you be okay, not going with us to Northrend? An appreciative smile ghosts across the human mage's face, along with some pain that she doesn't quite manage to hide. A quiet sigh leaves her lips, before ultimately she nods. I'll be fine. Truthfully, my place is here on Kalimdor, with my people. There isn't really anyone I can truly trust to watch over their Amor in my stead. Not at this critical juncture. And, as much as I want the Lich King dead for what he and the Legion did to Arthas, I've moved on. The monster Arthas became, he's gone now. The Prince of Lord Aaron has been laid to rest, in no small part thanks to you. I'm at peace with it, I suppose. And then Jaina smirks. Besides, I know you Rognak. I know you won't stop until you've successfully ended the threat that the Lich King and these Dread Lords pose. I guess. I'm content to sit back this time because I know the mission is in excellent hands. A swell of pride fills Rognek's chest at that, even as pulsing hot blood fills his growing cock at the sight of Chandri's angina, both in equal states of nudity and undress now. His eyes roam over their beautiful bodies, the two women very different from each other, but both gorgeous in their own ways. Chandri's meanwhile, scoffs at Jaina's words, cocking out a hip and putting a hand on it as she shakes her head. If only Tyrande felt the same way. Before Rognek can respond to that quip, Jaina gets this look in her eye. Suddenly, the human mage whips around and flicks out her fingers, letting loose a spell that neither of the other people in the room had realized she was even casting in the first place. What the? Chandri squawks indignantly as, near instantly, she finds herself bound in glowing orange arcane shackles. They pull her arms and legs taut in an X, leaving her spread eagle in midair as she struggles and squirms but to no avail. Restrained, her taut and naked body is on display for both of them as Chandri's blushes and scowls fiercely for a moment before letting her scowl turn into a pout. Jaina, meanwhile, is positively aglow with contentment as her eyes twinkle in mischievous joy. I've been wanting to do that for a while now. Not too tight I hope, Chandri's. Rognek lifts an eyebrow, even as Chandri sighs and wiggles for a moment longer before falling still. No. They're fine. Jaina smirks and then flicks her fingers again. Chandri's can only gasp as the arcane shackles float her over to the nearby bed. The newly promoted Night Elf General finds herself with her arms coming together over her head, while her legs remain stretched out, showing off her beautifully wet pussy lips. Rognek can't help but admire the sight. Every inch of Chandri's is on display. The Night Elf woman's incredibly defined musculature flexes as the more feminine parts of her anatomy jiggle and wiggle. Meanwhile, her captor stalks over, and crawls up onto the bed. Where Chandri's is all lean muscle mixed with light curves, Jaina is the opposite. She's all curves, with a body that just screamed pillow princess. Normally, Chandri's had no issues physically manhandling the human woman however she wanted. She was just stronger than Jaina, that was how it was. But right now, Jaina's magic has given the human mage the upper hand. Right now, despite being a pillow princess, Jaina is the one in charge as she leans over Chandri's, running her hands up and down the helpless night elf's beautiful figure. At the same time, Jaina wiggles her ass back and forth, swaying her hips from side to side as she kneels there between Chandri's legs. Looking back over her shoulder at him while she cups the other female's breasts, Jaina bites her lower lip, her eyes silently conveying an invitation Rognek simply can't refuse. Grunting, his cock positively throbbing with need by this point, the Orc Druid makes his way over to the bed as well. Placing one knee up on the bed, he rests a large green hand on Jaina's backside, cupping one of her sizable butt cheeks even as his thick fingers end up fully splayed over that half of her ass as well as parts of her thigh and hip. His other hand takes hold of his cock and places it against her slit, causing her to moan and her lower lips to clamp down on his dick tip in anticipation. She's more than wet enough for him, though the size difference is still very much a thing. Fortunately, as Rathian humans are built much tougher than the ones from his previous life's world. Otherwise, he's not sure he would have been able to start a sexual relationship with Jaina in the first place. As it is, he takes his time pushing into her. One of her hands even comes back and she uses her fingers to splay her pussy lips further apart for him, allowing him all the ease of entry in the world. At the same time, her other hand remains affixed to Chandri's breast, groping and squeezing the bound night elf woman's chest as she moans wantonly into her face. Eventually, he's as deep inside of her as he dares to go. Which is why he's a little surprised when Jaina insists on pushing back against him, not just bouncing her hips but actively using all of her meager physical strength to force him back. He doesn't fight her of course, and the end result is him fully standing at the edge of the bed, while Jaina kneels there in front of him, trailing her tongue down Chandri's taut abs and eventually reaching the bound night elf's pussy lips. Rognek blinks at this, even as Chandri's eyes, which had become lidded, go wide the moment Jaina's tongue touches her cunt. The newly promoted general gasps as the lady of the Amor Isle begins to eat her out, working that tongue of hers in and out of Chandri's folds. Rognek just watches the incredibly intoxicating sight for a moment, wondering how he got so lucky. Then, Jaina wiggles her hips in an insistent manner that reminds him he's not just some bystander here. No, he has his own duties to be upholding. Chuckling heartily, he grabs hold of Jaina by her hips, his large green hands easily managing to encircle the tight waistline of the beautiful mage's hourglass figure. Once he has a solid hold on her, he begins to fuck into her, thrusting his cock into her depths and running up against the entrance to her womb itself as he bottoms out inside of her again and again. The sounds of flesh slapping against flesh, cock meat squelching in and out of a sloppily wet pussy, and wanton feminine moans mixed with harsh masculine grunts quickly fills the room. As he fucks Jaina, she in turn eats out Chandri's. And Chandri's in turn lays back and takes it. Rognek realizes, watching Chandri's moan up a storm from Jaina's oral technique, that this was exactly what the night elf woman needed. After the day she'd had and the responsibilities foisted upon her by her adoptive mother, was it any surprise that what Chandri's needed most in the world was some no-nonsense monkey sex? But more than that, she needed to have any sort of responsibility or duty to the encounter taken away from her. And that was exactly what Jaina had done. By binding Chandri's with the arcane shackles, she was keeping the night elf from actively participating in any way. Despite their two distinct body types, it was Chandri's who was being treated like the pillow princess in this instance, with Jaina nibbling at her clit and swirling her tongue around inside of the other woman's cunt while Rognek pounds Jaina's gloriously tight, incredibly soft cunt from behind. The three of them exult in one another's company for what feels like an eternity, Jaina's pussy trying and failing to hold him inside of it, but nevertheless succeeding in eventually managing to milk him of his load. However, by the time Rognek finally seats the human mage, filling her with his cum, Jaina is beyond exhausted. She's put her all into this entire encounter, and it shows. As he pulls out of her, the arcane shackles holding Chandri's in place fade away, allowing the night elf to suddenly wrap her legs around Jaina's head and hold her to her cunt. Leg. The next few moments are filled with enthusiastic lapping sounds and Chandri's moans, before finally the toned night elf bucks her hips and gasps, squirting her own orgasm all over Jaina's face. A moment later and Jaina is rolled off onto her side, sprawled out and panting, her face glistening with pussy juices and her cunt leaking thick and copious amounts of orc cum. Meanwhile, Chandri's just spreads her legs wide once more and offers herself to him. Rognak wastes no time in crawling up onto the bed at long last, pinning the beautiful live night elf down, and thrusting into her ready and waiting cunt. As he does so, she hooks her arms around his neck and lets out a lewd cry as she takes his cock nice and deep. At the same time however, Chandri's looks him in the eye, clearly having something she wants to say. Rognak, on this expedition, if you get the chance to be-bed my mother. I want you to take it. Rognak blinks at that, caught a little off guard by the demand. He frowns, still fucking Chandri's but slowing down a bit as he shakes his head. You already tried on that front, Chandri's. Tried and failed, if you remember correctly. Chandri's scoffs, thankfully not overly offended at being reminded of her previous failure. In fact, she even smiles up at him. That was then, this is now. The fact that Tyrande has chosen to go on this mission herself, she can say that it's because she wants to avenge those she's lost once and for all by taking down the Lich King personally. It's probably even true. But just because that's true doesn't mean she also isn't feeling restless. Lonely. Tired. Grunting, Rognak listens even as he continues fucking Chandri's into the bed. Though, he does pick up the pace a little bit, partially out of hopes that he'll fuck her too hard for her to continue talking this nonsense. She's, still unhappy. I've, done my best, but I think she's actually been unhappy for a long time. Longer than just Malfurion's death. I'm not saying you have to proposition her, over and over again, just be available. Rognak is quiet for a moment, before letting out a growl and pulling Chandri's up into a kiss, one of his large green hands on the back of her head. She, of course, immediately goes for the tusk of his that she likes paying extra special attention to. They make out for a few moments, her moaning into his mouth, until finally he pulls back again. Fine. But you have to do something for me as well while I'm gone. Chandri's blinks, looking curious at what he means. Rognak only hesitates for a moment before outlining to her what he wants her to keep an eye out for. He doesn't know the exact timeline of events, so it's entirely possible this is ultimately going to result in nothing, but hearing Tyrande call Chandri's general for the first time earlier today had jogged loose a memory from his previous life. Whether anything would come of it or not, Rognak couldn't say. But he figured it couldn't hurt to try. Or rather, have Chandri's try anyways. As he finishes explaining things to her, Chandri's takes it all in and then nods decisively. I'll see what I can do, Rognak. Chuckling softly, Rognak pulls her into another kiss before nodding his head. That's all I can ask. Needless to say, the three of them enjoy each other's company for the rest of the night. And just as Chandri's prophesied, there isn't a single moment for any of them to see each other over the coming week. They're simply too busy. And then suddenly, it's time to leave Kalimdor behind. Northrend awaits. Chapter 43, The Voyage North. Pushing open the doors in front of her, Tyrande steps out of the passenger cabin hallway and onto the open deck of Alon's Blessing, the night elf flagship of the Northrend expeditionary fleet that they'd put together on such short notice. She breathes in the fresh ocean air, taking a moment to bask in the sunlight streaming down from overhead. Then, she turns and makes her way up the stairs to the upper deck where the ship's helm can be found. If she's going to be out on the deck of the ship, it's better that she be as unobtrusive and out of the way as possible. After all, High Priestess of Alon and leader of the Night Elf people she might be, but a sailor she was not. Part of being in charge was knowing when you shouldn't be in charge, and in this case Tyrande is all too happy to move to a railing on the upper deck of Alon's Blessing, gracing the captain of the vessel with a grateful smile as she arrives there. Good morning, Captain Galland. Galland Windsword turns her way for a moment, bowing his head respectfully in her direction before returning to steering their vessel. With Alon's Blessing at the head of the fleet, he's effectively steering all 15 of the ships that are currently journeying with them to Northrend at the moment. Still, he's an accomplished sailor and has no issue holding a quick conversation with her at the same time that his eyes are constantly scanning the horizon. Well met, Priestess Whisperwind. A pleasure to have your company on this fine morning. It's a good day for sailing. I don't foresee us having any issues with the weather, at least. Tyrande smiles, appreciating the information as well as his gruff tone. She knows that he doesn't mean anything by it, of course. Though a spark of guilt does alight in her chest over her presumptuous decision to declare they would be leaving from Oberdine within the week. In hindsight, it was a wonder they'd even managed. A week was, not a lot of time, and only via some arcane help via Lady Jaina Proudmoore and her portals, along with some fast work growing some supplies from Cenarius, Rognak and the other druids, had they been able to get everything and everyone together in only a week. Well, technically they'd set out on the 8th day, but Tyrande wasn't about to be nitpicky. No, not when she already felt bad for making everyone dance to her tune and fulfill her expectations in the first place. Still, she hadn't wanted to risk Chandri's managing to talk her out of her decision. And believe her, the girl had damn well tried. It felt like every single day, the newly promoted General Feathermoon had managed to somehow find a moment to speak to Tyrande despite her new duties and responsibilities. Not that Tyrande would have minded getting the chance to speak to her adoptive daughter each day, but it grew rather irritating when Chandris turned every meeting into another conversation about how Tyrande should stay and she should be the one to go to Northrend. In the end, they at least hadn't parted ways on bad terms. Chandris might not have been happy she couldn't convince Tyrande to change her mind, but they'd still hugged before the fleet had left Kalimdor. Ultimately, Tyrande knew she was right. Even if Chandris didn't agree with her, this was the right move. Not just choosing to go with the expedition, but also promoting Chandris to general in the first place. The other night elf was right after all. They'd lost too many leaders. And while Tyrande knew the truth of Fondrel Stagilm's treachery thanks to a conversation with Cenarius, the fact remained that between his demise and Malfurion's state, the night elf people were without an archdruid to properly lead them. Fortunately, Brawl Bearmantle was up to the challenge, even if the night elf male didn't think so. But of all of the living night elf druids, he was not only the one most in touch with nature, he was also touched by the wild gods themselves, being one of the handful of night elves who were naturally born with antlers in the image of their patron, Lord Cenarius. But while Tyrande knew Brawl would make an excellent archdruid, she also knew that Chandris would be an excellent sentinel general. The girl had even been talking about sending a scouting force down to Feralas before the fleet had departed, showing that she was already falling into her new role with a gusto that Tyrande couldn't help but admire. And of course, there was the personal element to all of this. Tyrande needed this. Whether it was for closure or simply good old-fashioned revenge, she knew that she needed to be part of this mission. On the one hand, the time since the Defilers' defeat had been a time of celebration, rejuvenation, and growth for the peoples of Kalimdor, both old and new. Her people in particular had embraced their newfound mortality with a gusto that had both surprised and impressed Tyrande. But she knew why that was. It was because they had found a solid example of how to live mortal in the form of their new friends and allies from the Horde and the humans of their Amor Isle. From the savage but honorable orcs, to the soft-spoken and good-natured Tauren, to the ever-inquisitive and thrill-seeking humans. All of these mortal races and more had given the night elf people examples of exactly what it meant to live on a time limit. To not have eternity. Sure, some of Tyrande's people had fallen into melancholy and despair at the loss of their immortality. More had entered depressive states over the loss of loved ones during the Legion's invasion of Kalimdor. Whether they were sentinels killed in battle, civilians overrun by the scourge sweeping through their forests, or druids slaughtered in their barrows, it was hard to find a night elf still alive who hadn't lost someone in the conflict. But they still had each other. They still had their people, and they still had their potential. And oh, what that potential had managed to accomplish. Tyrande couldn't help but be grateful that Fondrel Stagilm's proposal for a new world tree in which they could settle atop its boughs had never come to fruition. His plan for this Teldrassil had seemed sound on paper, but knowing now what he was plotting, well, technically they could have gone ahead with the initiative anyways once he and his master's plans were dealt with. They hadn't though, and Tyrande was all the happier for it. Because rather than their people being mostly sequestered in a tree off the coast of Kalimdor while their ancestral lands languished and some remained corrupted by the Legion and Scourge's passing, they'd stayed on the mainland and were making something beautiful alongside the younger races of Kalimdor. Indeed, there were already initiatives to combat the disgusting condition of the Fellwood. And even whispers of an effort to go south and perhaps bring life back to the barons themselves. It was wonderful, truly it was. Back home in the grand temple to Elun that had been erected in Astranar, no matter where Tyrande looked, she saw things that made her heart swell with pride in her chest. And yet, despite how grand these last several months had been, Tyrande herself had never been lonelier. She had Chandris of course. Her adoptive daughter was ever close by, and in fact this little expedition would be the longest they'd been apart since the Legion's invasion. And of course, she still had Elun as well. Her goddess was always with her, a comforting balm upon her wounded soul. But her soul was still wounded. Still damaged. There was a gash in her heart that would not heal. A festering injury upon her psyche that refused to scab over. Malfurion's loss sat heavily with her even now. So did Illidan's. It was funny, in a not-so-funny sort of way. For 10,000 years, Illidan's Stormrage had languished in his prison. Tyrande hadn't visited him once. Maybe she should have, but after everything, she couldn't bring herself to do it. She feared what she would find. She feared what she might do if she came face to face with the man she'd once counted as friend. And Malfurion. Malfurion had been in and out of the dream damn near constantly, spending far more time in the dream tending to his responsibilities there than out. Tyrande had never begrudged him it. She'd put it out of her mind as much as possible. But, she had counted the years. Before his death, before he'd been so callously taken from her, Malfurion had spent the last 3,000 years in the dream. Even still. They'd always both been alive, at least. They had not been permanently lost to her. Only, temporarily displaced. There was always the chance of a reconciliation between her and Illidan still. A possibility that he might see the error of his power-hungry ways and repent his callous disregard for their people's safety. And of course, Tyrande had known that Malfurion would wake up one day and return to her side. He always did, eventually. Until he did not. Until he could no longer. Tyrande had always known the Stormrage brothers were still out there, and now they weren't. She hasn't spoken to Malfurion directly since their encounter before the Battle of Mount Hyjal. Cenarius had confided in her the circumstances of Fondrel Stagilm's defeat. How Malfurion's presence had been instrumental in stopping the puppet and his damnable nightmare lord from disabling Cenarius and killing Rognik and Brawl. Tyrande was happy to hear that it had all worked out, even if she was less than happy that she hadn't been included in either the planning nor the mission itself until after the fact. Regardless of her immense irritation over Cenarius' decision to keep Fondrel a purely druid matter, Tyrande had listened well when the Lord of the Forest had explained to her Malfurion's final words before disappearing. How he believed that he would only have one more manifestation on Azeroth before he dissipated entirely. And how he had decided to save it for her. The instant she'd heard that, Tyrande had demanded Cenarius pass on a message to her beloved for her. She'd told him that Malfurion was not to use up his time just to visit her, and to not worry about her. That she was fine, and that what she wanted, more than anything, was for Malfurion to stay in the dream and stay alive as long as possible. Yes, he might be lost to her, but so long as he lingered, Tyrande could hold on to the knowledge that he was still out there. They would never be together again, but they were both still fighting the same fight, still working towards the same goals. What little cold comfort that provided, anyways. Cenarius had done as she'd asked and Malfurion had given his assent to her demands using his mentor as proxy. And so, Tyrande had had very little communication with her mate in these last several months, as busy as they and Cenarius, their go-between, all were with their respective projects. And sure, it wasn't unusual for Tyrande to go months or even years without hearing from Malfurion. But the context had undeniably changed. Tyrande needed this expedition. She needed to get away from the beautifully crafted Temple of Elune and all the expectations of her people. And she needed, more than anything, to put this monstrous Lich King to rest once and for all. Even now, right alongside the sorrow in her heart, Tyrande Whisperwind felt a cold, raw hatred and fury towards any and all undead. The Scourge were a blight upon this world, and she would see their master destroyed once and for all. She knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that her vengeance would not be satisfied until the Lich King himself was dealt with. And so long as he and his demon masters were trying to hunt down the shards of that damnable rune blade that slew Illidan, she knew her people would not be safe either. Yes, there were times to dig in and defend and times to take the fight to the enemy. This was one of the latter, most definitely. Tyrande would. Blinking, Tyrande is pulled out of her rather morbid inner thoughts by the sound of something aquatic and large. Looking back behind Ilune's blessing, she watches as a massive orca with large spiked tusks coming off the sides of its mouth crests out of the water, doing a flip and then diving back beneath the surface. Behind it come even more orcas, along with a group of sea lions as well. Tyrande finds herself unable to fight the smile that spreads across the face, as she notes the difference between the aquatic form that Rognak and his warsong druids have taken, and that of the night elf druids who have come on this expedition. Though even when she compares Rognak and his fellow orcs, she finds that his aquatic form is the biggest of them all. Leaning against the railing, Tyrande watches the druids of the expeditionary fleet play in the water, swimming back and forth and up and under the 15 ships that are currently making their way to Northrend. She admires their carefree nature, wishing she herself could feel even an ounce of that. It would be lovely to just be able to turn into a fish and swim beneath the waves. Or even to be able to turn into a bird and just fly away. She'd never envied Malfurion or his fellow druids before his loss. She'd always been content with her place as Ilune's chosen, as her high priestess. And, she still was, don't get her wrong. But she would be much more content, much more satisfied even, once the Lich King was dead. Turning her gaze back towards the great expanse of water in front of them, Tyrande's fingers gripped down harder upon the wooden railing beneath her hands. Northrend awaited. And so did the Lich King and his demon allies. They might have defeated Archimonde and the Legion at Mount Hyjal, but as Ditherok's attack on Nendes and Moonglade showed, the threat was not yet over. Tyrande would not rest until their world was safe. In memory of Malfurion, in memory of Illidan, she would see it done. One way or another. Chapter 44, Landfall. There, on the tree line. Undead sighted. Rognak immediately whips around, an orcish huff leaving his flared nostrils as he draws Wolfsong from his back. This wasn't unexpected though. In fact, it was downright anticipated. They'd barely just made landfall on the cold, frozen shores of Northrend after weeks of travel at sea. A small fleet of rowboats had deposited the first portion of their forces on the grey, sandy beach and then turned around to collect the next group. Of course, that was when the Scourge made themselves known. Predictable. Rognak's lips curl back into a big orcish grin as he thrusts Wolfsong up into the air. Forward. See, none of the expedition leaders were idiots. And they'd had plenty of time in the past several weeks of sea travel to plan for their landing on Northrond's shores. Indeed, it was all too expected that the Scourge would likely meet them. By this point in time, Ditherok's demise, if not known, had to be suspected. And Northrend was, if not the Scourge stronghold it might have become in the future, still the resting place of the Lich King all the same. Honestly, watching the wave of ghouls and zombies and other shambling undead rush onto the beach at them, Rognak's eyes narrow a little bit. He was expecting more. That said, a force of even this size would need to be commanded by there. Necromancers, lurking by the trees. Rognak's words do not fall on deaf ears. Warsong druids alongside their night elf counterparts have already begun rushing forward. Behind them, sentinels and priestess of Elune also move into position, bows notched and the moon goddess blessings radiating from glowing fingertips. At his warning, attention diverts to the necromancers that can be seen leading the small army of shambling undead from the back. Rognak reaches out, fully intending to turn the very trees they're using as cover against them. They underestimate his range and his eyes widen as he's suddenly hit by something he doesn't understand. A spell, perhaps? One moment he's standing on the beach, Wolfsong in hand and his connection with nature singing in his veins. He's just made contact with the trees when it happens, and suddenly he's no longer on the beach at all. Suddenly, he's in some sort of foggy, ephemeral place made of mist and shadow and snow. Ah, the outsider's champion, at long last. Rognak goes to bring Wolfsong in front of himself in a defensive posture, only to find it's not in his hands. Rather, he isn't in his proper body. His own form right now is as vague and indistinct as his surroundings. His very self is flickering in and out of existence. What is this? Show yourself. A soft, purring chuckle resounds around him and the feminine voice that spoke before hums for a moment. Very well. Peace, Chieftain Rognak. I am not your enemy. Quite suddenly, she's in front of him. Not just in front of him, but damn nose to nose. Of course, considering he's just one single orc and she's an utterly massive snow leopard, her nose alone is easily 5 times the size of his head. Blinking as he finds himself with far too good of a view up her left nostril, Rognak takes a stumbling step back, and finds himself looking into a pair of glowing, icy blue eyes. Hello. Immediately, Rognak knows exactly who he's speaking with. Harkoa. LOA of snow leopards. He finds himself reeling for a moment. Why was she contacting him? How was she contacting him? It hits him just as she chuckles again, tilting her massive head to the side and studying him with feline amusement. You are well informed, aren't you? Or does the part of you that is me recognize its origin, I wonder? A shudder runs down his spine. Her earliest words come back to him then. She'd called him the outsider's champion. And he'd only heard that identifier used in reference to him once before. You were there, weren't you? You were one of those that he contacted. Nodding her massive head, the snow leopard LOA finally pulls back. Sitting on her haunches, she towers over Rognak, gazing down at him somewhat impassively. Indeed. Before we were LOA, we were wild gods after all. Kin to the likes of Malorn, Ursoc, and all the others. The outsider approached us and showed us what might come. In return, we agreed to empower you. A fair deal. A good deal, as it's turned out. Rognak slowly nods at that, his mind whirling with more questions than he could hold. But before he can ask any of them, he's reminded of what he'd been doing before this. I was in the middle of battle. I apologize, but I really need you to put me back now please. Rather than acquiescing to his very reasonable request, Harkoa just laughs again. Rognak grits his teeth, wondering if he might be completely at the mercy of this fickle creature. His second set of memories assured him that the snow leopard LOA was honorable and easily one of the most personable of the LOA that players tended to interact with. But before he can grow any more antsy, Harkoa shakes her head. You need not worry, young one. This is a moment frozen in time. We can converse for a while yet before the first heartbeat lapses out in the real world. Oh, hi, he didn't know she could do that. Hopefully she wasn't lying. But, assuming she was telling the truth. So you and the other Drakari LOA all partook in making me the druid I am today? You're all my patrons. Harkoa nods her massive head up and down. Indeed. We are but some of your patrons, young druid. In exchange for fragments of our power, instilled in you at birth, the outsiders showed us what might become of us if we allowed certain individuals within the Drakari Empire to remain in power. Rognak's own memories of the downfall of the Drakari Empire flashed through his head. By the time all was said and done, Harkoa was literally the last LOA of the Drakari pantheon left standing. She was the only survivor, after the Drakari trolls decided to slaughter their animal gods in order to sup upon their power. You need not worry, young orc. The treachery that the outsiders showed us will not come to pass. We have made sure of that. A shudder runs through Rognak as he finds himself imagining just what that might mean. But then, he doesn't need Harkoa to spell it out for him, does he? It's obvious that there'd been a cleansing. Probably pretty much every Drakari prophet had been removed and replaced with more tractable individuals. I'm glad to hear that you and your kin will not be slaughtered for your power, great LOA. Harkoa snorts in amusement at that. You need not be so formal with me, young one. There is a reason I was chosen of all of my kin to speak with you. Yes, it is good that the Drakari no longer consider slaughtering us for our power. But the root of the problem still remains, doesn't it? Rognak's jaw clenches at the reminder and he nods. The Lich King. He and the Scourge are why we're here in Northrend. I know the undead have been harassing the Drakari's borders for some time now, but if all goes to plan, then that won't be a problem for much longer. There's a pause and then the massive LOA almost seems to slump in relief. Rognak blinks at the sight of the huge snow leopard dropping forward onto her belly before him, letting out a sigh that seems like it should blow a massive gust of hot air across his entire body. But it doesn't, because whatever this place is, it isn't the real world and doesn't operate by the real world's rules. Good. Very good. You will be happy to know that that's why I'm here. The moment you reached out to Northrend's natural splendor, you reached out to us. And so I reached back, to gain your measure, and to let you know that we shall support your endeavors. Rognak narrows his eyes at that, half imagining a fully mobilized Drakari Empire marching out of Zuldrak and onto the frozen throne. That would certainly be nice, but then, when something sounded too good to be true, it often was. Unfortunately, the Empire is still in a state of turmoil. And the undead ceaselessly nip at our borders. We cannot push for our followers to provide you with direct physical aid. But you are a conduit for pieces of our power, Rognak. And so, for as long as you walk the lands of Northrend, you may call upon our forms as your own. Wait, what? Rognak's eyes widen at that declaration, once he fully processes what she's just said. He opens his mouth to speak, to ask for clarification, but Harkoa suddenly gives a cat's shrug. The heartbeat has passed. Goodbye, young one. And good luck. In an instant, Rognak finds himself back on the beach, holding Wolf Song aloft, reaching out to the trees with his connection to nature. However, he pivots at a moment's notice, no longer reaching for the trees, but rather, for something else. Sheathing Wolf Song on his back, Rognak begins to move forward, walking at first, and then running. And as he runs, he shifts. His fellow Warsong Druids have already reached the front of the small army of undead that have been sent after them and are tearing into them alongside their elven brothers while sentinels and priestesses support them from the back. But Rognak doesn't stop at the front. As he fully transforms, taking on the appearance of Harkoa, LOA of snow leopards, he coils himself up, and leaps. He's not quite as large as Harkoa herself. But he is larger than any other form he's ever taken before now. As such, his leap takes him past the entire army of undead that have been gathered up to ambush them. He lands instead behind their lines, at the trees themselves where their necromancer masters hide. The look of wide-eyed shock that he sees in the barely visible eyes of one of the cloaked, hooded necromancers is truthfully all Rognak needs to feel a surge of satisfaction rush through him. But that sense of pleasure is further compounded when his new claws, glowing with icy blue power, tear through body after body mere moments later. He makes short work of the necromancers in charge of the undead army, all while his students and their night elf allies deal with the actual undead themselves. With the leadership beheaded, the already mindless zombies, ghouls, and shambling horrors become even more mindless, making it all too easy to take them down. They were already ready for this first battle, to be fair. Having expected some sort of ambush the moment that their rowboats turned back to the fleet to get the next batch of troops, they'd front-loaded the first landing party with as much power as they possibly could. Still, Rognak and his new form make it even more of a one-sided slaughter than they'd anticipated, and by the end the number of casualties on their end can be counted on one hand. The casualties on the enemy's side of things by comparison are complete. Rognak doesn't allow a single necromancer to slip away and report back to their superiors. Licking his chops as the battle comes to a close, Rognak makes his way back to the beach, slowly pulling away from Harkoa's power. It's not like other animal forms he's taken, truth be told. There's something undeniably intoxicating about holding onto Harkoa's form. He's almost reluctant to return to his own body, having lived for a moment as the avatar of a wild god. Harkoa's purring chuckle echoes in his ears as he finally manages it, fully transforming back into himself and shaking his head to try and clear it of thoughts of grandeur. Best if he didn't become an egomaniac just because he had access to some serious firepower at the moment. After all, while the fragments of power that the Drakkari LOA had granted him at the behest of his mysterious benefactor the Outsider were his to keep and not something they could take back, their forms were another matter entirely. They were a temporary boon, a gift that Harkoa had made clear would be rescinded when he finally departed from Northrend again. He shouldn't get too attached. Arriving at the makings of their first base camp, Rognak is met with stares from his fellow orcs and their elven allies alike. Everyone is giving him some serious looks after what just happened, but only one among them has the balls to actually say something. Which is funny, considering her gender. The fuck was that? Mayev Shadowsong is looking at him with her head tilted to the side, as though she really doesn't know what to make of him. Feeling a little self-conscious, Rognak rolls his shoulders and sort of shrugs. A boon from a nearby wild god. Kin to the Lord of the Forest. They have great reason to want the Lich King dead and the Scourge disorganized if not completely defeated. Eyes widen at that explanation, but thankfully no one questions him further. Even Mayev seems to accept that at this point, Rognak just does things like this. Which isn't really fair. He doesn't do things like this, rather, they happen to him more often than not. Regardless, soon enough, everyone is together and the base camp is constructed, which means it's time to buckle down, send out scouts, and make plans for how they were going to journey to the Frozen Throne to end this once and for all. In all honesty, for all that Rognak's new form had trivialized the battle, the welcoming party to their little expeditionary force had been startlingly weak, he realized after the fact. But then, it made sense in a way, didn't it? This was not a Northrend that Arthas had years to build up. There would be no ice-crowned citadel to besiege, no massive sets of fortifications to fight through. The Scourge were a very real threat to be sure, but Nazul had to be growing weaker by the second if he was being forced to work alongside Kil'jaeden. Frostmourn's destruction was likely killing him even now. Hopefully, this would all be a walk in the park. But that didn't mean Rognak wasn't going to take it all seriously. The Lich King was going down. Even if he had to use his new forms to make sure of it personally. Chapter 45, The Cavalry Arrives. Copper for your thoughts. Mayev grunts as Nation nudges her in the side. Her mate has her head tilted in that way that Mayev just knows means the other warden is grinning under her helmet. In response, Mayev scowls a bit, but truth be told, she can hardly bring herself to be upset with Nasha. Upset with their situation? Sure. But upset with Nasha? No. Even still. I was just thinking that I wished you'd stayed back at base camp. Feigning a hurt gasp, Nasha places a hand on her chest as though Mayev has just dealt her a grievous blow. Mayev snorts derisively at her mate's little comedy routine. What? And here I thought you enjoyed my company. Well, Warden Shadowsong, if that's how you really feel. Rolling her eyes, Mayev just sighs as she looks around, her gaze darting back and forth, looking for anything out of the ordinary. You know that wasn't what I meant, Nasha. You have every right to be here. You've earned your title, same as me. Her fellow warden bumps hips with her as they keep walking along, off to the side of the expedition that's currently making its way northward. And don't you forget it, Mayev. I'm not some simpering priestess in need of your support. I can damn well take care of myself. Naisha's tone is still jovial, but there is a bit of bite to it as well, making it clear she means what she says. Maiev agrees with her, truth be told. But it didn't change the facts. If it were wholly Maiev's choice and she could make the call without completely alienating her mate, she would have left Naisha behind back on Kalimdor. After that brush with Dithirok, she would have preferred it if her mate was somewhere safe from harm for, just a little while. Say a few decades maybe. But no. Naisha had always been particularly free-spirited, and even sneakier than Maiev besides. If she had tried to pull rank and forbid the other night elf woman from coming on this trip, she suspected Naisha would have ended up in Northrend anyways. Just like she knew if she'd tried to push the issue and keep Naisha confined to the base camp with the rest of the expeditionary force, the other warden likely would have snuck along all the same. Even before they'd fallen into bed together, even before she'd called Naisha her mate, the other night elf had been intensely loyal to Maiev and their cause. She wouldn't let anything stop her from supporting Maiev in whatever way possible, not even Maiev Shadowsong herself. Besides, do you really think the base camp is any safer than we are? If Northrend is truly as infested with undead as everyone says it is, then they will be in just as much danger as we will be. That, however, Maiev cannot let stand. Shaking her head, she scoffs. Don't be disingenuous, Naisha. There is a big difference between holding the beach within easy line of sight with the fleet, and journeying to the heart of this frozen, misbegotten place to deal with the master behind the undead threat once and for all. Defeating this Lich King will not be easy. Do not forget that his champion was the one who slew the betrayer. Naisha hums at that. Maiev, you know I love you, but we're going to have to sit down at some point and have a talk, especially now that Illidan Stormrage is dead. The man wasn't the greatest threat to Azeroth that you thought of him as. Not by a long shot. We fought, imprisoned, and even killed way worse than him in the last 10,000 years. Bristling at Naisha's exasperated tone, Maiev opens her mouth to respond, but no doubt sensing that she'd riled her up, Naisha immediately changes the subject. Besides, if this Lich King is so dangerous, where are his armies? One paltry force of undead attack us on the beach, and then nothing? We've been traveling through the snow for 3 days now and the undead haven't shown their faces even once since that first assault. Perhaps that orc chieftain, Rognak, is right. Perhaps the Lich King really is dying and this might not be quite so hard as it first seemed. Maiev grunts and shakes her head. I don't trust it. Just as she's about to explain that she really doesn't see this being one of their easier missions, Maiev notices something. Movement in the snow. It's barely there, oh so subtle, but she sees it. And more than that, she feels it. A rumble, from below. Without missing a beat, the Night Elf Warden draws her Umbra Crescent, even as Naisha swiftly does the same beside her, no questions asked. Beneath us. Ambush. Maiev's words fly through the air, reaching the ears of the rest of the expedition. Everyone immediately starts going for their weapons or gathering their magic, but by that point, the enemy has struck. Snow flies everywhere as they come out of the very ground itself. She's expecting more zombies and ghouls, truth be told. She's not expecting massive arachnid monstrosities reminiscent of the horrific tales that came out of the War of the Shifting Sands. Maiev's eyes widen as a particularly massive beetle-like creature with hulking mandibles comes right out of the ground just in front of her. Before it can close those mandibles down on her body, however, Naisha's hand grabs her by the scruff of her cloak and yanks her out of the line of attack, saving her from a particularly messy end. The two wardens fly into battle from there, each of them striking at the giant monstrosity right in front of them, cutting along its carapace with their weapons. They don't dig as deep as Maiev would have hoped, however. Nor do they do as much damage as she'd expect. It's only then that she realizes what these creatures are. Nerubians. They're undead, all of them. Yes. These are Scourge. Though, the cry from Rognak regarding these creatures is something Maiev immediately files away in the back of her mind. Nerubians, he'd called them. Was this more of his prophesying? Or had he been told about these creatures by the native wild god he said had spoken to him back on the beach? Either way, it rapidly became apparent that the reason they hadn't encountered any more Scourge in the past 3 days was not because they were so weak that they couldn't fight back. No, it was because the Scourge had been preparing an ambush. They were smarter than Maiev had given them credit for. 3 days away from the base camp was exactly the perfect time to strike, having lulled many of the expedition into a false sense of security. Not Maiev though. And despite her somewhat cavalier attitude from before, Naisha is always ready for a fight. Together, they take down their current opponent on a second pass, before moving on to the next. And as Maiev quickly discovers, there is always a next. The Nerubians are ceaseless. Once they spring their ambush, they don't stop coming. The ground itself has become the expedition's enemy, with undead arachnids prone to jump from every snowdrift, to come exploding out of every inch of dirt. And on top of that, there are flying bugs as well. Buzzing through the air, they come from over a nearby ridge and descend down upon the expedition. Maiev's eyes widen as she takes in the state of the battle. Her and Naisha are already having to carefully back up to where the rest of the watchers they've brought with them are reinforcing the sentinels, who are in turn defending the priestesses of Elune. Among their number, Tyrn the Whisperwind fires radiant arrow after radiant arrow into the carapaces of these bugs, shattering them one after the other and killing every single target she sets her sights on. The High Priestess is a beacon of Elune's light for the Night Elves to rally around, but for all that she doesn't leave a single Nerubian intact once she focuses her ire in their direction, she's not making much of a dent. Still, her connection to the Moon Goddess is their best bet of handling these undead. She must be protected. At the same time, there are the Druids, both Elven and Orcish. The elves are split into the three usual disciplines when it comes to druidism. There are those who stand with the priestesses of Elune, using their nature magic to heal. Then there are those close by who are using their nature magic to hurt, creating adverse weather conditions and turning the very trees themselves against the Nerubian onslaught. Lord Cenarius himself is among that second group, the forest demigod's eyes glowing with green light as he wields nature like no one else can. Yet even he is being pressed at this point by the endless tide of arachnid bodies. And finally, there are those who take on animal forms, fighting the arachnid monsters claw to mandible. Alongside the latter group are the vast majority of the Orc Druids from the Warsong clan. Those that aren't transformed into some sort of animal are wielding axes alongside nature magic in a way that's reminiscent of their chieftain, cutting through carapace after carapace while entangling the arachnids all around them in grasping vines. As for Rognak himself, Maiev can't help but be a little amazed yet again when she finally lays eyes on him. The Orc Druid has transformed into a massive woolly rhino, easily as large as the snow leopard form he said was a boon from the native wild god. Was this also part of that boon? Or was this another wild god entirely? Just how many beings did Rognak truly have in his corner? What made him so special? It was a point of curiosity for Maiev, but one she would have to put off until later. For now, Rognak's woolly rhino form was certainly helping to keep the battle from becoming a slaughter. He was rampaging left and right, the massive horn on his head tearing through some of the larger Nerubians that were currently assailing them from all sides. But that was just it, they were coming from all directions. North, south, east, and west. Above and below. They were surrounded with no route to escape that Maiev could see. It had her grinding her teeth, even as she and Naisha fought back to back, the two wardens also serving as direction for the contingent of watchers they'd brought with them. And frankly, the cohesion and teamwork on display within the expedition force was amazing. All around them, Nerubian bodies were piling up. In fact, it was getting so bad that some of the undead arachnid creatures were being delegated to pulling away their defeated comrades so that natural walls weren't formed out of the mountains being created by their deaths. However, that did not mean the expedition was without casualties of its own. In particular, the elven and orc druids who were fighting on the front lines were beginning to take losses. Their blood stained the snow, and Maiev could see more and more of them face down on the ground. Those that could be healed were and quickly got back up and into the fight, but more and more, she was watching nature magic and Elune's light wash over bodies that did not so much as twitch, because they were already gone. Was this truly how it ended? In one ceaseless, unending tide of bugs? Maiev found herself gnashing her teeth and railing against the indignity of it all. Surely not, right? They would not fall here. They could not fall here. And yet, everywhere she looked, the battle seemed to be slowly but surely inching towards an inevitable conclusion. Things are desperate, and she's not sure what they can do to turn the tide. But just as that thought is crossing her mind, a sudden shadow, much larger than the Nerubian flyers have proven to be so far, coasts overhead. Maieva's head snaps back, her eyes narrowing as she sees a strange sight. Dragon hawks, creatures native only to one part of the world as far as Maiev is aware, are flying above them. Most importantly however, they are not undead, nor are they Nerubian. Meanwhile, out of the woods to the east come battle cries. Hitting the Nerubians from behind, are new entities that have Maieva's eyes narrowing even further. 4 Silver Moon. 4 Kulthalas. Remember the sun well. Charging forth from the woods in shining golden armor are High Elves. Maiev, more than most of her insular and isolated kin, has traveled far from Kalimdor in pursuit of her work. Indeed, the Watchers themselves had holdings all over the shattered world left behind by the Sundering. So yes, she knew of the High Elves of Kulthalas, with their paler skin and smaller stature. But she'd never seen them outside of Kulthalas before. At least, not in such great numbers. The Dragonhawks overhead make a bit more sense now, seeing as the High Elves love to use them as mounts. Even still, their presence is a point of confusion, but it's not one Maiev is going to worry about, at least for the time being. The High Elf army ambushed the ambushers, attacking the Nerubians and providing much-needed relief to the beleaguered expedition force. Just when it looked like things were getting dire, these reinforcements from Kulthalas of all places arrive and turn the tide. Though, the mention of a Sunwell was particularly troubling to Maiev. She was aware of the High Elf's Sunwell. It was what sustained them, in fact. Maiev had investigated it, worried that it was another well of eternity, but as far as she could tell, the Sunwell was much purer. A force of light and strength. For them to shout battle cries in memory of it however was downright chilling. Still, she could not deny their efficacy. They fought with a fervor that reminded her of herself in a way. Like they had a cause that they believed in with all their hearts. And they attacked the undead Nerubians with a zealotry and violence that made her wonder just how personal all of this was for them. What had happened to the High Elves, to leave them without the Sunwell and such a massive force of them here in Northrend? In the face of these new forces, the Nerubians are ultimately forced into retreat. Their ambush was carefully planned it would seem, and whatever greater intelligence was behind this coordinated assault had clearly not accounted for these newest arrivals. The battle comes to a close as the undead arachnids are forced back underground by the strength of arms and coordination of the living. Once they're gone, Maiev watches as one of the Dragonhawks descends from on high, allowing a particularly ostentatious-looking high elf to dismount. He doesn't approach her, of course. No, instead he seems to zero in on the High Priestess immediately, his gaze locking onto Tyrn the Whisperwind even as Elune's chosen casts one final healing spell, closing the wounds of those immediately around her. Then and only then does Tyrn look at the newcomer and tilt her head to the side, studying him curiously. In response, he smiles at her and bows at the waist. Greetings. I am Prince Kael, that's Sun's Strider, of Kulthalas. It is a pleasure to meet long-lost kin in these distant, frost-bitten lands. Maiev watches this exchange with Naisha at her side and snorts under her breath. She had so many questions that she would be seeking the answers to as soon as the danger was past. But for now, one thing was certain. This was bound to be interesting if nothing else.